What's up, fam? Smash the like button for the algorithm and let's get started with the story. A single 5-star hotel loomed above the city, while the other was more like a collection of modest dwellings. The remaining hotels were all of a lower quality. It was a sunny day at the Jauria Hotel, which happened to be the 100th best hotel in the nation. In the large kitchen, the chefs were hard at work. The protagonist appeared anxious as he worked diligently. On the platters, you could see carrots and onions cut into thin slices. Someone yelled out to Sunghoon as he wiped the perspiration off his brow, sighing heavily. While using a rag to wipe his hands, he glanced back. He was asked by the man to attend the forthcoming culinary session in his stead and indicate his absence. The cook questioned why the seniors were required to attend these seminars instead of the juniors when he raised an objection. In an embarrassed nod, the young man consented. Looking down, the young man couldn't believe he was being treated like a junior, even though he had joined the hotel 4 years ago. A chef inquired as to whether or not the garbage can had been removed. The trainee was told to clean the camp when he said he hadn't done it yet while holding a bowl of food. The main character dipped his head and lifted the bucket. Every hotel had a tank on the floor for storing oil. Formerly, it was called a grease trap, but in the kitchen, it was just a garbage can. Sunghoon raised the hefty steel tank. Upon hearing that his coworker had set fire to everything, he glanced up. The chef yelled out to his apprentice, "Stop making such rudimentary mistakes!" while waving his hand. The young lad lowered himself and expressed regret. Jinik oversaw a crew of 17 cooks and was currently frowning in disapproval. As far as the youngster could tell, the captain was perpetually irritated whenever he witnessed his subordinates in the kitchen, yet he never failed to deliver the correct response. An icy expression crossed the man's face. Upon noticing him, the child immediately averted his gaze. Following the disposal of the garbage can, the intern resolved that he would undoubtedly be acknowledged at some point. When someone inquired as to why they had brought it there, he glanced up in perplexion. The irate cleaner put her hands on her hips and claimed she had recently discarded it. The main character expressed his apologies and clarified that his superior had requested him to carry it out. Looking down, the woman inquired about the duration of his treatment as a junior, and whether new cooks were indeed necessary. Sunghoon responded after a moment of thought that the seniors would need to step down before he, as an assistant, could even consider the possibility. The man boasted that his dishwashing skills had improved over the past 3 years. The cleaner expressed the need to advance in his work more rapidly, wearing a sorrowful expression. In response to being requested to vacate the garbage can, the young man put up his hand and inquired about the well-being of everyone involved. He was told to return to his work by the woman, who said she would be returning later. Beside the cabinet stood a water cooler. The intern straightened his tie and reached for his phone, determined to obtain the seminar's schedule. The protagonist's jaw dropped open in disbelief as he realized he was running behind schedule. The sun was blazing over the massive edifice as Sunghoon hurried onward. As he stepped into a hallway, the man made an effort to collect himself. Every seat in the room was filled, including the one directly in front of him. The youth beheld the table and understood that he must first register. Approached from behind, a stranger recognized him and greeted him by name. It was Shanti, an old acquaintance of his, it turned out. It had been quite some time since they had last met, he indicated by waving his hand. Once upon a time, this man had a big check for taking first place in a large catering contest for soldiers. Because they were housed together for 8 weeks, the boys became buddies. They were sitting on the floor one day when the subject of mass catering came up. With clenched jaw, the trainee recalled how the Transport Support Battalion commander had repeatedly thwarted his attempts at creative mass cooking, insisting instead on simple, inexpensive fare. Garnishing these recollections within, the protagonist grinned. As they shook hands, he remembered that his former co-worker had also gone into the culinary arts. He was informed by the man that he was employed at the Hilton Hotel. Sunghoon congratulated him, and arched an eyebrow in surprise upon hearing this. Asked his friend's employer, Gianti said it was ordinary. The man responded that he was employed by a modest motel named Jauria after scrunching his cheek in humiliation. Curious as to whether it was a hotel in another country, the man said with an open jaw. In addition to running a medium-sized convenience store, the young man mentioned that their CEO was Korean. Since he would be learning nothing, the chef advised that he go. The apprentice looked down and clarified that his probationary period was still ongoing. When his friend handed him a business card and stated he needed to get in touch with him, he glanced up. Since Yunti knew people who could be of assistance, he proposed that they give each other a call at some point. With his eyes closed, our hero accepted the business card. His friend was thanked by Sunghoon. The man proposed attending the seminar after surveying their surroundings. According to the man, there are no more available seats. In one of the rows, there were 2 empty seats. They could just sit there, the chef remarked, as his top chefs weren't available today. The young man scratched the back of his head and laughed when his friend asked if he really wanted to just register and go home. People gathered in a large auditorium. Someone started checking the microphone. The speaker opened his mouth wide and said that they would like to inform everyone who would be attending the seminar. The intern looked around. The man at the podium said that the seminar would start in 5 minutes and asked everyone to gather by then, pointing to the side. The protagonist said that he needed to go to the restroom. Janti promised to see him again. Sunghoon was washing his hands in the sink when someone's silhouette appeared in the reflection of the mirror. The guy looked up. He flinched when the man behind him said that they hadn't seen each other for a long time. The water from the tap was washing his hands, and the stranger was standing next to him, looking in the mirror. The young man noticed his reflection looking at him. The man called him by name. There was a malicious grin on his face. 8 years ago, there was a pagoda in front of the Yongdong Hotel. The intern was chopping onions on a cutting board. Crossing his arms over his chest, the cook asked if this was the one Gabby brought. The answer was affirmative. Illa grinned and offered to train him. His colleague asked if it was worth it since he would have to leave for work soon. The man raised his hand and said that was exactly why they needed to train him. His colleague said that it would be bad if he was caught. The cook told him not to worry and promised to prepare everything before leaving. The protagonist smiled. Night had fallen. The stars were shining above the hotel. There was a mountain of onions on the table. Sunghoon smiled widely and asked what he needed to do. Illa frowned in displeasure and ordered him to chow. As he made his way towards the exit, the man asked if he should repeat the task. Just as the young man was about to speak, the sound of a door closing silenced him. The sun shone brightly above the hotel, casting its warm rays on the trainee. The cook pointed to the pile of onions and asked what the trainee needed to do before breakfast. Ilu asked why all the vegetables hadn't been chopped yet. The protagonist, clutching his stomach, said that he shouldn't have to do it alone because such tasks require at least 4 people. Grabbing the man by the collar, the man asked if someone was supposed to assist him. The cook, kicking his subordinate, said that he could have stayed and done everything overnight. His colleague crossed his arms over his chest, asked the boy if he really thought he knew everything, and ordered him to do everything right. Sunghoon asked what they didn't like, and that's when things got rough. The boy covered his face with his hands, and Illa swung his leg, and that's when things got tough. For every little mistake, he would be hit on the head with a shovel. Behind him, there was a pile of onions that needed chopping. Gradually, the punishments became more and more irrational. After 3 months of bullying, the young man pursed his lips and realized that he was gradually losing his enthusiasm. The intern slashed the board with a knife and decided to leave the Mongdong Hotel, vowing to forget about becoming a chef. Taking off his uniform and setting it on as they stood in the restroom, the 2 heroes exchanged glances. The man with the glasses asked Sunghoon why his eyes were so red and angry, and if his former colleague was still acting like a chef. Jianji asked Sunghoon to stop, and Ilu turned around to see a smile on his face. As they headed out, the chef sincerely apologized, placing his hands on his friend's shoulders. The man with the glasses asked if everything was alright, since the seminar was almost over and he still hadn't shown up. Closing his eyes, the young man answered that everything was fine. The man stood at the lectern, while the heroes sat in the hall and listened. After thanking them for their time, the speaker moved on to the main topic, which involved the Mitchell and guide appearing on the screen behind him. The man then announced that the guide had started to be published in Korea and expressed regret that this had happened. The intern raised an eyebrow. The speaker then asked why their country should be influenced by a foreign culinary magazine instead of their own. In connection with this event, the speaker raised his hand and announced that they would begin to rate Korean hotels based on the Korean cuisine they offered. The protagonist opened his mouth in shock, while the audience failed to comprehend what he was saying because they were expecting a new rule to appear, and that was it. Leaning over, Jonggi decided that they were not joking. Sunghoon agreed and suggested that all the head chefs would start going crazy. Looking to the side, the guy remembered that the tourism promotion agency had already rated their hotel and realized that now even the kitchen would be rated. Looking around the room, the speaker expressed confidence that some would question the fairness of this rating system, so they would broadcast the entire process on the KVS channel. Pointing at the screen, the speaker said that the results would also be shown on KVS. Frowning, the young man thought that the rating of the hotel kitchens would be shown on television. Gritting his teeth, he realized that, in other words, this was an announcement of a cooking competition. People left the audience holding a booklet in his hands. Jonggi explained that only the top 20 would be ranked and that it would likely only include people the judges knew, because participating chefs had to have less than 10 years of experience. Closing the booklet, the man said it was hard. The intern said his friend had been in the position for 8 years, but he had more experience, so he could participate. Raising his eyebrows, the chef asked if his friend was going to participate. Putting his hand to his chin, the protagonist replied that he needed to think about it. Raising his hand, Sunghoon realized that he couldn't participate because no one in their right mind would allow an ordinary assistant to participate. Closing his eyes, Jianji became upset and said that he would like to cook in the same kitchen with him again. Waving his hand, the man said that he needed to report everything to the head chef. The guy said goodbye, and the guy watched his friend with a smile. Suddenly, he shouted. The phone lying on the table vibrated. The young man put the phone to his ear and heard beeps. The intern raised his eyebrows in disappointment, assuming that his colleague was busy. The voice on the other end of the line asked why they were calling him only now, and frowning, the protagonist explained that the seminar had just ended. The chef, standing in the kitchen, shouted that they had a huge number of tourists from China, so they were short of some ingredients. Sunghoon raised his hand and asked why they didn't order delivery, and the man on the line said that the ingredients were his responsibility. The guy closed his eyes and sighed and said that he would be there soon. The man asked what he had told the juniors, and looking back, the chef replied that he had asked him to buy the ingredients and that the assistant would be back soon. Jinya crossed his arms over his chest, assuming that his subordinate had already learned about the KV's program. A smile appeared on his face. The hotel staff were working in the kitchen, frowning in displeasure. The chef ordered them to work faster while chopping carrots. Jong Man thought that if the younger had returned from the seminar earlier, they wouldn't have been so busy. The blonde looked up tensely. The captain looked at him. When he was called, frowning, the boy asked why he had delegated the purchase of ingredients to the younger instead of doing it himself like before. Raising his eyebrows, the man asked if he still didn't know. The boy's mouth dropped open in confusion, and he replied in the negative. Jinak closed his eyes and sighed heavily, turning away. The chef stated that his subordinate was still a long way off. There was a sea bass lying on the cutting board. The captain scratched his chin as he looked at it. The employee looked at him and asked why he was looking at it so seriously. The man asked if he thought it was wild or farmed, and Jong Man walked over to the table and replied that it looked wild. The fish was over 50 centimeters long and maintained its color. It had a bright pink hue and blue diamonds in the lusk. Jinik closed his eyes and said that this was a very common method of judging, but experts classified it in a different way. The nostril of the fish was divided into 2 parts, and this should not be the case with wild fish. The chef bent down and took a closer look. The head chef said that his subordinate brought them all separately. The captain smiled broadly and said that they had a large catch. The setting sun was shining over GCK Market. The protagonist approached the counter. The seller looked back when she heard his voice. The woman stood up from her chair and asked what her friend was doing there at such a time. Sunghoon replied that he came to see her and asked if the goods for tomorrow had been delivered. On the floor were boxes of Cheongju apples and Sangju apples. The guy extended his hand towards them and asked them to wait a little. He took the apple in his hand. An image of rain falling in an apple orchard appeared in his mind. The young man handed the apple to the clerk and said that they were low on sugar. The woman asked what that meant, since they were Cheongju, the most delicious apples in Korea. Pointing at the fruit, the intern explained that if you touch the apple, you can feel that it had rained heavily. Picking up the apple, the protagonist offered the clerk a taste. Taking the fruit, the clerk was surprised, since she had been in this business for so many years. There was a peeled apple on the plate. The woman put 1 slice in her mouth. Her face grimaced at how sour the apple was. The clerk said that yesterday's apples were much better. Sunho smiled and suggested that yesterday's fruits were from a different batch. Putting his hand on the crate of apples, the young man said that it was better to return them because they were better for juice but not for restaurants. The saleswoman crossed her arms and decided that they needed to be returned as soon as possible and that she would have been in trouble without him, asking how he knew they were sour just by touching them. The young man replied that he knew one method and touched other apples, saying they were good. The intern asked. The woman was to send 3 boxes of these fruits to the hotel, and the saleswoman agreed. While picking up her phone and looking at the phone screen, the protagonist decided to check what else he needed to buy. There was a man standing behind the fish counter. Hearing his name called, Mansa looked around. The man asked what the customer was doing there at such a time, and Sunghoon scratched his head and asked if sales were going well. The saleswoman answered in the affirmative and asked what was wrong. There were crabs in the aquarium, and the young man noticed that the selection was poorer than usual today. Smiling, he said he would like to buy some blue crabs. The salesman called someone on the phone, hung up, and smiled, pointing to the side. Mansa said that there were blue crabs in the store nearby that were caught that morning. The crabs were sitting in the water. Looking at them, the young man asked if they were definitely caught today. The seller said that they were in the sea this morning. The intern put his hand to the crab. An image of an animal sitting on the bottom of the sea appeared in his mind. Suddenly, a net covered it. The fisherman took the net out of the water. There were many crabs in the container. The people went ashore, placing the boxes on the ground. The fisherman handed one of them to the merchant. The protagonist examined the crab, smiling contentedly. He realized that they were really fresh. Happily closing his eyes, the man said that they were not deceiving anyone. Sunghoon asked him for a business card. The seller handed over a map of the fish store, pointing to the side. The guy asked to deliver these crabs to the Joria Hotel. The sun set behind the horizon. The young man left the market. The phone vibrated in his pocket. The intern looked at it in surprise. He picked up the phone, seeing something. The protagonist frowned tensively. A message from Seoul Hospital Hit appeared on the screen, reminding him that his debt was 23 million. Sunghoon put the phone in his pocket. Inside, it was evening, and the lights were on in the Joria Hotel. The guy put on his uniform and entered the kitchen. Jongman was cooking something in a wok. Someone was boiling soup on the stove. Looking back, the lion cook called out to the junior employee, frowning in displeasure. The blonde asked him to hurry up and help him. At the request of his colleague, the young man hurried to bring him a plate of sausages. The next moment, he was already carrying a boiled duck. The man shouted that they were out of gas and needed to replace the cylinder, and the trainee ran to the warehouse, watching him being chased back and forth. Jongman smiled, giving him a slap on the back of the head. Henman asked why his hands had stopped, and asked him to hurry up. The lights went out in many of the hotel windows. The staff were cleaning the kitchen. Wiping his forehead, the protagonist thought that he finally had a chance to take a break. Looking at him, the man offered him to clean up dirty plates that fell into the sink filled with water. The guys were washing dishes. Jangman looked at them with displeasure, putting his hand to his head. The lion cook wondered when things had turned into this, and thought that he had always been in charge of cleaning and washing dishes when he was the youngest there. The man's lips turned down in disappointment. Watching Sunghoon wash the dishes, he wondered how it was possible that the seniors were helping him clean. The man with the plates in his hands asked why they were still wet. Frowning, Jongman said that he would do it right away. The clean dishes stood on the table and sparkled. The guy was putting the plates in the cupboard when someone asked him to come over for a second. The young man looked back. In front of him stood a very displeased lion cook. The man frowned sternly and asked why his colleague, who was simply asked to check in, sat through the seminar until the very end and returned to work so late when otherwise they would not be so overloaded with work. The intern looked down and apologized. Crossing his arms over his chest, Jongman said that the seniors should help him clean because his colleague could not do his job well. He said that in the past, he himself had to stay here until midnight at night and clean alone. The lion cook frowned and said that everyone should do their job and asked the employee to see what had happened because of him. Looking up, the protagonist interrupted him and asked him to speak more quietly. The man gritted his teeth and asked what it meant. He raised his hand to slap the junior, but someone grabbed his hand, stopping it. It turned out that it was Jean Yak. Jongman opened his mouth in shock. The chef furiously knitted his eyebrows and asked what was going on here and whether this was what he had taught him. The lion cook bowed and said no. The captain asked why his subordinate wanted to hit the junior. The blonde explained that the man was 4 years younger than him, and so he wanted to teach him not to be so sluggish at work. The man crossed his arms and remained silent. Hearing the words of apology, Jinnik flinched, closing his eyes. The protagonist said that the seniors wouldn't be so busy today and the cleaning would have been finished much earlier if he had worked a little faster. Bowing, Sunghoon said that it was his fault. The chef looked at him silently, smiling sheepishly. Jongman said that it was indeed true, sighing heavily. The captain said that he understood everything. Pointing a finger at his subordinate, the man shouted that raising a hand to his colleagues is unworthy behavior for a chef. The blonde said that he was sincerely sorry. Frowning, Jinnik suggested that they just clean up here and call it a day. The chef reminded him that there was a cooking test tomorrow and asked the junior to come straight to work instead of going to the store to buy things. The chefs bowed and agreed. There was a work uniform hanging in the closet, and the guy put on his usual clothes. He shuddered when he felt his phone vibrate. Taking it out, the young man looked at the screen. A message appeared. G wrote that they should meet at a cafe near the university and talk. Putting his phone in his pocket, the intern thought that this was all he needed. Putting his hand on his waist, John Man asked where his colleague was going. With his mouth wide open, the lion cook asked why the head chef cherished him so much, and why he needed to come to the test tomorrow. Smiling, the protagonist wanted to say that this was not the case, but the man interrupted him and asked what was the reason why the captain allowed him not to go to the store. Bowing, Sanan said that during the seminar, they said that the P was going to hold a program called Top Chef, and that they would be participating. He added that only those with less than 10 years of experience can participate, and that he would hardly be able to pass the test. John Man smiled widely and asked why Jinnik asked him to come to the test then. Putting his hands behind his back, the guy assumed that the head chef was going to ask him to take the colleague's job for a while. The boy said that he had urgent business and asked permission to leave. Slightly knitting his eyebrows, the line cook gave him his permission. The intern ran down the street, his face turned red. He stopped and put his hands on his knees. The protagonist looked up. In front of him was a coffee shop. Sunan adjusted his jacket and sighed. The guy went inside. The cafe was crowded. Looking ahead, the boy wondered if his girlfriend had arrived. The girl was sitting at the table, looking at her phone. Suddenly, she looked up, seeing her friend in front of her. The woman accused him of being late. The intern frowned in displeasure. She looked at him with a smirk. There was a mug and a plastic cup of cola on the table. The heroes sat opposite each other in silence. Looking up, the protagonist asked what they wanted to talk to him about. The girl took her phone in her hands. She handed it to her friend and asked him to look at something. Sunan picked up the phone from the table. A bead of sweat ran down his tense face. On the lock screen was a photo of his girlfriend with a man hugging her. He closed his eyes and thought that he had known about this for a long time. He handed the phone back and asked if this was all they needed to talk about. The woman took her phone back. Looking down, she said that the man was also a chef. She raised her eyebrows and said that her new fiancé was very different from him. The woman raised her hand and said that he had a completely different perspective. The woman picked up a mug and said that the man was a bit old but worked as a sous chef at a hotel that was in the top 20. The boy frowned angrily. His girlfriend called him a junior chef at a hotel that was barely in the top 100. She raised the mug to her mouth and said that she did not want to invest in a man like him. The intern raised his eyebrows and realized that he was just an investment. Putting the mug on the table, the girl said that was all and asked if her friend had anything to say. Closing his eyes, the protagonist answered negatively. Getting to his feet, the woman said that it was time for her to go. Approaching her ex, she asked him to thank her for opening his eyes to this world. The protagonist looked down. She headed for the exit of the cafe. There was an untouched drink on the table covered in condensation, emptied beer bottles lay on the floor, and an empty bag of chips lay nearby. Sihun was sleeping on the mattress. Suddenly, he woke up and opened his eyes wide, putting his hand to his head, which was hurting terribly. The guy decided to check what time it was. The time appeared on the screen. It was 6:30 in the morning. The young man realized that he was an hour and a half late. Grabbing his jeans, the intern realized that he needed to run to the store for food. Suddenly, he shuddered. A memory of them standing in the kitchen flashed through his mind with Jinnik telling him that he didn't need to go shopping because there was a cooking test. Closing his eyes and letting out a sigh of relief, the protagonist realized that he needed to work instead of going shopping. A smile appeared on his face. Putting his hands on his hips, Sunan decided to do his best. Clouds were floating above the jewelry hotel. The cooks were running around the kitchen. Someone was putting plates in the cupboard. The guy turned around. The head chef was standing in front of him. At that moment, the captain turned away. People with groceries ran into the kitchen. They thought that their colleague was having a hard time being in charge of shopping all this time. Hands on the table, the young man asked them to put the ingredients in the refrigerator. The cooks were standing in the kitchen. One of them yawned. Suddenly, someone opened the door. John Man, who was late, ran into the kitchen frowning. Sangha asked why he was late again. The line cook replied that he would change in 2 minutes. The trainee looked up. The other staff were discussing their colleague's tardiness, calling it another reason to yell at him. The man abruptly opened the door, tying his apron. The blond man said that he arrived at exactly 8. Sangha gritted his teeth in displeasure, mentally insulting him. Jinak brought his fist to his mouth and cleared his throat. John Man put on his chef's hat in fear. He hurried to take his place among the cooks. Standing in front of them, the head chef announced that the Food Safety Administration had decided to select the top 20 hotel kitchens. Crossing his arms, the captain added that they would select them through a competition program called Best Chef, which would be broadcast on KBC and in which anyone with sufficient experience could participate. Suna looked at his smiling colleague in surprise. The man explained that their hotel was not even in the top 50, so this was their chance to improve the hotel's reputation. The sous chef nudged his fellow kitchen chef, hearing that he would not be able to participate in the competition. The man's mouth dropped open in surprise. Pointing at himself, John Man declared that he met all the requirements. Jinnik frowned in displeasure. The line cook said that he had only been working for 6 years and was suitable for participating in the competition. Pointing at himself, the blond man promised not to let them down and to improve the hotel's reputation. The head chef averted his gaze and said that his subordinate was mistaken because they hadn't decided on a representative for the hotel yet. Jungman's eyes widened in shock as he asked who would be that representative. The captain averted his gaze. The protagonist flinched at being called. The man's brows furrowed sternly, as if reminded of the culinary test. In shock, the line chef looked at his colleague after Jinnik announced that they would have a test, the winner of which would be the hotel's representative. The chef was chopping onions with a tense face, and the blonde turned away to watch Sunghoon make soup. The man thought he was very lucky, so he cranked up his speed, hoping to pass the test. The head chef scowled and announced that the representative would be the winner of this cooking test. John Man pointed to his colleague and asked if it was clear that they shouldn't compete since he should be the one to take part. The guy scowled in response. The line chef argued that his colleague was inexperienced and unfit to compete against him. The captain closed his eyes and explained that the young man had no issue with the terms of participation and that they were on equal footing. He promised to make a decision after they finished the task. Standing in front of his subordinates, the man asked them to prepare breakfast for a group of Chinese tourists who arrived yesterday and stayed at the hotel. Their menu would be placed in the lobby. John Man frowned. The intern looked forward resolutely. The one whose menu sold the most would be the representative. Jinnik asked if there were any objections. The line cook smirked and answered negatively, pointing a finger at his assistant. The head chef asked what about him. The protagonist closed his eyes sternly, knitting his eyebrows. He answered negatively. The captain smiled, and the guy shuddered, frowning menacingly. The man said that for dinner those tourists had chicken, duck, and beer on the menu, and this should be taken into account. Light food should be made. The contestants had to make a light breakfast. There were bowls of chopped vegetables on the table. Throwing them into the pot, the blonde thought that he could handle it. Stirring the soup, John Man thought that for the past 2 years, he had only been assigned to make soup, which made him the most outstanding chef in this hotel. The line cook raised the ladle to his mouth to taste the soup. The soup was boiling in the pot. The blonde thought that it tasted very good and decided to make sandwiches as well. Looking at his competitor, the man wondered what he had been doing all this time. Peas were boiling in one pot, and rice soup was heating up in another. Holding a stack of bread, John Man asked what kind of baby food this was. The protagonist took the boiled peas out of the water and poured them into a bowl of cold water. Sunu opened the pod to get the peas. The peas fell into the bowl. The guy poured them into a bowl and added water. There was a small amount of sugar in the spoon. The young man turned on the mixer. The device began to rotate, turning the peas into a smoothie. The lid of the mixer opened. The intern poured the smoothie into a glass of ice. After looking at it, the chef decided to move on to the rice soup. Steam rose above the pan. The protagonist picked up a full plate of soup in his hands. After peppering the soup, Sunghoon decided to add some more salt and green onions. On the table, there was a glass of smoothie and a bowl of soup. Approaching the competitor, the line cook asked what that peculiar smell was and whether it matched the hotel. Closing his eyes, he asked to look at his menu on the table. There was cheese soup and a plate of sandwiches. Pointing at himself, the blond man declared that his menu would sell better than this poor man's food and thought that his colleague was wasting his chance that Jinnak had given him. Looking around, the man thought that the head chef had decided to help him out by making breakfast, the test menu. Putting his hand on his belt, Hunan asked what it looked like. The captain asked what he needed to look at. Looking at the rice soup and pea soup, the chef du party asked if there would be people in the hotel who would like it and if such a menu would kill anyone. Raising his eyebrows, the man realized that his colleague had never seen these dishes before and asked what he thought of them. There was ice in the pea smoothie. Hunan asked what kind of hotel would even offer this for breakfast since it was impossible to imagine even as a dessert. Jinnik said that he thought he had the experience of a man who had worked in the kitchen for 25 years. The chef du party opened his mouth in surprise and asked what that meant. There were dishes from 2 menus on the table. Next to them were stickers with letters and arrows. The head chef, crossing his arms over his chest, reminded them that the one whose menu collected more orders would be the hotel's representative in the competition. Chinese tourists entered the hotel cafe. They looked at the menu options in surprise. Hearing that, they ordered 1 menu and 4 of menu B. John Man clenched his fist in joy. People continued to order menu B. The lion cook constantly poured soup into the bowls and made sandwiches. He smiled, thinking that everything was happening as expected. The Chinese man leaned over the bowl of soup. No matter what country they were from, tourists would always choose soup and sandwiches. Looking at his competitor, the blonde man thought that he would never be able to win with a menu that was ordered only once. The people went to the menu. The man asked what they would like to eat. His friend said that he drank too much yesterday, so he should eat something light and healthy for the body. They stopped in front of the counter with 2 menus. The protagonist closed his eyes and wondered if his menu was too bold. Putting his hand on his shoulder, Sang-gun praised him and said that this menu did not suit their hotel. Looking down, Sang-hun agreed with him. Hearing that someone ordered 10 of menu B, the hero's mouth opened in shock. They looked ahead in surprise. Another 10 orders came in. The guy raised his eyebrows in confusion. Jinnik smirked and thought that the show had begun. Imagining drunk people entering the cafe, the head chef thought that now 80% of the guests were Chinese, who worked for Hansen Company and came on vacation. This was their first visit to Korea. There were 2 types of menus on the table. Most likely, the Chinese would choose the dishes that suited them best, not the ones that were hard to chew. The young man poured soup into a bowl. He prepared this menu with people in mind. There was a bowl of hot soup and soy milk on the tray. The Chinese happily ate their breakfast. Holding a smoothie in his hands, the man smiled. Sunu and Hun Man widened their eyes in shock when they heard that many people ordered menu B. Someone asked if there were any dishes left on the menu. The intern smiled and said that they would be ready soon. At this time, John Man frowned tensely. The lion cook thought that this was simply impossible. A drop of sweat slid down his cheek. The cook stood in the kitchen in front of their boss, holding a paper in his hands. Jinnik decided to announce the results. The protagonist was happy while his competitor looked uncertain. Gritting his teeth, the blonde man couldn't believe that his soup and sandwiches were losing to the rice porridge with peas. The head chef frowned and decided to read out the results. A hotel employee burst into the kitchen and interrupted him, saying that the CEO wanted to see him. The captain looked around and asked if it was really that urgent. There were people standing in the hotel lobby. The men shook hands. One of them got into the car, and they said goodbye. The CEO walked back into the hotel. Jinnik approached him and asked why he was called. The man put his hand on his shoulder, smiling widely. The CEO praised him for his excellent work. The hotel employee said that the company chairman, Hansen, was in a great mood thanks to today's breakfast. The head chef smiled. The man raised his eyebrows and explained that the Chinese had been to some Korean hotels before, but none of them served authentic Chinese cuisine, so the company chairman had booked a room in this hotel for 6,000 guests for 2 months. Jinnik looked down happily. Walking down the hotel corridor, he thought that his subordinate was a very good person, and his guess was correct. Hearing the vibration, the head chef looked in his pocket. The captain looked at the phone screen and saw that it was an unfamiliar number. The man put the phone to his ear, smiling. The director of the KBC show greeted him. Frowning, Jinnik said that it was an honor for him. Hyunwoo explained that he was calling about the program, Top Chef, and that there were several changes to their program. Raising his eyebrows in surprise, the head chef asked what the changes were. The producer said that they changed the rules, and now 2 people could participate in the show. The captain thoughtfully put his hand on his belt. Looking ahead, he clarified if they needed to send 2 chefs. The director explained that there would be both team and individual tasks, and for everything to go well, they needed to send 2 people at once. Smiling widely, Hyuna asked if they knew what they would lose if they did not participate in the show. The man frowned in displeasure. After some time, he stood in front of his subordinates. Jinnik crossed his arms and explained that he had to take a break and would announce the results shortly. Looking at his colleagues, the head chef explained that today's competition was their first since they started working there, and asked how they felt. With an angry frown, John Man said that his dishes were perfect and suggested that the guests did not choose his menu because they were simple country bumpkins who were not used to living in a hotel. Sang-gu clenched his teeth in anger. The sous chef grabbed his subordinate by the collar, waving him off. The lion cook asked if that was not the case and stated that the company's executives chose his menu, and the workers chose the competitor's menu. The protest looked down, clenching his fist. The man stated that the contestants still did not understand what he did wrong. Jinnik stepped between them and asked them to calm down, stating that this was not about who was worse but about who was better. The head chef asked his colleague to behave properly and not to grab others by the collar. Sangha looked down and apologized. Turning to his junior, the captain asked what he thought. Keeping a calm expression, Sanghoon said that Koreans always order ramen or kimchi when visiting other countries, so he wanted to cook a breakfast that Chinese guests might like. The guy added that it probably created a bad impression because of cooking such an informal meal and apologized. The man smiled, closing his eyes. Jinik said that if it was about the elegance of the hotel, then Jman's menu was the right choice, and if you think about the guests, then his menu was also good. The head chef added that the first participant did not even think about what the guests needed because he only cared about maintaining the standard. The line chef gritted his teeth in displeasure. The captain explained that his competitor's menu was great, but the Chinese don't like cold food, so putting ice cubes in soy milk was a bad idea. The intern raised his eyebrows in surprise. Closing his eyes, the man explained that the representative was originally supposed to be the one with more orders, but he had just received a call from the channel saying that each hotel could now send 2 representatives. The participants in the cooking test gaped in amazement. Smiling widely, Jinik said that they would now be on the same team and wished them to return with the best result for their hotel. The sun was shining on the resort hotel. The chefs had gathered in the hall. The film crew was nearby. The protagonist frowned tensely, thinking that there were too many people here. Sunan looked away. Jongman bowed, attracting the attention of the chefs from the other hotels. Crossing his arms over his chest, the guy thought that this was a good opportunity to become part of the program and asked what kind of tasks there would be. 2 people approached him. Ji noticed her ex with a surprised frown. Heyman was standing next to her. The young man looked at them, and the heroes looked at each other tensely, frowning. The intern realized that his friend was also participating in this program as a representative of the hotel. The sous chef, with his mouth open, asked what the assistant was doing here, who was still on probation. The girl asked him not to worry about it. The man said that he did not want to see him here. The main character turned away. The woman asked her fiancé not to embarrass her, and to talk to her off to the side. The man in the chef's hat waved his hand, smiling widely. Yunti was glad that his friend was here too. Shaking his friend's hand, the chef asked how he managed to participate in the show. Sunan replied that the rules suddenly changed and he was able to join. Raising his eyebrows, the man remembered that now 2 people from the hotel could participate in the show. He waved his hand and said that the competition was about to start, and decided to do everything in their power. Approaching his colleague, Jongman asked if it was the chef from the Hilton Hotel. The guy confirmed it. The lights were on in the room. Suddenly, the lamps went out. Looking up, the lion cook asked why they turned off the lights. The young man assumed that filming was about to begin. A spotlight came on under the ceiling. In the other corner of the room, exactly the same spotlight came on. The light fell on the large doors opening them. The man entered the room, and the intern's mouth fell open in surprise. Raising his hand, Munin thanked everyone for coming. It was the chef who worked at the Hayes restaurant in Manhattan, a 3-star Michelin hotel. The woman came out to the journalists, and was surprised that there were so many young guys here. Smiling, Yunin hoped that everyone would be healthy. She had 40 years of experience. The man put his hand on the wall, and said that it was getting hot in here. Jisung raised his eyebrows and greeted everyone, hoping that all the contestants would show their best skills. This man had 30 years of experience, and was the head chef of the Hilton Hotel. Jman's mouth dropped open in shock. The protagonist thought that this was the first Korean to win first place in a foreign hotel. The judge smiled, and said that by the end of the day, more than half of the contestants would go home. The man waved his hand and asked how anyone could come here with the intention of going home, and decided that everyone came here with the desire to be the best. The black TV screen sparkled. This was one of the prizes that the winner would receive. The other prize was a free interior design from an enterprise. The kitchen had all the necessary cooking equipment. Munin closed his eyes and said that there was something else waiting for them. Pointing to the screen, the man said that the winner would receive 100 million. Sihoon's mouth dropped open in surprise. He imagined money raining down on him from the sky. Raising his hand, the judge announced that the first task was behind him. People walked into another room. On the table were plates with various foods. Next to each plate was a number. Looking at them, the boy wondered what all of this was. Crossing his arms, Mung stated that buying ingredients is the basis for a chef. There are times when a chef buys the ingredients themselves, or buys them through suppliers, or leaves it to the juniors. Looking at the contestants, the man explained that even chefs with less than 10 years of experience can judge the level of a hotel just by looking at the ingredients used. The young man looked ahead silently. The first task is to guess the names of the ingredients. Pointing to the table, Jisung said that the contestants need to sit at the table and write down the names of 50 ingredients according to the number on the plate. The trainee frowned. The judge said that they could touch them, but they could not cut them or eat them, and they had 15 minutes to complete the task. On command, the protagonist walked forward, looking at the ingredients. The man asked what they were. His girlfriend said that she had never seen anything like that before. Sunghoon picked up the fruit. Looking at it, he thought it was strange. The man wrote down on the paper, frowning tensely. Jongman tried to understand. He was number 42 and was outraged that there were so many types of fish. Gritting his teeth, the lion cook thought that he was in charge of soups, so he knew all kinds of vegetables, but he knew nothing about fruits and fish, which he had never even touched. The man looked up, looking at his competitor. The blond man wondered if he really knew everything since he was writing so quickly. Looking at his paper, Jongman wondered if he should cheat a little. The cameraman approached them and started filming their tests. The lion cook thought there were too many cameras. He looked at the screen and realized he was running out of time. The guy brought his pen to the paper and stopped. The young man frowned. A drop of sweat ran down his cheek. The trainee thought he recognized most of the ingredients, but two products were unusual. The strange fruits were deliberately placed next to each other. Wiping his forehead, the protagonist remembered reading about these ingredients and that they were tropical fruits. The pen stopped at the paper. Sunghoon clenched his fist. Jason crossed his arms and shouted that time was up and asked the contestants to give them their work. Jahi closed her eyes. Heyman pursed his lips in displeasure. Yuni smiled. Jongman put his hands to his head in fear. The man handed the judges a paper, looking away. Yunnan asked if they were going to determine the ranking after combining the scores of the chefs from one hotel. The man smiled and confirmed it, putting his hands behind his back. Hyuna said that this and the next task would be done quickly, so they would do it in groups. Looking at him, the woman said that it was a great idea and asked if they had too many contestants. The show director asked her to take a rest while they checked the work. Waving his hand, Mung said that they would announce the results, which would be shown on the monitor, except for first place. Jongman frowned. His name was on the list. The paper said that he had 28 points out of 50. The lion cook clutched his head and realized that he was doomed because he was ranked 148th. The couple from the Pia Hotel stood behind him. Ji smiled. She had 41 points. Heyman smirked. He had 43 points. The blond man looked at them with displeasure, wondering why they were acting like lovers during a competition. The girl looked away. The main character was standing at the end of the room. He was looking at the list. The woman mentally asked him to stop looking for his name and expressed her confidence that he was in last place. She looked ahead. The boy's name was on the list of participants. Seeing his result, Ji's eyes widened in shock. He had 48 points out of 50. Jongman's mouth dropped open in amazement, not understanding how this was possible. The girl frowned in confusion, looking at her ex. The woman thought that she had started cooking much earlier than him, and wondered how he managed to get so many points. Sunghoon closed his eyes. The contestants were confused about who he was and what kind of hotel jewelry it was. Smiling, Noonan prepared to announce first place. Wai looked forward as he was announced as the first place winner. Raising her eyebrows, Yunan called the Hilton Hotel special for having an employee who managed to get 49 points. Jisung stated that it was just average and was upset that his student did not get the maximum points. Holding a gold coin in his hands, the judge announced that the winner of this task would not participate in the next round. The man pinned a badge to the chef's shirt. Under the badge was a name tag. Looking around, Mung asked what they should do with the rest of the contestants. Closing his eyes, the Hilton Hotel chef explained that the task was to evaluate them individually. The contestants gaped in shock when they heard that the judges would be adding up the scores of 2 contestants from each hotel, and those who scored less than 75 would be sent back. Jisun, with his mouth wide open, praised those who were eliminated for their efforts. The man folded the pile of papers together. Looking through the exam papers, the girl thought that there was a question that was difficult for her to answer. She picked up the main character's work. On the sheet, numbers were crossed out with the captions, Dragon Fruit, and Ramatam. Putting her hand to her chin, the girl thought that the correct answers were Longan and Sapadilla. Taking the phone in her hand, the stranger decided that this simply could not be true. The screen showed those same tropical fruits and their names. Looking at the paper again, the girl realized that this was the correct answer, but the contestant used high words, so his answers were marked incorrect. Sitting on the couch, the girl was glad that he managed to pass this test. Putting his hand on his chest, Jiman realized that he was able to move on only because of his colleague. The man frowned. looking at his competitor. The lion cook asked if he had cheated. The protagonist replied that he would not do such a thing. Leaning towards him, the blonde suggested that Yunti helped him pass the test. Hearing a negative answer, the cook suggested that they return to the resort hotel since they were finished. The sunset sky hung over the city. Night had fallen. Sunghoon was standing on the balcony. In his hands was a can of soda. Sitting behind him, Jong-man asked if they had broken up since the girl who looked like his girlfriend was with another man. The guy narrowed his eyes in displeasure. He took a sip from the can, frowning. The lion cook was indignant that the junior was ignoring him and drinking without even answering. Holding the can up in front of him, the blonde man said that the man holding hands with Ji seemed indecent to him. Taking a sip and remembering the couple, the man said that he knew the man well because they went to school together, and called him someone who seduces many girls. He assumed that she simply found a replacement for her ex, but this was a mistake. The young man was looking down from the balcony. The intern said that this was natural. Jong-man looked at him in surprise. Holding a can of soda, the protagonist said that dating her was his choice, but they broke up because she was tired of him. However, he had no grudges or hidden feelings. Remembering how the girl and her new fiancé stood behind him, Sunghoon thought that they had underestimated them throughout the competition. Then the man smirked and slightly knitted his eyebrows. The guy squeezed the aluminum can in his hand, frowning. He decided that he couldn't forgive them for this. The sun rose over the city. The lion cook was sleeping on the bed. The young man was sitting and reading a book. The intern squinted. He had a notebook with notes in his hands. The cook closed his eyes. 7 years ago, the sun's rays illuminated the hospital. Adjusting his glasses, the doctor said that he was very sorry to have to say this. Standing in front of the protagonist's family, the doctor explained that the cancer had spread to other organs, so recovery was impossible. Sunghoon frowned in disappointment. His mother began to cry. The girl covered her face with her hands. Dong-gak looked down, folding his hands with and four attached. The man with cancer asked how much time he had left. The doctor replied that he had 6 months. The man squinted. He looked up. The boy looked at his dying father. An airplane was flying in the sky. The boy was walking down the street with his father. The future cook wrote down everything he said about fruits in a notebook. They tasted the dish in a cafe. The protagonist picked up a bell pepper at the market. The sun went down. The heroes watched the sunset. They held hands. An incredibly beautiful orange sky hung above them. Dong-gak was lying on a hospital bed. His wife and daughter were crying, begging him not to die. With dry lips, the man called his son. He handed him a notebook with a trembling hand. Crying, Sunghoon took it. The father said that he had been collecting these recipes all his life and asked his son to use them wisely. Smiling, the cancer patient asked him to become a great chef. The family bent over the body of the deceased Dong-gak. The guy was holding a notebook in his hands. The young man tied an apron behind his back. There was a name tag hanging on his shirt. The intern looked at himself in the mirror. Jong-man continued to sleep, drooling. The lights in the hotel were turned off. Suddenly, a loud sound came from the speakers under the ceiling. Opening his eyes, the lion cook asked what happened. The voice said that the time of the new round had changed to 5:15 minutes. The protagonist furrowed his brows in determination. The voice asked everyone to go down to the first floor within 5 minutes. The blonde wiped his drool and asked why it was necessary to do this now. Sunghoon put on his chef's hat. Opening the door, he decided to go down first, and asked his partner to hurry up because there were only 5 minutes left. Minutes left. The man put on his rope. The judges were sitting at the table surrounded by cameramen. Yunin frowned. Jisung put his hands on the table. Suddenly, something made his mouth open in surprise. The guy came down from the second floor. The young man approached the judge's table. The man furrowed his brows sternly, handing the participant a number. The Hilton Hotel chef asked him to take it and sit on the left. Looking at the number, the trainee thought that it helped that he usually had to wake up very early to buy ingredients. Hearing someone's excited voice, the protagonist looked back. Approaching him, Jang-gi asked if his friend was going to displace him from the first place. Sunghoon replied that he simply could not sleep sitting on the sofa. The chef said that his friend worked hard, guessing the ingredients, and explained that it was an easy task for him because his hotel had most of these ingredients. The guy assumed that his old acquaintance was bragging because he was jealous. People walked down the stairs quickly. The girls were dressing in a hurry. The man with his mouth wide open asked them to stop. Crossing his arms, Msung declared that their uniforms must be worn properly because anyone who is not perfect will not be able to pass the test. Pointing at the mirror, The judge asked them to come back after they had adjusted their uniforms. Smiling, Yunin assumed that it was time. Jing looked at his wristwatch. The hands showed 15 minutes past 5. Standing up from the table, the judge declared that that was all for now. The chefs looked at him. Many of those who had not had time to prepare were barred from entering the room. Frowning sternly, the man explained that the number of those who would pass this surprise test was exactly 7. These 7 would be allowed to be the first to present their cuisine to the jury. The young man's mouth dropped open in surprise. Sunghoon felt awkward when they started talking about him. His friend smiled, congratulating him. Jason crossed his arms over his chest, saying that was all. Another chef took off his hat in disappointment, cursing. The man looked at him silently. He put his hand in his pocket and asked again. Suddenly, he pointed at the cameraman, calling him over. He looked at the screen, listening to the chef's words. Then Jen glared at the guy. Both chefs tensed up. A badge of one of them was visible. The man covered his eyes and addressed them. He immediately took away their badges, stunning them. Jisung threw the badges, saying that they were eliminated from the show. The badges fell to the floor. The chefs, dumbfounded, asked questions and apologized. To this, the man raised his foot, then stepped on the badges, breaking them. After this, the chefs were scared. Adjusting his tie, Jisung praised them. He left, leaving them in despair. The cameraman crossed his arms over his chest, deciding to save this scene. He smiled, wanting more incidents like this. It turned out that their ratings would skyrocket. The kitchen was shown. A crowd of chefs had gathered, and it was announced that they could cook here. The man in glasses held a sheet in his hand, talking about the time the dish would be presented. Sunghoon and his friend smiled. Suddenly, the young man tensed up, deciding to take the chance. After all, here he was, thinking. He closed his eyes and thought. The jury appeared. The cameraman looked at the sheet, talking to them. Suddenly, the woman noticed something. The man was happy with Sunghoon's results. Jisung was thoughtfully looking at the sheet. A photo of the young man was shown. The man frowned, thinking that he had seen his name somewhere. The cameraman was addressed through an earpiece, and everyone was getting ready for the scene. Jung sat with his arms crossed. When the start was announced, closed doors were shown. Here, Sunghoon came out with a dish. He stood in front of the jury. It seemed that the young man was calm because he was smiling. Jisung disinterestedly asked him to introduce himself. With his hands behind his back, he introduced himself. Another man smiled, asking for his dish. Immediately, the young man reached for the lid of the dish and opened it. It turned out there were 3 pieces of meat. Jisung was serious and asked the reason for choosing this dish. Sunghoon explained his decision with an awkward smile. The man then thought about it. Suddenly, the boy became serious, confirming that he was now the assistant chef. He was surprised by Jisung's next words. His face darkened, and many thoughts were spinning in his head. The man sat with his arms crossed while another judge examined the dish. The man in the gray suit smiled, noticing that the boy mentioned a book. Sunghoon frowned at this, thinking that his dish was getting cold. He then firmly declared to himself that he would make them try the food. The woman was surprised by his remark, asking if he learned anything. Suddenly, the boy confidently declared that he learned everything from the man. The judge raised an eyebrow, grinning. Jisung was amazed at this. The woman clutched her head in despair. The man tensely offered everyone to try the food. The boy's dish was shown. The judges gathered around him, holding chopsticks. Sunghoon watched tensely. Jisung made an emotionless comment on the food. He picked up a piece with his chopsticks. The man took a small bite. He chewed with his eyes closed. Suddenly, Jisung opened his eyes. The piece of meat approached the sauce. It was dipped. The man took a small bite. The woman chewed. Jisung did the same. Now his eyes widened. The boy sat down, taking out dessert. It turned out to be in 3 cups. The man willingly took one of. Here's the text with corrected punctuation. Then, Jisung drinks it gradually. Sunghoon watches tensely. The man smiles. Everyone sits contentedly. Jason crosses his arms, asking if this was his idea. Embarrassed, the boy says he saw it in a manual. He bows when he is allowed to go. Jason looks at him thoughtfully. The director smiles, telling the cameraman not to film. The participants, one by one, suddenly the man becomes furious. Curly raises an eyebrow. Jason crosses his arms and asks the woman for her opinion. She looks away, commenting on the situation. The man, however, is thoughtful and speculative. A piece of meat is revealed, and an analysis of the dish is made. Jisung raises his head, asking the director a question. He frowns, stating that he felt a rich flavor. Suddenly, the man looks down, thinking he remembers the piece of meat that was delicious. Jisung looks at his neighbor, who states that it is kiwi. Len Juri raises a finger, expressing his thought. Kiwis are revealed. The man smiles, expressing his surprise. Jisung silently lowers his head, closing his eyes. He looks away, claiming that he has changed his mind. Looking at the director, he states his idea. Curly hesitates. After that, the man only looks away, asking about the second task. Smiling, the man in the gray suit states that he has strange expectations, thanks to Saemin. The woman raises an eyebrow, agreeing. Jisun just looks away, deciding that this is how it should be. The director tenses up. The cook walks down the hallway. He thinks awkwardly. Here, the young man smiles, saying that he was excited. It shows what happened 2 hours ago. He puts his hand on the meat, closing his eyes. Suddenly, a field with cows is shown. Smiling, the young man decides that there is no problem with the meat. He notices mushrooms in the back. Then, Sunghoon approaches them, wondering whether to add them to the dish. Here, the young man closes his eyes, thinking. Pine branches appear. Opening one eye, he is perplexed. Suddenly, he starts sorting through the mushrooms, being sure that they are royal cherries. Sunghoon examines them. It turns out that one mushroom is different, and it is matsu. The young man picks it up, thinking. Suddenly, he frowns with determination, ready to use the mushroom for the dish. He starts cooking. Now, Sanin is already taking off his shoes. He takes off his cap, sighing. The young man opens his eyes when he is addressed. An angry guy stands in front of him, cursing. To this, Sunghoon calmly tells him that he cooked everything well. The cook purses his lips in displeasure. He tenses up. Suddenly, memories of Sunghoon from yesterday appear. The young man passes by, deciding to take a break. The cook looks down in confusion. It turns out that he has received a message. While Sunghoon is undressing, he is being called. Then he tenses up when he is told that they want to see him. He turns his head in surprise. The guy looks at his phone, having many questions. The young man frowns, believing that those who fail will be given a second chance. He puts his hand on the guy's shoulder, supporting him. To this, the cook smiles, agreeing. Sunan gives him a thumbs up, and he is embarrassed. Suddenly, his phone starts vibrating. He looks questioningly at his pocket, taking out his gadget. The young man thinks about postponing the second task. Then he sees a message about an interview. Sunan calmly answers. He puts the phone away, deciding to rest before the interview. The guy looks at him awkwardly. A building with lights on appears. Sihun goes down the stairs. He turns around, noticing a girl. It turns out that it is Mina, the scriptwriter who wrote to him. The young man bows, greeting her. They find themselves in a cafeteria. Sunan looks tense. He nervously looks away. Smiling, Mina asks if her interlocutor is nervous. To this, the young man awkwardly says that this is his first interview. The girl kindly asks if he worked in the hotel kitchen for 4 years. Looking away, the young man confirms this. At this point, Mina begins to be perplexed. She smirks, deciding to ask something more difficult while Sunghoon continues to be nervous. A question is asked about whether he felt offended. Smiling awkwardly, the young man shares his feelings. Suddenly, Mana is confused again. She holds a piece of paper in her hands, talking about the chef's dish. Here, the young man smiles, talking about it, listening attentively. The girl asks why he did not tell the judges about what he just said. Sihun looks away, saying that he just wanted them to try his dish. Mina smiles sweetly at him, and it turns out that he saved part of his explanation. Now, she professionally asks if the chef lied about the manna. Sunan is embarrassed, asking what she thinks. The girl only closes her eyes, realizing that her interlocutor does not know how to lie. Smiling, she asks the last question. The young man thoughtfully lowers his gaze. His hands are shaking. Then, smirking, he decisively declares that he will definitely be first. The girl is surprised by this. She straightens the sheets, ending the interview. The young men bow to each other. Sunan leaves, climbing the stairs. Watching him go, Mina asks the cameraman for his opinion. He looks away, noticing that this is just a termination. Looking at one point, the girl thinks that this is something else. She remembers the boy's face. At that moment, the cameraman feels awkward and confused. Mina smiles, believing that the boy has a reason for such statements. He holds on to the railing, moving away. At this point, Mina resolutely frowns, deciding to expose him. The cameraman turns his attention to her, looking questioningly. It turns out that she is simply talking to herself. There stands the boy. With his dish, he tries to calm down, closing his eyes. The waiting jury members appear. The woman adjusts her glasses, noticing that the chef is also from Georgia. Jason turns to the director, asking if this is the last participant. He calmly expresses a desire to finish with him quickly. After that, the director calls the chef through the earpiece. The doors swing open suddenly, and the woman is taken aback. The guy resolutely moves forward. The wheels of the tray are spinning vigorously. He stands in front of the judges, and the man laughs awkwardly. The chef confidently opens the lid, deciding to show them the dish. The food is already visible. It turns out to be barbecue pork ribs with grilled shrimp. Jason crosses his arms over his chest, examining the dish. Hyunwoo, trying to hide his disappointment, says that the dish was amazing, but in fact, he is sad that it was another meat-based dish. Jisung suddenly calls out to Hyunwoo after asking the man if the rest of the participants would see the score. Hyunwoo replies by saying that only 7 people who took the test were sent at the same time, so they would see them during the broadcast. Frowning, Jisung suggests not to be too strict in this case. Johnman, who served the barbecue, chuckles, introducing himself as a chef with 6 years of experience and in charge of soups. Jisung frowns, asking if he thought that being in charge of soups for 6 years was a long time. Youngman replies, saying that their seniors always surpassed him, which made it difficult to advance. Nanung smiles and asks him to tell them about his dish. The guy frowns and asks himself if he could tell them about it, much like Sunghoon. Having decided he could, he slightly surprises Munsung by telling him that his dish was made from a comic book series. Yoo-jun stands up, saying that they do not care about the story because the most important thing is the taste. Youngman grins, watching the judges move. They begin to put on gloves, after which Jisung takes one of the ribs in his hands and immediately bites off a piece. The taste of the meat surprises him a little. Nanung, unlike him, takes a shrimp and, in a second, separates the head of the shrimp, after which he bites into the flesh of the shrimp. But after trying it, Munsun becomes dissatisfied. At this time, Yunin is separating the ribs, and when she sees the internal state of the meat, the woman sighs tiredly. Johnman, seeing this, frowns, not understanding why no one is eating. When Jason is already wiping his mouth with a handkerchief, the guy suddenly shouts, saying that he has prepared an addition to the dish. The dissatisfied judge asks what it is. Smiling broadly, Johnman says that he has prepared a remake of a military song from a real person, and when he begins to sing, it shocks the judges. The guy, instead of singing normally, screams like a savage, which greatly angers Yoonjun. So she orders him to shut up. Without holding back her anger, the woman says that the guy is really annoying her. Jisung, deciding to interrupt his partner, calls out to Johnman, and a moment later, he frowns angrily, asking the guy what he is allowing himself to do. The guy is scared when the judge calls him an idiot who does not know the basics of cooking. Then he points to the dish, and asks the guy if he has tried his dish. Jisung then points at the member, saying that his dish is terrible, that he cooked it for so long as if he was playing with the food. Did he extract the blood from the back ribs? Johnman worriedly says that he didn't have time because it took 20 minutes just to boil the back ribs. The guy can't help but look at his dish when Jisung says that there would still be blood left, and if he had eyes, he better look and see something reddish in the ribs. Unhappy, Yeojun says that he also didn't get rid of the smell and just poured wine into the rice after boiling it. Yoon-sung frowns and says that he simply couldn't be a chef with 6 years of experience, and in general, if he had boiled it with spices like bay leaf, garlic, and pepper instead of SAU, the disgusting smell would have disappeared. Jongnan becomes nervous but doesn't say a word. Looking at the shrimp, Manson says that it is undercooked because it should have just been cooked with salt. Angrily, the judge tells the contestant that before thinking about adding fried shrimp to pork ribs, he should have thought about compatibility by removing them from the grill and adding oil. Youngman is horrified, looking at his dish. Jisung points at the guy and tells him to eat it all tonight, not to leave anything, and to realize his mistakes while eating this horror. The guy bows his head, saying that he will do so. Then he takes the cart and heads for the exit. Jisung frowns, saying that something is wrong with this hotel because a guy with 6 years of experience is much worse than someone with 4 years of experience. Manson agrees with him. Yunin angrily says that it would also be hard for the hotel to endure because the hard work of the head chef is no joke. Jing interrupts the woman, saying that not only the head chef's job is hard, but the person supervising him is probably hurt too. The man grits his teeth, realizing that he had expected too much from a 4-star hotel. At this time, Sang-hun is reading his book. He soon closes it, looking at the person who comes in. It turns out to be a disappointed young man. Prad asked how it went. The guy said nothing, barely containing his disappointment and sadness. Passing by the protagonist, the guy mentioned that he was thinking about home. Afterwards, he offered the protagonist something to eat, but he refused. Sunghoon, not noticing the sad expression on his face, told his partner to rest because tomorrow it would all start again. The events take us to the next day. The protagonist was adjusting his uniform when he looked back at John Man, asking him if he was okay. John Man looked at the protagonist and said that he could not sleep. Sunghoon surprised the guy by saying that there was an energy drink in the fridge that he could drink because, since the program was starting again, he needed to get ready. The protagonist soon found himself at the gate, which swung open. Inside, there were numerous kitchen appliances and devices, with the newest items displayed on the tables. The cooks were amazed by what they saw, comparing the hall to a banquet. Menson, who was standing nearby, greeted everyone. The man waved his hands and said that they would complete the second task here. The protagonist became serious upon hearing this. Menson extended his finger, saying that their task would be to cook man as a team. The judge sat at a distance, watching the participants, to whom Menson, smiling, announced the essence of the task. Hyuna came up and corrected the man's speech. Unaware of this, he pointed to the side, poking the participants to look there. The judge started touting their sponsor. Hyuna, who was standing by the side, was taken aback by the eloquence of the ad. Just then, Mung introduced Han Sung as the special guest director. Han Sung extended his hand to greet the contestants. Turning to the old man, he asked him to explain the rules of the challenge. The contestants tensed up when the old man informed them that they had 30 minutes to prepare a bowl of nan men and present it to the judges. They would be divided into 4 teams, with one team being eliminated. With a smile, Han Sung assured them that the type of nan men they served was irrelevant, but that there was one stipulation: their noodles had to be handmade. Sunghoon tensed up. The task demanded careful consideration because they had to decide which on one side were the refrigerators stocked with ingredients, while on the other was the entrance door, which they could easily use. As the judge raised his hand to signal the beginning, the protagonist considered his options and decided to focus on the noodles. Then, Chan Man approached, offering to make regular nan with buckwheat noodles, so he needed to make broth. The protagonist approached and asked what kind of nan they would make. The guy became angry and shouted at her, saying that there was no need to ask such irrelevant questions because if he said to make broth, it would be nan with water. Rather than argue, the protagonist simply agreed. As the protagonist opened the refrigerator, he made the decision to use mat gxa since they had used buckwheat flour for the noodles. Upon taking out the ingredient, he realized that the organizers had already decided they wouldn't have time to make donkey, because it was in the refrigerator. Now he just needed to choose the ingredients. Sunghoon reached out and grabbed the top-class brisket. The protagonist examined the meat, garlic, green onions, and then scowled, realizing he had never used this in a jaman. Meanwhile, Chanman was making the dough. An unconscious glance at the protagonist caused him to yell at him, telling him to make the broth quickly. With clenching his teeth, at this time, Sunghoon began to cut the meat. He frowned mentally, saying that since they didn't have much time left, he would cut the meat into smaller pieces for the broth. Once the meat was cooked, he could use it for the garnish, and the soup would be ready soon. He added the prepared ingredients to the pot. After that, he immediately added water and started to boil it. Looking at the nervous Jang Man, he realized that he would use all this time to cook the noodles, so he also needed to prepare the garnish. Soon, the guy prepared a small pot to boil the eggs in water with salt and vinegar. Then he took out the dichi, cut off the root, and decided to turn the radish into a good decoration for the dish. The protagonist looked at the pot and smiled. The water began to boil, so he could take out the eggs after 10 minutes, and when there were about 5 minutes left, he could start cooling the broth. But remembering the noodles, the guy frowned. He turned to the nervous Jang Man and asked if the noodles would be ready in time, who replied, telling him not to worry and to continue making the broth. But in reality, the dough was tearing so easily in his hand that making noodles was a dream come true. Suddenly appearing behind him, frowning, the protagonist asked Jang Man if he had used buckwheat flour for the dough. Jang Man, puzzled, asked if buckwheat noodles were made from buckwheat flour. Worried, the protagonist said that it was usually combined with starch, and if he used only flour, it would be difficult to make noodles from the dough without a machine because there was not enough gluten in the mixture. Tearing the dough, the angry chef asked if he should have started over. Pushing Jang Man aside, the protagonist said that he would fix it himself because they did not have time for noodles. The chef, surprised, asked what he should have done. Sang-hun looked at him and asked him to bring him a bag of ice and turn off the stove when the broth and eggs were cooked. Gritting his teeth in anger, the protagonist said that he would leave the rest for him. Chanman, slightly frightened, decided to obey, looking for starch among the flour. The protagonist cursed in his mind. He just took the starch, wary of Changman's ignorance. Soon, he took out potato starch, which he immediately poured into the dough. Putting on gloves, the protagonist was worried the noodles would be overcooked if he started right now. When Chanman brought ice, they only had 10 minutes left. When the protagonist began to roll out the dough, the time was reduced to 8 minutes, and only when there were 5 minutes left was the broth poured onto the noodles, which Sunghoon immediately began to move. 2 minutes before the end, he placed the pan in the ice, and at the last minute, they peeled the noodles. The protagonist gritted his teeth in anger. Noonan stretched out his hand, announcing the end of time. Soon, several types of Ningmen were placed in front of the judges, in front of which stood the team members Ji and Haiman. Seeing that their opponents were Sunghoon and Young Man, they were slightly happy. The protagonist himself, at this time, was carefully looking at his man. Jisung picked up his chopsticks, deciding to start the tasting. He looked at the participants and announced it. The first dishes were Ji and Haiman's. Frowning, the judge asked if they were from the Freya Hotel team. The couple looked down when Jisung told them that they had just the typical Haeming man taught in culinary school, using sweet potato starch for the noodles. The judges soon began to taste the dishes. Even Yunnan tried the noodles. Ji was nervous watching this, so was her partner. Wiping his mouth, Jing said that it was pretty ordinary. There was nothing special about the noodles and broth. The couple tensed up when the judges gave them 75 points. The next dish was bibimbap, which the judges soon tried, and they gave 80 points to the cooking team. When Jisung looked at the next dish, he was amazed. It was Ningnan using ma gaku. Looking at the boys, the judge asked if it was masu. The boys smiled, saying that it was. Youngman frowned and asked Sunghoon if mguku was considered ning. The protagonist whispered to him, saying that he was part of this family. Yoonjun looked at the noodles and expressed her admiration. Jisung smiled, saying that he thought the buckwheat flour itself was of the highest quality, but they cooked the noodles well. Noonan, without saying anything, simply tried the noodles, after which he grinned and said that this team did an excellent job. The boys bowed when the judges awarded them 90 points. Ji saw this and tensed up. They had the lowest score among the 3 teams. Frowning, she turned to Hyan, saying that if they were expelled, their relationship would be broken. Looking at the protagonist, Hyan told the girl not to worry because they would definitely be expelled. Jisung took the protagonist team's Pingyang man and said that it was made from the same noodles as the previous teams, then asked Youngman if they were from the jewelry hotel. Youngman worriedly confirmed this. Jisung picked up the bowl, deciding to start tasting. A moment later, the noodles fell into his mouth. Right after him, Yunnan also tried the noodles, and Yunnan decided to pick up the bowl and taste the broth. Sunan tensed up, expecting the worst. Unexpectedly, Jisung smiled. This surprised the protagonist. The man looked at the guys and asked who cooked the noodles. The protagonist thought mentally, recalling the cooking process, but before he could answer, Young Man raised his hand, saying that he was the one who made the noodles. A smile appeared on the guy's face. Jisun looked at him and thought his fingers grabbed his hand. A moment later, he screamed and began to scold Youngman. He was very scared when he heard the judges scream. The man angrily began to list the shortcomings of the noodles. Youngman became very nervous listening to the screams. A second later, he pointed at the protagonist, saying that he was the one who made the noodles while he was busy with the broth and side dish. The protagonist glared at his partner in anger. His pupils shrank from insane anger. Jisung pointed at the couple and asked if the noodles were actually made by Sunghoon. The protagonist himself closed his eyes, realizing that now he could not justify himself. His fists clenched. He now just needed to stand there and remain silent, as making excuses would now be detrimental to the entire situation. If this had not been filmed, the protagonist would have hit his partner long ago, the partner who was now smiling contentedly, and called out to Sunghoon. With a frown, bowing his head, the protagonist admitted that he was the one who cooked the noodles. The judge thought for a moment, realizing that such hotels were simply hopeless. And because of the guy's skills, he was still an apprentice chef. It had already seemed strange to him. Back then, when he said that he learned about cooking from Samana, the guy was good at making glee. Jisung stood up, saying that he didn't even need to bother solving the assessment for this. The man began to approach the couple, getting very angry. Then he grabbed their badges, thanking them for their participation. The protagonist gritted his teeth. He didn't want to be excluded because of such nonsense, but suddenly, they looked away. Even Ji and Hyan, who were celebrating their victory, stopped dancing. Mung stood up and said that everything was strange. The explanation of what he heard and the things he saw were very different. Iman became worried when the judge began to dispute his words. Afterward, the man described how he had previously observed the cook. He noticed contestant Sunghoon preparing broth and contestant young man kneading dough. He smiled and asked the person whether he was incorrect about something. Youngman lifted his hands uneasily, then pointed to the protagonist, stating that while he was doing his best, this guy climbed in and grabbed the dough, picking up noodles with chopsticks. Mung questioned the man if he was serious. Afterwards, he smiled and explained that when he chose the type of flour, he chose buckwheat flour without hesitation, thus his dough did not stay together and was easily torn. But his time was over, so Sunghoon disagreed with him and began correcting the D. Chanman froze in amazement as he heard the judge's comments. Manson smiled smugly and suggested they watch the recording to confirm. Chanman bowed his head as he remembered that the entire operation had been filmed on camera. He closed his eyes and began to consider what to say, but when he ran out of ideas, he groaned and asked for pardon. Then he bowed again and begged pardon, freezing in that position. Jason called out to the guy, irritated. Then he seized his badge in his hand and ripped it away violently, congratulating him for his participation while implying their defeat. The youngster bent his head again, refusing to object. Jason gazed at Sunghoon and shouted out to him. After calming down, he asked him what he thought about losing due to his partner's meanness. The protagonist grimaced and stated that he was disappointed. The judge asked the kid why he was disappointed. Unfortunately, the youngster stated that he was unable to demonstrate his level of preparedness, and thus missed out on the opportunity to realize his ambition. Jason looked at the boy and stated that, while yesterday's dish was great, that was it. When the judge started outlining his transgressions, the young man turned away instinctively. Jason pointed at the boys and complained about the poor quality of their accommodation. The man, hardly managing his rage, declared that Sunghoon and Youngman will be terminated because of their poor teamwork. But this time, Yunin stopped him, forcing the man to look at her. The woman asked him if they needed to count their points. Why was he making all the decisions himself? Jisung frowned and stated that there was no need to count anything. Picking up the bowl, Yunin stated that the noodles were not very nice, but the soup was excellent. Yun also took up the bowl, agreeing with her, and drank the broth again before putting it aside. Mung said the broth was simply delicious. Yunin asked Sunghoon if he used chicken and beef brisket in the broth. The protagonist responded honestly, stating that the chicken attracted his eye when he opened the refrigerator to select ingredients for the broth and side dish. So he used chicken and brisket to make a classic soup, and to mask the pungent odor, he added all of the pepper and bay leaves. Yunin smiled happily upon hearing his remarks, then tensed and simply stated that it was worth 5 points. Manung smiled, indicating his agreement. He then turned to Jisoo and asked if he still believed there was no reason to count the points. Jisung clenched his teeth in rage when he heard his inquiry. The man scowled at Manung, questioning why he dared to argue with him so boldly. After calming down, Jisung stated that his decision remained unchanged. Hearing this, Sunghoon grew depressed again. Jisung appeared in front of him again, announcing that he was removing him from the program. He then extended his hand and asked for his badge back. The guy closed his eyes, telling Jisung not to give up hope for their hotel because he was fairly sweet. His statements astonished the judge. Youngman was surprised when the protagonist tried to rationalize his conduct. Jisung, who was watching everything, frowned again. Extending his hand, he instructed the protagonist to cease being calm because there were still several teams behind him. Ignoring his words, the protagonist dug into his pocket and pulled out a ticket that surprised the judge. Sunghoon handed it over, explaining that it was a ticket granting him the right to make a mistake, which he acquired yesterday following an unexpected test. Jisung narrowed his eyes, focusing on the protagonist. Then he took the ticket in his hand and announced that participant Sunghoon was immune from expulsion. Soon, all of the teams had returned to their positions, leaving only Jongman standing. Jisung, glancing at him, instructed him to go to his room and pack his belongings. The person lowered his head, indicating his comprehension. The events take us to the bus stop at night, where Sunghoon bows and bids Jongman farewell. He responded by waving his hand. The protagonist grinned, mentally advising his friend to be more honest because if he didn't stop this practice, karma would catch up with him, just like it did today. At this point, Jongman examined his. He reviewed his profile and decided to make it private after what had happened. Gritting his teeth, he suddenly remembered how he had told all of the neighbors what was going to be on TV. The bus quickly took off. The events lead us to Jisung drinking wine. He raised his glass to savor it, then sighed pleasantly. He banged the table, scolding Mung, no longer able to contain his rage. Jisun stated that after frolicking everywhere with his foreign foolishness, Meng had decided to show himself, or rather his arrogance. The man unintentionally took the bottle of wine and poured it into his glass. Gritting his teeth, the man realized Munson could clip and rephrase his comments, using them against him. When he had already raised his glass, someone knocked on the door, and Meng told the man that he was the one who had come here. Jisung frowned, unable to grasp the cause for his visit, but he nonetheless approached the door and opened it for the guests before freezing and glaring at the man. The man appeared to be surrounded by hostility. The men stared at each other for a time after seeing Meng. After a while, Meng informed Jisung that he had come to tell him something. The man turned around and urged Meng to come inside. Soon, they found themselves in the center of the living room. Jisung closed his eyes and asked the visitor what was wrong. Meng frowned and questioned Jisung why he did it previously. His ratings today were weird. Jisung stared at him, bewildered. Nanung inquired, seriously, why he didn't offer any marks to the Joria Hotel's meals. Jisung looked at the other man and said that they were talking about the horrible noodles they had made. Nanung closed his eyes, then yelled, moaning about their handmade noodles, despite the fact that he had told them to make cooled noodles with fur, to reject those who were only concerned with the noodles and had forgotten about the broth, and to include the one who promised to help him. Jisun disregarded the shouting and gulped the wine before slamming his hand on the table. Standing up, he reminded Manson that they needed to take out the weeds first, or he would forget how humiliated he was 15 years ago in America. Pointing at his interlocutor, the man instructed him to consider how the gentleman presented his food to them. He had clearly lied to them about being the youngest in his group. Jisun, unable to contain his rage, claimed that they should never have given him a chance. Then he slumped into a chair and asked Manson to leave if he understood everything. Manson, on the other hand, refused to go, claiming that he had no understanding of the situation. And while Jisun poured himself some wine, the man stated that a chef could only be expelled for his cooking abilities, and that removing a chef because of his history is discriminatory. He almost shouted his final words. Jisung lowered his eyes when Manson questioned if he had given Genti a perfect score. Suddenly, the man scowled. The person seated in front of him became serious, reminding him that they were in Korea. Manson clenched his teeth as Jisung explained that Korea was unlike the America he had visited. Looking at his old friend, Jisung stated that it was in his nature to remain in Korea, and he may even influence politics with today's outcomes. The man became upset again and urged Manson to make a decent decision. Hearing him, he became even more cautious. He regained his composure and asked Jisung whether he would continue to support Juni till the finish. Jisung did not respond and gazed at his interlocutor. Manson slapped his hands on the table, stating that if he continued in this manner, he would back Sanghoon. His statements astounded his pal. Manson smiled and remarked that the guy was talented. He meticulously performed his duties and did his best to compensate for his partner's shortcomings. And, despite the fact that they were unable to finish their dish, he calmly accepted this, as well as his partner's blunders. Despite this, he possessed the confidence that Manson recognized. The man closed his eyes and stated that simply looking at it made him want to see him grow up. Unknowingly, he would support him. Jisung punched the table in rage, shivering all over and asking whether he understood what he had just spoken. Manson frowned and stated that he knew everything and would not leave the competition judging to his own discretion. The man shouted, reminding him that they had to name 50 elements in the first task, and that he was also the one who launched the surprise exam on the second day. His statements infuriated Jisung. Leaning against the table, Manson inquired if he considered this a fair competition. Frowning, the man told Jisung that if he wanted to change his attitude, he needed to quit supporting the Hilton Hotel. Jisung's face went purple from anger. Manson put his hand in his pocket and decided to leave. When he turned around to duck, Jisung began to shout after him. Stopping in front of the door, Manson expressed hope that he recognized his earnest intentions. Jisung clenched his teeth, filled with rage and fury, and resolved to exact retribution. The circumstances lead us to the filming gang. Mina handed Hyunu a paper, claiming it was relevant to the main program. The girl covered her eyes and explained that the writing was about the program's heroes. Hyunu considered it when Mina recommended having numerous persons as the major protagonists. A second later, he assured Mina that they would absolutely choose those with high commercial value, and that it would be fantastic to include personal life experiences. Hyunu stated, somewhat frowning, that this was a tactic utilized in programs of limited interest. The group leader closed his eyes and stated that the selection of the key characters was very essential. Mina smiled and offered Sun. Putting the paper on the table, the girl stated that the guy withheld something during the interview, so she dug a little more and discovered that his mother suffers from a rare ailment. Hyuna grinned and decided to include the individual on the list. He then turned to the other members of the group and asked if they had any suggestions. One of the guys raised his hand to suggest Junti. Hyuna stated that after reviewing the papers containing information on the man, he clearly bore the aura of a typical elite. Hyuna, looking at Mina, suggested that Sun and Janti get acquainted. One of the guys was the youngest chef from a hotel in challenging conditions, and the other was a chef from a first-class hotel. Hyuna commented, smiling, that their image suited them. Suddenly, Hu's phone rang. He took the phone in his hands and apologized to the group before staring at the text of the message. He rose up abruptly, stating that he had an urgent situation that required them to do all of the job alone. Nina smiled, not too disappointed by this. Hyuna said goodbye to everyone after he became serious. The girl thought about it, trying to figure out who he was going to see. If she had known they despised Jisung, she would have prevented Hyuna. The group's efforts continues. One of the guys smiled and chose to recap because they had planned the situation. Mina was looking at her phone at this point, recognizing that Sunghoon had been booked to go to the hospital. The girl trembled in response to the protagonist's message. He requested to reschedule the interview. The girl, slightly astonished, inquired as to the explanation. The girl was overjoyed when she learned that the guy needed to go to the hospital. She quickly wrote to the protagonist, explaining that she was about to take a day off. The protagonist sighed in relief, almost forgetting that he needed to go to the hospital. Looking at his phone, he noticed Mina requesting permission to record him in the hospital. The protagonist grew a little worried, so he asked the girl if he'd get paid for this. Mina was stunned by his question. The events transport us a few hours forward to the courtyard of the house, where the film crew was preparing. The protagonist, turned her head and stared intently at Sunghoon. The girl involuntarily considered how the guy requested cash. He met her gaze and approached her. Approaching, the protagonist stated that he wanted to discuss money. Mina grinned and stated that they would transmit the monies to him following today's broadcasts. The protagonist astonished the girl by asking if they might transfer them right now. He said this with a serious expression on his face. Mina was perplexed. She didn't understand why the guy was so preoccupied about the money. Staring at the guy, the girl realized how weird she felt every time they discussed money, as if the guy had changed. Mina turned around and requested the protagonist to wait. Soon, she presented an envelope containing money, which he seized and began counting. After that, he exhaled in relief and bowed to Mina, starting to thank her. When the operator indicated that it was entirely ready, they got into their automobiles and drove to the hospital. The protagonist sat in the car and glanced out the window while the operator, sitting in the rear seat, filmed him. Smiling, asked Sunghoon when his mother became ill. Thinking, the protagonist responded, stating that 3 years had passed, and the journey proceeded under the girl's continuous questioning. She soon asked the protagonist what his mother was suffering from, and he replied, looking at Mina, that she had complicated regional pain syndrome, a disorder that produces agony throughout the body for no apparent reason. The protagonist was upset, explaining that his mother was usually at home, but she had lately been hospitalized, so he was constantly visiting her. Na was slightly astonished to hear his remarks. After that, she grew sorrowful, realizing the guy's condition. Soon, the gang arrived at the hospital. When the protagonist entered the hospital, he called his sister, who was leading their mother in a wheelchair. The protagonist approached their mother and asked whether she was okay. Kook gazed at the camera and wondered why there were cameras here. Upon hearing the inquiry, the protagonist instantly explained the scenario. Mina became saddened when she saw how the protagonist's mother was. Her multiple injuries to her face and breast were obvious. She spotted the woman's shattered arm, and her legs were in bad shape. Mina felt sorry as she remembered the protagonist's comments. The cameraman asked the girl if they needed permission to film. Mina immediately met Shun's mother and asked if it was acceptable to record them with her son. She grinned and agreed. Menon reminded her brother about the payment for their mother's treatment. They soon arrived at the doctor's office, where he unwrapped the bandages from the woman's hand and began examining her. The protagonist and his sister witnessed everything with anguish. The cameraman lowered the camera and announced that they might conclude it here. The protagonist unexpectedly drove his mother to Mina and asked her to stand beside him as he paid for her treatment. After obtaining her consent, the protagonist walked away. Hook grinned as he asked the girl if Sunghoon had passed the preliminary test. Nina grinned and stated that the guy had. The protagonist's mother, Gred, stated that she still needed to go see her son, of whom she was proud. Hook was relieved and asked when she could watch the finals, to which Mina replied that it would be after the weekend, on the first day of the week. The protagonist and M were standing near the cash register when the cashier looked at the monitor and announced the amount of the treatment. Nin handed over the card, saying that they would pay with this, and the girl became a little nervous, telling her brother that she should at least pay for her mother's treatment. Sunin sadly stared at his sister, who turned out to be working part-time, but the cashier suddenly returned the card, saying that the payment. The protagonist smiled as he handed over the envelope to his sister, saying that even though it wasn't much, it should be enough for the first time. Sunin explained that the money was an advance payment he received for the interview, and Mina, who was standing to the side, understood why the guy wanted to. In the hotel, Heyman was carrying glasses of wine for himself and Ji. He approached her and handed her a glass of wine, but the girl did not accept it. After a while, they found themselves near the car, and the protagonist knelt down, telling his mother that he needed to leave. His mother smiled, asking him to do his best and not be nervous, and Sihun smiled, accepting his mother's request. The girl was enraged at the thought of the Persia Hotel's sous chef losing to the assistant C. She removed the guy's hand and said she didn't want to drink. Heyman smiled and asked if it was because of yesterday's incident, but she didn't respond, mentally saying that they only passed because of luck. They had the lowest result among the 3 teams, and if Sang-hun hadn't made a mistake, she would have been expelled. The events take us to the next morning on the set, where the film crew was preparing the venue for the tournament. The employee bowed in greeting to Hyuna. He walked past him, ending up next to Mina and sighing, sitting down on a chair. Mina looked at the guy, asking what happened to him. Smiling, she guessed out loud that it was because of yesterday's case. Hyuna couldn't help but remember his meeting with Jisun. Entering his room, Hyuna asked Jisun what he wanted from him at such a late hour. Jisun closed his eyes and said that he would be frank. Then he looked at Hyuna, demanding that he change the judges because he would not work with Muna. Hyuna was shocked, saying that they had already been filming for a couple of days and it was already too late. He could not kick out the other judges. Jung frowned upon hearing his words. Hyuna threw up his hands, saying that the government was watching this show. Jisung bit his lower lip, barely holding back his anger. The head of the film crew was tense, watching him. Then he slightly surprised Jisung by asking him if he remembered the program they had done together before. Jisung heard him and looked away, trying to hide his shame because the store he was advertising on the show was selling imported meat and deceiving their customers by telling them it was domestic. But during their show, it was revealed that their meat was from Korea, and they were later caught. Hyuna raised his hand, reminding them how hard he tried to cover up what happened in order to protect Jisung from the consequences. Taking bribes from that store, he had to beg the director for help, and even then, he barely managed to resolve the situation. Jisung frowned, looking at Hyuna. A moment later, he closed his eyes, saying that he understood everything. Hyuna, however, did not feel any better from his words, and now he was sitting tense on the set. Then he looked at the set and said that they were changing the show's editing technique. Hyuna was determined to exact retribution, so he directed that the sequences of Judge Jison's swearing be left uncut and just the vulgar language be censored. Mino was concerned, asking if they should do it because the communications committee would be upset. Hyuna frowned slightly, claiming that because they were backed by the government, the communications committee would do nothing. He grinned and decided to turn Jisung into a clown. Jisung served as a springboard to help them elevate their performance. Soon, the contestants and judges had gathered. Jisung stood up to meet the candidates. The contenders began to cheer because they had all advanced to the finals. Only Sang-hun and Janggi remained calm. Ji and Hyun were tense when Jisung mentioned that not everyone who came this far did so because of their abilities. Being serious this time, the man stated that some of them may be standing here because their colleagues performed well, and he was confident that there were those here who did not make it out simply because they were unable to stand out. Suddenly, the guy exclaimed, "Today will be different. The judges will test their knowledge of the fundamentals from the start." Jisung took a piece of paper and read the first job. After reading it, he scowled and informed the candidates that they had never had to kill a living creature with their own hands to cook something. The contestants were ecstatic when they heard his remarks. Suddenly, a truck drove into the yard, loaded with chicken cages. The protagonist frowned. The scent was simply terrible. The truck soon came to a stop in front of the judges. The chickens in the cages closely investigated the people. Their odor caused many to hold their noses. Yunin suddenly grabbed a chicken and raised it up, explaining that their first mission would be to catch and roast a live chicken. The fowl made a loud noise. The cooks sweated in dread, and many covered their noses with their hands. Yoonjun smiled broadly and announced that the first job in the finals would be to catch and roast a live chicken. There were numerous cages with birds in the truck. Manson extended his hand to the side and ordered that as soon as the assignment began, each participant walk to the truck and take a chicken. He turned aside as Jisung instructed the candidates to remember something. He crossed his arms and stated that the mission would start with properly catching the chicken. There were stoves and other cooking items on the tables, and Jisung stated that the candidates were welcome to utilize them. Jisun furrowed his brow and shouted loudly that the candidates will have 40 minutes to complete everything before beginning the last assignment. A man wearing white gloves rushed out to grasp the chicken, one hand securely gripping the bird and the other grabbing its legs. Yun-sun, the Burgess Hotel's second cook, grabbed the chicken in her hands and claimed it smelled dreadful. The bird's eyes were wide open. The girl was sweating and her lips were tightly squeezed together. She extended her shaking hands to the chicken, urging it not to move. Suddenly, the chicken flapped its wings and extended its sharp claws for the chef's fingers. The girl clamped one eye tight and screamed in terror as blood spilled from a new wound on her arm. Jisun approached her, and the girl told him that a fowl had scratched her. She showed the man her haircut. Jisun frowned carefully, pointing to the side and informing her that there was a hospital center behind the truck where she could get medical attention. The man crossed his arms and directed the cook to return to the hotel immediately. Then he collected her belongings and left. Jisun ordered that she hand over her badge, and the girl paled in dread. The man extended his hand forward, reminding her that the candidates needed to catch a chicken for this challenge. The girl removed the emblem from her garments, gazing down sadly, and placed it in Jisung's palm. Yeonjun scowled, perplexed as to why the candidates were struggling to do this assignment, to which Muning responded that in today's world, individuals don't collect chickens on their own. Jen crossed his arms and stated that the last time he caught a chicken was 10 years ago, so this would undoubtedly be a new experience for the young chefs. Yun furrowed her brow and said that there was nothing they could do in that circumstance. The man looked aside, thinking that he didn't hold back this time because of the mission Yunin assigned him. While the contestants attempted to catch the birds, Jisun considered how the goal of this challenge was to eliminate as many individuals as possible, making it ideal for his purposes. The man gripped the chicken's legs hard, gritting his teeth from the physical strain. Ji looked at Hyan and said that this was not a team effort. When Dad stated he'd be back in the kitchen with the birds soon, the girl looked to the chicken cages. She was drenched in sweat and held her hands in front of her. Ji's eyes widened in surprise as someone instructed her to grab the chicken's legs first. She turned to the youngster, who said the bird should be turned upside down. He grabbed the chicken by the legs, and the protagonist turned it over. Ji scowled, questioning whether Sunghoon was assisting her. The protagonist, who was standing sideways to the girl, responded that she was holding up the line and that he was showing her how to do it. She knows how to do it. Sunghoon turned around and said he didn't want to see Ji fall behind like she did, while the others around her made mistakes. The girl frowned, indignantly. The protagonist approached the table and roughly placed the chicken. Sunghoon sweated and assumed he could do it so quickly because he had just watched a few videos of others catching chickens, but the true challenge would be killing the bird. The protagonist closed his eyes and considered looking into the chicken's memories. Sunan placed his hands on the bird, and the chicken's eyes opened wide. The birds were walking around the hay-scattered area. When the chicken heard a loud noise, it stopped moving. A man wearing a blue shirt carried a white bird out of the enclosure. He placed his hand on the chicken's neck, and its beak opened. Sunghoon's eyes widened as he heard someone call him out loudly. Jisun crossed his arms and asked the protagonist whether he was tired, and he said no. The man furrowed his brow in confusion and inquired as to whether Sunghoon was meditating. The protagonist stared at him and said he was thinking about how to murder the chicken. Jisung, outraged, inquired whether Sunghoon knew how to kill the bird. The protagonist furrowed his brow, thinking that the man would continue to nitpick everything he did, just like the previous time he was overly strict. Sunan looked at Jisung and said he knew how to do it, but he was simply thinking about how to improve. Jisung furrowed his brow in wrath, believing the protagonist was bluffing, so he planned to humiliate and put him in his place by eliminating him. The man opened his mouth and murmured, "I understand." He crossed his arms and told Sunghoon to do everything in front of him right now. The protagonist's brow furrowed in agreement. Jen looked straight ahead and asked to do everything right now. The protagonist put his hands on the bird's body, and the man instructed Sunghoon to demonstrate how he murdered the chicken. The bird's beak was open, and the man's face was distorted with wrath. The protagonist looked at him and realized that Jisung was waiting for him to make a mistake. Sunan remembered the man hauling away the chicken and decided that he needed to keep his cool, take his time, and mimic what the man in the video did. The protagonist frowned and decided that he should first turn the bird's head and slit its throat. He apologized to the chicken in his mind. He grabbed the bird's legs and decided to hold the chicken so that the blood might fall out. Sunghoon looked at the pot and decided that if the water was already sufficiently hot, he should reduce the heat to medium. The protagonist changed the temperature on the stove. A droplet of sweat trickled down his cheek as he considered immersing the drained chicken in water. Sunghoon picked up a plate and decided to remove the bird from the water after 10 minutes so that it would not overcook, and then placed the chicken in a cutting dish. The protagonist grimaced and decided that he should carefully pluck all of the feathers and dispose of them. There was a chicken on the chopping board, and Sunghoon decided to cut the leg joint to remove the feet. The protagonist wiped the sweat from his brow and concluded that the last thing he needed to do was acquire the chicken. Sunghoon put on transparent gloves and brought the knife blade to the bird. The protagonist scowled and decided to cut the front of the chicken from the top of the breast to the base of the tail, then remove the tail. Sunghoon inserted his hands into the bird to extract the innards. His face sweated as he worried that the gallbladder may explode, so he had to be cautious. Small feathers flew over the chicken's body. The protagonist grinned slightly, pleased that he had done it. He poured water from the bottle to rinse the bird and clean off the remnants after extracting the innards. Sunghoon gripped the chicken's body with his hands. The ideal chicken carcass was on the cutting board. The protagonist closed his eyes and sighed with relief. He turned to Jisung and said he was finished, which surprised the man. Sunghoon furrowed his brow and inquired whether he needed to explain how he did it step by step. Jisung frowned his brow in surprise. His face was sweating, and he thought he was attentively monitoring the protagonist to catch any errors, but he was so focused on watching that he didn't realize Sunghoon had finished. The man saw a chicken on the cutting board and thought it looked great. Yunan remarked, smiling, that she wanted to see it. The woman approached the table and looked at the chicken. There were gloves in the bowl, and Yunan claimed that the protagonist completed it the fastest of all the members. Jisung pursed his lips indignantly as the woman claimed they had to let Sunghoon go because he did an excellent job. Nung closed his eyes and agreed with a smile. He furrowed his brow and inquired whether Jisung agreed that the protagonist was a good butcher. The man gritted his teeth furiously and said sure. Sunghoon tightened his fists as Mung said loudly that he had completed the duty of cutting up the chicken and should wait on the second floor. Ji glanced around, her face furrowed in surprise. Yuni thought with a smirk, which was to be anticipated from Sunghoon. Han's mouth dropped open in disbelief. He clenched his teeth and watched the protagonist go away. Hyan closed one eye, convinced that it didn't matter. He smirked, thinking he'd just emulate the man in front. Sun furrowed her brow as she peered down, noticing a large signboard on the building. Sun first managed a restaurant that served samatang, and while it wasn't tough to run, she lacked ambition and excitement. The woman stared at the monitor. When she approached 40, she discovered a new dream, becoming a hotel chef. Sun listened intently to the man. Ordinary folks did not have the opportunity to push themselves, but she was fortunate. The woman was holding a frying pan. The hotel's head chef congratulated her and offered to train her. Sun was standing by the stove. She continued to work for the head chef, and at 48, this was her 5th year as a chef. The woman was picking the feathers from a fowl. She was lucky enough to participate in the show. Top chef. Sun frowned. This time, she was fortunate since they were assigned to carve up meat. The young man with glasses raised his hand, indicating that he was also finished, and the woman opened her mouth in terror. She looked at her chicken and felt bad when she fell behind because cooking fowl was her specialty. Sun grimaced at Heyman, knowing he had certainly duplicated everything she did. The woman pulled on her gloves hastily so that the man wouldn't see anything else. Hn furrowed his forehead in surprise. He sweated profusely, not understanding why Sun was now doing everything so fast. There was a bare chicken on the cutting board. Gritted his teeth, believing this was insane. The woman took off the bird's legs and used a knife to cut the chicken's breast. The man clenched his teeth, thinking Sun was traveling too quickly for him to keep up. The woman furrowed her brow as she looked back. Heyman lifted his hand and smirked, asking Sun to slow down so they could complete this duty together. She closed her eyes and exhaled. Heyman's mouth dropped open in horror as the woman addressed the judges. She lifted her hand, indicating that she was finished. Jisung furrowed his brow. Sun raised her hand, indicating that she had completed the work. Heyman's mouth dropped wide in surprise. He gritted his teeth tightly in wrath, and the man slammed his fist into the table. The woman turned around and screamed in fright. Jisung furrowed his brow and said loudly, "Who just slammed the table?" Man scratched the back of his head and mentioned that there was a bug on the table. He gritted his teeth furiously, convinced that Sun was trying to set him up. He furrowed his brow and reasoned that he had witnessed everything the woman did save the last portion, so even if he couldn't copy her, he could observe the others. The judges were watching the contestants. Jisun furrowed his brow and said that time had expired and that the contenders who were still working should halt and wait. The man crossed his arms and stated that the judges would now start judging their work. Ji furrowed her brow. She was the last to be assessed by the judges. The man stretched his hand forward. He was the 7th person to pass the evaluation. Sun folded her arms and passed the 3rd. Uni smiled and placed his hands on his waist. He was the 2nd. Sunan was the first to pass the judge's evaluation, wiping sweat from his brow, and pushed her mother in a wheelchair. The girl smiled and stated that the hotel was wonderful and that the second portion of the finale will take place there. The main character's mother smiled and stated that Sunghoon was doing well on the show. Menon scowled as the woman explained that she could now die without regrets. They continued down the hallway, and the main character's mother mentioned that Ji was also competing in the tournament. The woman smiled and explained that Ji was Sunghoon's girlfriend who frequently visited their home. She looked straight ahead and mentioned that Ji worked as a chef in another hotel. Nin's jaw dropped open, astonished. Ji strode along the corridor, arms crossed. Menon called her, and the girl frowned. The blonde's jaw dropped open in dread. Menon and the protagonist's mother moved closer to Ji. The woman asked, smiling, if Ji was competing alongside Sunghoon. The blonde sweated in anticipation, thinking that the protagonist hadn't told his mother about their separation. Someone suddenly placed their hand on Ji's shoulder. Heyman furrowed his brow and questioned why the protagonist's mother was acting as if she knew Ji. Jen opened her mouth in disbelief. Ji looked down as the girl inquired about Han's relationship with her. The protagonist's mother furrowed her eyebrows in surprise when the man exclaimed that he was not Ji's close buddy. He scrunched his brow and screamed, "We're dating!" Ji threw Han's hand off her shoulder and told him to stop yelling. The man's jaw flew open in surprise as the girl yelled that Sunghoon's mother was unwell and that he shouldn't be cruel to her. Ji looked away, and Heyman knew it was the protagonist's family. When Hyan wondered if Sunghoon had asked them to speak with Ji instead of him, the protagonist's sister and mother gasped in surprise. Menon furrowed her brow and exclaimed loudly that they were not present. For Ji, but not for the protagonist, Hyam exclaimed angrily that they should hunt for Sunghoon and stop acting like they knew his girlfriend. The protagonist, who was holding the headgear in his hand, gazed forward with surprise. Heyman placed his hands on his waist, demanding at Sehun's mother not to approach Ji again. The woman paled and began to sweat with terror. The protagonist's eyes widened in surprise as he dashed for his mother, shoving man away. He sat next to her and asked Minan what was wrong. Sunan asked his sister to call an ambulance because they needed to hurry and get their mother to the hospital. Minan dashed onward, and everyone gazed after her. Each frowned, announcing that the protagonist had arrived after all. Sohan stood motionless. The man glanced at the protagonist with displeasure, who explained that his sick mother would have convulsions when she was worried. The protagonist had his back to Hyan and said that he couldn't just yell at her. Ji looked down and apologized, saying she would pretend she did not know the woman. Hyan turned to the girl and explained that it was not her fault. He turned around and frowned fiercely. The man placed his hands on his waist and continued that if Sunghoon had stated that he and Ji had split up, this would not have occurred. Without turning around, the protagonist responded that his mother had just gotten out of the hospital, and he hadn't had a chance to inform her. Ji frowned when Sunghoon mentioned that they had only broken up a few days before, and he couldn't find the perfect time. Heyman lifted his hand and told the protagonist to stop harassing Ji. When Sunghoon explained that he still didn't understand him, the man's eyes widened in surprise. Holding the cap in his hand, the protagonist stated that he was no longer interested in Ji or anything associated to her. Ji furrowed her brow and turned away when Sunghoon suggested that Hyan should ask her personally if he didn't believe her. He furrowed his brow, realizing that it was his responsibility. The man stared at the protagonist, who suggested that they tackle their relationship's problems themselves. Sunan tightened his fist and turned around, facing straight ahead. The protagonist stated that he would not simply stand there and be silent if Hyan dared to do this again. Mina was casually walking up the stairs at this point. She turned toward the corridor after hearing the protagonist describe what happened to Hyan. She unintentionally looked out to check if the participants were squabbling. She noticed 3 individuals there. Hyman was furious, and the protagonist informed him that if he dared to do it again, what he did to his family today, he would not stand by and be silent. After that, the protagonist turned to H-Min and gritted his teeth, calling him an idiot. Sunghoon, on the other hand, ignored this and said farewell, but his enraged interlocutor refused to end the argument and continued yelling at him. When Mina saw this, she became a little nervous. She gazed at the protagonist's back, reflecting on what had happened. Soon after entering the room, the protagonist called his sister. When she picked up the phone, the guy excitedly inquired about her mother's condition, at which point he froze, listening to his sister say that everything was not well with her mother, but the doctor assured her that she did not need to worry because she would receive a prescription for an injection. The protagonist breathed a sigh of relief after hearing her comments. Then Sunghoon glanced at the bulb, as his sister questioned him about his ex and requested clarification. The protagonist closed his eyes and asked his sister not to discuss this further. Smiling slightly, he asked Minnan to hand over the phone to her mother, but his sister surprised him by abruptly shutting it off, stating everything was okay with her mother. Looking at his phone, the protagonist grew concerned. After calming down, the protagonist decided not to worry because his sister was next to his mother, and it was preferable for him to focus on the next assignment. He then got out his recipe book and sat on the sofa, beginning to read it. The judges soon addressed the test-passing participants through the speaker. When the protagonist learned that he had been summoned to the first-floor lobby, he raised his head. He closed the recipe book and decided to go. When he arrived, numerous people were already there. Sunghoon started looking about, hoping to discover the judges, but they were not present. However, upon spotting Shanta, the guy smiled and called out to him. He also grinned when he saw his pal and stated that he had given it his all. He then made the protagonist nervous by asking if he thought they were meant to meet in the finals. Sunghoon responded by expressing that he hoped they could manage the following challenge. Suddenly, the guy was amazed and remembered something, so he asked his pal if anyone else from their hotel was participating. Yoonhee, puzzled, responded that there was another one, but he was terminated after today's task. Raising his hand, the protagonist stated that given that the person had never cut up a chicken, it was logical that he was eliminated, regardless of how great he was at cooking. Yoonhee grew concerned when his friend asked him how he knew how to carve a chicken. Bowing his head, the man began to recall the past. He remembered his instructor, and how he learned to carve up a chicken under his supervision. Yoonhee closed his eyes and understood that telling Jisung learning how to carve up a chicken the night before the mission was announced would be foolish, so he looked at Sunghoon again and lied, claiming that he learned how to do so in the army while undergoing a special program. When his companion inquired where he learned how to carve up chicken, the protagonist smiled. Scratching his head, he said that he'd done it a couple times in the army when he was assigned as an assistant cook. Young Haeon was anxious, thinking that he had learned everything from the chicken's memories, but even if he told them, they would not believe him. Suddenly, they noticed the judges approaching. NTI offered his hand to his friend, encouraging him to give his all. Sunghoon agreed and extended his hand, after which they shook hands. One of the judges spoke up, attracting attention to himself while standing near the entrance. The man grinned and announced that the test will take place here. Following his instructions, the participants hurried into the hall. However, Sunghoon observed someone in the crowd. He frowned when he spotted two chefs he recognized. They turned out to be Subak and Ilu. Ilu chuckled as he noticed the protagonist, then stopped and stared at him, laughing. The two men commented that it was strange that such a dismal person was around. The protagonist could barely contain his rage. These folks were from the Mongan Hotel. He closed his eyes, deciding to ignore the men and concentrate on his duties. The cooks soon formed a line and rose in front of the judges. Neoman was startled to see that only 24 out of 200 participants remained. He frowned slightly, understanding he needed to be stricter given the tiny number of participants. Extending his fingers, he reminded the competitors that this was a paired task. 2 contestants would independently cook dishes of their choice and deliver them to the judges, who would then determine who to eliminate. Jinik, who was standing close to Sung, tightened up when she realized the contestants may kick their opponent. Suddenly, the chef summoned Sunghoon, who had completed the stage before everyone else. The man smiled and asked him to step forward. The protagonist complied and stood before the judges. Looking at the individual, Muning urged him to choose his opponent. The protagonist scowled, pondering about his opponent, and when the man opened his mouth to choose an opponent, Junti screamed, interrupting him. The man lifted his hand and stepped forward. The protagonist was surprised to see him. Nunung looked at him and inquired what type of inquiry he had. Stepping forward, Jangi inquired whether he could compete with Sunghoon. Nunung smiled and asked if there was any particular reason he wanted to do so. The guy grinned and stated that he wanted to renew their competition from 8 years ago. The protagonist grinned as he remembered an 8-year-old culinary competition in which Gongdi won first place and the protagonist finished second. However, the current scenario was diametrically opposed to that of the past, which is why Jangi was so determined to win. Sun turned to his friend, Jae, who was now looking carefully at Jangi. He was biting his lips, chastising Jangi for his decision. The man grimaced. If Jianji could win now, He could modify every program in the future to ensure his victory. Yunnan smiled and told Janti that he was overconfident about facing an opponent who had won first place. He simply smirked and shouted, claiming that it didn't matter. Jis, who was beginning to feel nervous, peered at the woman next to him. She looked at Sunghoon and inquired what he planned to do. The protagonist thought competing against Janggi was difficult. Even if he was considering another cooking competition, the man hesitated when Manson called. The man became serious and told the guy that he didn't have to engage in provocation because he could choose anyone. The protagonist used a serious tone and spoke the opponent's name clearly. Soon, the man found himself in the dressing room with Hyman. Hyman frowned and questioned why he was so sure in himself when he was only an apprentice chef. The protagonist said that he simply wanted to know how good a person working in one of the top 20 hotels was. Hyman could scarcely hold his rage as he looked at the protagonist and questioned if he was from Jula, a rubbish motel that ranked 100th in the country. When the protagonist heard his statements, he grimaced and turned to face him, saying that he was too arrogant to be a member of such a hotel. Hyman grinned and revealed that he knew the guy's genuine motivation. He merely wanted to exact revenge on the person who had taken his girlfriend. However, the protagonist did not glance at Hyman, claiming that he had previously discussed this with him in the hall. His statements astonished the person much. Sunghoon turned to the sous chef, stating he only wanted to see how he was. Hyman couldn't control his rage and wanted to scream, but the photographer summoned them, and they were obliged to stand before the judges. The boys were able to relax and did not show their actual emotions. The other attendees observed them from the sidelines, with some turning their focus to the table. Gianti frowned, not understanding the significance of the black cloth. Everyone looked to Jisoo, who announced that the object hidden in front of him will serve as the competition's theme. Frowning, he said that it was one of the themes. Looking at the guys, he inquired if they could determine what ingredients were hiding there. Sunghoon and Hyun both stated that they understood which substances were present. Jisoo snatched the cloth and threw it to the side. The theme of the tournament was eggs. Jisoo pointed to them and explained that these were the eggs from the hens they had murdered earlier. He then approached the judges, explaining that they needed to create a memorable dish using these components as the key elements. Yunnan grinned and stated they could focus on the eggs, the chicken, or both. The choice was theirs. They completed their dish within the time limit. Nanung smiled and stated that once the tournament began, they would set up walls around the cooking area so that no one could see what they were producing. Hyman and the protagonist grew serious. Jisoo immediately exclaimed, signaling the start of the competition. The protagonist walked straight to the refrigerator and examined the ingredients. He stood in front of it, trying to decide what food to create. Gritting his teeth, Sunghoon resolved to create a dish that the judges would never forget. Following that, he promptly picked up an egg. At this point, Hyun had gathered all of the ingredients and placed them on the table. He grabbed the onion and milk, thinking about Sunghoon while peeling it. The guy decided to demonstrate his skills as a sous chef by rapidly chopping the onion and placing it in a bowl. Feeling a great loathing for the protagonist, the guy determined to cook a dish that would throw Sunghoon out and force him to depart quickly. He found himself in front of the stove. He looked back, carrying olive oil in his palm. Hyman took a careful look at Sunghoon. He wasn't sure what dish he was going to prepare, but he assumed the person would utilize eggs as the major ingredient. He realized this and poured oil into the frying pan. He gave a weird grin. Hyman used eggs as the most prevalent item from the time he was a line cook until he became a sous chef. Heating the frying pan, the man grabbed for one of the eggs, then took a mold with his other hand and broke the egg into it, causing the cooking egg to take the shape of a square. Now he waited until the egg was about halfway cooked. He soon built 4 of them. The guy exhaled. After frying the eggs, he poured oil into a clean frying pan and examined his ingredients, which had previously been chopped and wrapped. He began adding the chopped ingredients and frying them. After a time, he peered at the tomato and unscrewed the lid, then poured the sauce into the pan. The guy scowled, understanding that 30 minutes was insufficient for the sauce to simmer and thicken, even if it was store-bought. To achieve the desired consistency, the guy added milk and waited for the sauce to boil. It soon boiled. As soon as it boiled, Hyman began adding the fried eggs and mozzarella to the pan. Then he added basil leaves on top. The guy's lips curved into a smile as he stared at Sunghoon, expecting his victory. Soon, Jisoo yelled, heralding the end of time. The 2 contestants instantly appeared before the judges. They stood immobile and expressionless. Jisoo, sitting in the center, requested everyone to present their delicacies. Hyman and Sunghoon grasped the lids simultaneously. The sous chef grinned. A moment later, he opened the cover, surprising Jisoo with his food. The judge then turned to Sunghoon and asked him to produce the food, but when he saw it, he was appalled. It was fried eggs with nori. The three judges were all stunned by what they witnessed. Yoonan frowned as she noticed the food. Nunung was likewise surprised that a guy offered such a dish. Now he felt ashamed that he stood up for him. Jisoo was surprised that a man was offering them with this food. He gazed at the protagonist, trying to figure out what he was thinking. The judge cooled down after coughing, and he made Haemin happy by promising to sample his meal first. The three judges stood up. Soon, the sous chef had 3 pieces of his entree in bowls. Yoonan eagerly inquired about the dish's name. Smiling, Haemin explained that it was shakshuka, a North African dish. Jisoo grabbed up the bowl, eager to test the meal. A second later, he sipped some of the sauce and looked at the sous chef, stating that the dish was not horrible, but there was one flaw. The last words astounded Haemin. Jisoo looked at him and asked how much olive oil he used. Nervously, the sous chef stated that he used approximately 200 milliliters. Frowning, Jisoo asked to look at his plate again. Then he pointed to it, stating there was a lot of oil floating on top, but everything else was fine. Haemin bowed and thanked Jisoo, but the man felt tired when he heard Mang's voice, which smirked and said that, aside from the oil, the egg was not excellent. Picking up the spoon, Sung admitted that he was too focused on cooking the eggs, forgetting that they weren't done that way. His statements terrified the guy. Nunung, sensing the guy's concern, told him that instead of putting a half-fried egg in the sauce, he should have cracked a raw egg into it while it was boiling. The man bowed his head, understanding his error. Yoonjun smiled and informed the sous chef that he needed to pay more attention to detail, and that everything was delicious. Bowing to the woman, the man began to cheer again because he received positive ratings from 2 judges. Jisoo looked to the side and decided to taste Sunghoon's food, who was standing to the side, smiling and glancing at the guy's dish. Jisoo was nervous. No matter how many times he looked at it, he didn't see any genuine effort in this meal. When it came time for the protagonist to speak, he stopped smiling. Nunung, hesitantly smiling, inquired about the dish's unusual concept. The protagonist looked at the food and commented that it was an open-minded breakfast. His statements astonished the man. The protagonist looked back at the judges and repeated what he had stated. Jisoo cursed in his head. He couldn't understand why the man was so confident when his food looked like that. Mung took the plate and opted to be the first to try. Soon, all of the judges took plates in their hands and looked at the food again. Mung couldn't hide his displeasure. He asked the protagonist if there was a particular order in which to eat. Sunan pointed to the tago and explained that it was the main dish, while the fried egg on the left was dessert. Nunung, skeptical, asked the fellow whether he truly believed so. The man grinned and stated that fried eggs could not be considered dessert. Looking at the egg, he explained that an appetizer is typically a dish seasoned with spices and salt that complements the main course. Nunung frowned as the protagonist did not change his mind. The man grinned, reminding them that this is an open-minded breakfast. Man scowled, unhappy, as Manson agreed with the gentleman and took the tago with chopsticks. Then he slipped it into his mouth. Jisoo and Yoon both did the same thing. A second later, the woman was taken aback. Frowning, she stated that the taste was average, but she was looking forward to something else. Manson closed his eyes and proceeded to list all the benefits of the food. Then, staring at the protagonist, he inquired whether he prepared the rice himself. He smiled and explained that he had just cooked some instant rice in a saucepan. Manson felt anxious. As expected, half an hour was insufficient to prepare rice. Then he glanced at the dish and realized it was too conventional. He was honest when he voiced his thoughts on the tago nairi. Frowning, the man wondered if he had overestimated Sunghoon. The protagonist shouted out to him, encouraging him to try the dessert once he was finished. Sunghoon even offered dessert forks and asked to use them. Nunung was perplexed when he saw the spoon. Jisoo, who was standing next to him, stated that they would sample the egg with no expectations. Manhwa soon transferred the egg with a spoon and peered at it, attempting to figure out what made it exceptional. Yoonjun was a little disappointed since the egg was uncooked, and only Mung took the yolk with a spoon. Then he slipped it into his mouth. The taste of the yolk shocked and pleased him. When he witnessed his reaction, the protagonist grinned and asked the other judges to try it for themselves. Jisoo took the egg and couldn't understand why Mung had changed his attitude so dramatically because of the scrambled eggs. A second later, he bit off a chunk and felt as if he had been struck by electricity. They, like Yoonan, glanced at the egg, commenting that it was unusually sour. Jisoo scowled, recognizing that the white belonged to an egg, but the yolk was not from an egg, it was composed of something else. Looking at the gentleman, he inquired if he used mango. Sunghoon smiled and verified it. Jisoo smiled and commented that it was extremely humorous. Nanum closed his eyes, exclaiming that it was fantastic that he offered them a dish that perfectly exemplified molecular cooking. The protagonist thanked the judge for his praise. Haemin was amazed to learn about molecular cuisine. Yunan ate the egg and asked the man where he studied molecular cuisine. Was it derived from manna? Again, the protagonist smiled uneasily, explaining that this time it wasn't from manna, but from YouTube. His statements astounded Yoonjun. Jisoo frowned and requested that the competitors return to their seats while they judged their food. Soon, the judges took their places. Jisoo turned to Haemin and told him that they were concerned about his food since he didn't fully comprehend it, therefore he made a mistake by focusing on the presentation. The guy bent his head to indicate his humility. Jisoo gazed at Sunghoon and then turned to face him. The man became serious and stated that the Taego Nairi was pretty ordinary and did not delight them. It did not even impress them. However, the fried egg was wonderful. The protagonist smiled as she heard his remarks. Nanung laughed, claiming that he had never tasted molecular gastronomy foods before. Even when he returned to Manhattan, the man smiled and stated that Sunghoon's dish exactly captured the unforgettable food they were discussing. Looking over the participants, the judges decided to reveal the winner, who happened to be Sunghoon, forcing the sous chef to grit his teeth. The guy couldn't contain his rage after the judges had already eliminated him. The judges examined the second story and granted the protagonist permission to walk up there. Jisoo watched everything and scowled, admitting that the person was capable of doing a lot. He became enraged and hateful as he looked at the protagonist, who appeared to be familiar to him. However, the protagonist was unaware of this as he approached the steps. Min clenched his teeth, unable to accept defeat. The guy couldn't accept the outcome quietly after remembering the egg. Looking at Sonan, Haemin determined to exact revenge on him. Anger struck the guy. He planned to exact revenge on the winner as soon as he lost. The protagonist, unaware of this, casually walked up to the second level and began looking at people. The guy realized that if it hadn't been for the ingredient he discovered in the refrigerator, he wouldn't have received such glowing feedback because he had never attempted molecular cuisine before. The protagonist was shocked to find calcium lactate, which is employed in molecular cuisine. After looking in the refrigerator, the protagonist discovered the elements required as an additive in molecular cuisine. Looking at them, he made the strong decision to use molecular cuisine. He became enraged and vowed to create a dish that could never be ignored. Looking at the film team, the guy wondered if any of them expected such a result. Pity was smiling broadly at this point. Looking at Mina, he stated that Sunghoon was getting a lot of attention from viewers. Na grinned at hearing this. The man pointed at her and requested her to take an interview. At this point, all of the participants assembled again. Mensen looked at them and requested Jang Ti, who finished second, to come forward. The guy did this without thinking. The judge smiled and instructed him to choose a person with whom he wished to compete. The guy considered it, merely being cautious, not understanding why JTI began to assume that he should simply choose a weak opponent. The man tightened his teeth, aware that this was the guy's chance to make it to the finals. Jonggi grimaced, understanding that there were still individuals here who he disliked, those Yeongdong boys he had seen at the seminar. Gongti frowned, remembering how Sunghoon had suffered as a result of those two while working at one of the top 100 hotels. And while those guys questioned themselves after seeing the outcomes, the fact that they worked at Korea's second-best hotel remained unchanged. He looked at the judges and decided to choose an opponent he couldn't tolerate watching. The two were grinning too much during the broadcast. Jisoo was shocked by the guy's choice. He smiled and stated he'd compete with the Mongong Hotel's sous chef. Jisoo clenched his teeth and mentally called Jonggi an idiot. Manjen chuckled, claiming that because his opponent had been picked, they should call him out. A little later, Ilya was summoned to the stage. The guy instantly obeyed and started to stand up. He soon stood next to Chanti, and Mung raised his hand, informing them that they had also been given 30 minutes. Walking to his seat, Ilya expressed surprise that the chef from Hilton, Korea's greatest hotel, would choose someone from the Mongong Hotel. Chanti gazed at the guy when he said that. Ilya grinned and stated that if he were in his situation, he would choose someone from a low-class hotel. Ilya smiled and inquired if he was attempting to avenge his friend. However, the guy did not respond, stating that they needed to swiftly prepare their plates. When the judge's voice rang out, signaling the end of time, the participants rushed to bring their dishes to the table. When the judge ordered them to exhibit their dishes, the guys exclaimed simultaneously. Then they both grabbed the lids. Chanti's food was an omelette with chicken breast steak, while Ilya served chicken soup with Jean. Jisoo stepped up, stating that the steak had drawn his attention. He quickly tried the steak and froze, staring at the platter. Then he looked at Jisoo and inquired why he had added pilla sauce to the side dish. The man laughed, stating that he believed the perfume of pilla leaves and lemon would mask the distinct smell of chicken. Jisoo demonstrated his knowledge by continuing to sample. He swallowed another slice of steak, then closed his eyes and enjoyed it. Nanung, who was standing to the side, turned to Jonggi and said it was delicious and odorless even without the pilla sauce. Gongdi thanked the judge, but Yunjun informed him, claiming that something was missing. She looked at the steak and remarked it was unfortunate. Jisung gazed at her and wondered what was lacking, as everything appeared to be in order. The woman examined the food and commented that the flavor was nice, but the presentation was uninteresting, and there were no vegetables, making the dish disharmonious. Janggi was skeptical of the woman's words. He smiled slightly and informed Yajun that he'd keep this in mind for the future. Nanung set the plate on the table and looked at Ilya, offering to try his cuisine. Yoonjun instantly voiced her admiration. She was astonished by the soup's appearance, and commented on how good it smelled. When she questioned how he cooked the chicken, he grinned and explained that he used a smaller bird and cooked it in a frying pan. He then pointed to the bowls, instructing them to scoop up some soup and pour it into the bowl to eat the chicken with gloves. Hyro pointed to the bowls and said they'd start with the soup first. Soon, Ilya put the soup into the bowls, which the judges lifted and sampled. Yunin instantly expressed her admiration and offered to try the chicken. Soon, she put on gloves and pulled out a chicken leg. When the woman examined the leg, she was astounded that the chicken had been cooked so quickly. Ilya handed out the salt, saying, "If the flavor was weak, she might need salt." The judge instantly added salt and chewed on a slice. Jisoo ate the entire leg, whereas Mung only took a nibble of the wings. Ilya felt tense as he watched the judges, but then he smiled. Mung smiled, complimenting the guy, although it was a touch bland. But that is fine because he served the salt separately. The guy bowed and thanked the judge, and Yunin showed her admiration, unexpectedly becoming agreeable. Only Jisoo was pessimistic, noting that while it was fantastic overall, they were selecting the finest chef on the show rather than an average one. His remarks made Ilya nervous, and he even became terrified. Jisoo stated that his food should have had a story and inventiveness, but it was just wonderful and, at the same time, conventional. Nanung stared at Jisung and realized he was insulting the guy in order to help Yunti. The judges soon sat down to discuss the winner's identity. Yoonjun raised her hand, telling Il that he had exceeded her expectations. Jisun, on the other hand, remained pessimistic, claiming that his opinion had not changed. After hearing one of the judges speak, Il grimaced and looked at Mung. Jing stated that he will be the one to declare the winner. Mung himself was nervous. It was a difficult decision. Thinking about it, the man told himself that both dishes were great. Yes, they used the basic components effectively, but neither the steak nor the chicken soup were exceptional. Yunsung looked about at the competitors before turning to Youngi and remarking that, despite making a distinctive sauce with perilla leaves, he considered his meal to be quite underwhelming. Jisun tightened his teeth at the man's statements. Yuni tightened up while listening to Myung's comments. The judge smiled slightly and commented that the chicken was good on its own. The seasoning was also good. It was delicious without the sauce, but it became too salty when dipped in it. Yuni grimaced as she heard his remarks, and Jisun couldn't help but be angry. Ilu chuckled when Mung hailed him as the winner. Yuni couldn't help but think about his extreme perplexity. If he had thought about the side dish instead of the perilla leaf sauce, he would have closed his eyes and determined not to regret it, and instead give it his all in the following exam. He could only see Ayu's back as he left. He turned around and stared at him, and his lips curled into a smile. The guy couldn't help but frown at this. Il grinned broadly and started to stand up. At this point, the protagonist was strolling down the corridor. He glanced into the distance, thinking about the interview, which turned out to be more difficult than he anticipated. The guy closed his eyes, remembering how the queries became increasingly personal. When he opened his eyes, he suddenly remembered the last question. The guy opted to forget about it as he continued walking forward. Meanwhile, Mino was reading the text. The operator saw the girl's bewilderment, and she kept rereading 2 sheets. He terrified the girl by summoning her in a whisper and lifting his hand. The guy informed the girl that she needed to prepare for the upcoming interview. The guy, feeling slightly apprehensive, inquired as to why she had asked Sanghoon the final question. The girl smiled, not immediately comprehending what they were saying, and then looked at the text in her palm. Sunan then returned to the second-floor landing. He was the one who witnessed his friend's exam, and when Ilya was declared the victor he was stunned. His friend was now walking downstairs, and Ilya approached him on the second floor. The guy was perplexed when he saw the protagonist, but a crazy grin came on his face shortly after. He approached him and yelled out. Standing next to the protagonist, Illa said that his friend had lost and was now on the elimination list. The guy smiled creepily as he warned the protagonist not to disgrace himself like his friend. Sihun stared at the newcomer, calling him obnoxious. Illa closed his eyes and informed the protagonist that he had improved his word choice since joining his hotel. Illa patted the guy on the shoulder and encouraged him to enjoy his dominance because he was about to steal even him. Sunan could scarcely contain his rage following his comments. At this point, the judges moved on to the next participant. Nansen smiled when he called Yoongi. The girl rushed forward and stood in front of the judges. Manson raised his hand, instructing the female to choose an opponent. She grinned and said the opponent's name, which turned out to be Ji from the Persia Hotel. Ji grew irritated, unable to recall the girl in front of her. The girl was definitely anxious when she saw the Bia Hotel ranked 6th on the list of the best. Manson stared at the crowd and called Ji. She stood close to him with a solemn expression. Jisoo cooled down and asked Yoongi why she selected Ji. The girl smiled softly, explaining that she had no motive for this. Ji was stunned by this. Yoonjun lifted her hand, indicating that everyone might take their seats and begin cooking. The gals did this. Ji frowned, recognizing that the judges were already full, therefore it would be best to make a Mediterranean salad. She instantly started chopping the cabbage, which she then put in a basin. In addition to cabbage, the dish contained other things. The girl grimaced slightly. The salad seemed overly plain. You only needed to cut the vegetables, you didn't need to cook anything. Ji turned away, knowing she needed to account for two things. One was a sauce in which Ji intended to place the eggs. She put the eggs in, deciding to concentrate on them and the seasoning. The eggs instantly float to the surface. The girl scowled slightly, determined to ensure that the eggs were neither overcooked nor undercooked. She wanted the eggs to be flawless. Now that the eggs were boiling, she started to create the seasoning. Ji took an involuntary glance toward Young, wondering what she was up to. Yoongi was constantly shaking the mixture, looking at it and checking its consistency. The girl unconsciously remembered Jio's query, and her lips curled into a smile. She actually had a purpose for choosing Ji. Continuing to construct the concoction, the girl reminded herself that the program designed to evaluate cooks from various hotels truly desired something else. Yi's lips curled into a smile. If the producers saw her, she could be the star of their next show. She soon stopped shaking the mixture and broke 2 eggs, transferring the contents into a bowl. When 2 yolks were added to the mixture, Yoongi continued to stir the dough, believing that it would be simpler for viewers and producers to remember her if she didn't resemble any of the other members, but Ji looked similar. Soon, Yoongi took oatmeal flour and started pouring it into the bowl. She stopped doing this after a while and started sifting the flour, thinking of Ju, who had a beautiful face. But even if she surpassed her in the rankings, she would be forgotten with her. The girl grew slightly depressed and looked at the judges, knowing that they would want to eat something light, therefore it didn't matter what they prepared for them. The main thing was dessert. Yoongi gazed at Jo from the side and sneered, determined to take advantage of her popularity. Jo's eggs were still boiling while she worked on her right. She grabbed a small amount of honey and poured it on the mayonnaise. The girl began combining them. Ji felt nervous and told herself she couldn't be eliminated right now. She continued to mix the ingredients, claiming that she could not lose like her beloved. Suddenly, she heard the protagonist express that he did not want to see her lose. The girl instantly turned around to see the protagonist standing on the 2nd floor. Ji grimaced slightly upon seeing him. Suddenly, she exclaimed, recalling something. She looked at the pan on the stove, which she had forgotten to turn off. She removed the eggs in an instant and placed them in cold water. Then she started peeling them, begging God to have compassion on her. Soon, she placed the peeled egg and split it in half. The girl was upset when she saw the result. The egg had been boiled for far too long and hard. Looking at it, Ji began to consider ways to get out of the position. After making a decision, she broke the eggs and began shaking them, intending to crush them. She then placed the eggs on top of the salad she had prepared earlier. After that, she scooped up 1 egg yolk and crushed it before mixing it with the dressing she had just made. The girl then put the dressing blended with the egg into a saucer. Frowning, the girl decided to divide the salad into 3 dishes and sprinkle with basil on top. Ji breathed a sigh of relief as the judge proclaimed the end of time. Soon, she and Yoongi were in front of the judges. Jisoo raised his hand and asked them to present their delicacies. The females raised the lids simultaneously, revealing a Mediterranean salad with dressing and bacon-wrapped egg muffins. Jisoo laughed, realizing that the females had decided to make something light because they thought they were full. Manson smiled at the dishes. After inspecting the cupcake, he stated that the basis of an egg cupcake is often produced by splitting bread into bits, but these were baked and made using dough. However, despite the fact that the cupcakes were meant to be egg-based, they were coated in bacon. Youngie grinned while listening to Manson's words. 10 minutes ago, the girl was horrified when she looked about the nightstands and couldn't find the cupcake molds. The girl was disappointed to learn that others did not pay attention to baking, but she would have to come up with something. The girl thought about it and decided to do something. She opted to use a steel ring mold to bake the dough and eggs. Standing up, Youngie understood that wrapping everything with bacon might help keep things together. Now she smiled, delighted with her accomplishments. Yoonjun stood forward and asked if they might try. Manson considered it, then turned to his colleagues and offered to try the salad first. Jisoo agreed with him and pointed to the dressing. Ji advised the judges that it would be best to have the salad alongside it. Nunun poured the dressing and was relieved that it was thicker than expected. He soon placed the salad to his mouth and, together with Jisoo, swallowed it. Ji looked about uneasily. She scowled when she heard Yen mention she was slightly disappointed with the salad. The woman looked at Ji and explained that she had placed a half-boiled egg in the salad and then a hard-boiled egg on top. Nevertheless, it was extremely excellent. The girl acknowledged the mother with a grin and a bow. Nunun, who was standing next to her, suggested using sliced egg slices instead of mashed. Ji communicated her knowledge by mentally declaring that she knew this from the start, but what happened kept her from doing anything perfectly. Jisoo wiped his mouth with a cloth, stating he'd provide his thoughts later, but first he needed to eat Yi's food. All three judges reached for the cupcakes at the same time. Youngie didn't notice, she kept smiling. The girl disliked Youngie, yet she gave low scores to Western food and high ratings to Korean ones. Even still, Youngie noticed how the woman described her cupcake as excellent. Youngie looked at the judges and remarked the cupcake had an excellent texture, with a combination of salty and sweet flavors. Munin, wiping his lips, commented that the meat's saltiness was also great. Youngie bowed her head and thanked the judges. Nun looked at Jisoo and inquired what he thought of the dishes. He replied that he will respond to everything later. Youngie closed her eyes, unsure why they were waiting. If the two judges had already stated everything, she looked at Ji and got nervous. At this point, the judges began to deliberate on the winner. Jisoo closed his eyes and nodded before looking at the beauties in front of him. A moment later, he named Youngie as the winner. This made her very happy, but it saddened Ji. The man scowled, adding that the evaluation was based on how well the eggs were fried, but none of them did an outstanding job, so he declined to comment. The girl and the man glanced at each other. Jisoo scowled, explaining that Ji chose to utilize eggs as a secondary element, but contestant Youngie attempted to make the eggs appear to be the main ingredient. Youngie thanked the chef for his suggestions. Yugan, who sat next to him, concurred with Jisoo's assessment. When the girl realized she was no longer happy, Manson grinned and claimed Yi's food was really excellent. Then he pointed to the stairs and instructed Youngie to ascend. Only Ji was saddened by her loss. Suddenly, Hyman cried out to her. He gave her a handshake and complimented her on her performance. The girl smiled softly and agreed with him. Then they hugged one another. Hyman abruptly turned serious. The next day, the workmen rearranged the kitchens, and the kitchen stations were now arranged in many rows. After a while, the participants had packed the floor. Mangs extended his finger, indicating that he had an announcement for them before they proceeded on to the elimination candidates' tasks. They were split into winners and elimination candidates for the activity they just completed, however the winning candidates will be evaluated one more time. Illa chuckled as he heard this. Mangs stood up and closed his eyes. Then he pointed to Sonan and announced him as the winner of the winners. The child scratched the back of his head as he heard this. Illa frowned, unsatisfied. Yoonjun smiled and announced that the participant in first place would receive something unique. Jisoo agreed with her, explaining that Sanghoon would have immunity from elimination, but unlike before, he couldn't keep it for himself and had to offer it to one of the 20 participants nominated for elimination today. The protagonist closed his eyes and carefully stared at the judge, explaining that it was initially intended to save a candidate from a specific hotel if he failed, but Sanghoon couldn't do that, so he had to be cautious. Hyman stared at Ji as the judge revealed everything. Jisoo looked at Sanghoon and asked whether he understood everything. When he nodded, Yugun looked at the cart and said she would now inform him about the mission for the eliminated applicants. Soon, the cart came to a halt in front of her, and the old lady took the tablecloth, which she then removed, explaining that they needed to cook a dish with traditional Korean sauces. Jisoo, who sat next to her, informed the members that they had 30 minutes and that the 2 members with the lowest scores on this exercise would be eliminated. He uttered the last sentence with sincerity, which scared the members. He then announced the start time, and the members began selecting their items right away. She asked Heyman what he was going to cook. Hyun stared at her and explained that he would make red pepper paste with bulgogi sauce. Ji heard him and announced that she would make doenjang. After that, she grinned and wished her guy luck. Soon, the girl started cooking soup. She smiled and exclaimed in her imagination. She looked away a second later after Jisoo requested that the members concentrate because they only had 5 minutes remaining. The girl began packing her soup, satisfied with the amount of time available. Hyman gritted his teeth and was frightened at the time. His food had been overcooked, which made him exceedingly anxious. He clenched his teeth, aware that such mistakes were only done by beginners. Looking around, the individual realized that the others had made no blunders at all. Then he glanced at the stew Yunin had sampled. She grinned, claiming that everything was perfectly seasoned. The elderly lady standing next to the youngster stated that she enjoyed everything. Heyman was furious, knowing that he would most certainly be kicked out. He bit his bottom lip, determined to do something. Hyun shouted out to Ji and smiled, offering to cut some leeks and decorate the stew if she had time. Heyman smiled and agreed with him, and when the female started to walk away, her boyfriend grew concerned. He watched the female leave, then looked away to see the cameraman photographing another person. Dish. Then he focused his attention on the judges, who were casually discussing the dishes. The guy took the salt, mentally asked the female for forgiveness, and then put it into her soup. He smiled creepily. The hero held the onion and chopped it with a keen knife. The girl gathered the chopped green onions on the knife's blade before lifting it over the plate with the hot food and adding the chopped onions. She grinned as a drop of sweat ran down her cheek. Yoon-sung put his hands in his pockets and smiled, indicating that their time was over and that they should stop and remove their hands from the plates. Jisoo frowned, announcing that they would now begin tasting what they had made. Ji and Heyman wore red and white chef's uniforms. The heroes stood next to the tables, holding the prepared dishes. The boy grimaced and turned away. Steam rose from the girl's hot meal, which was adorned with finely chopped onions. Ji looked at the dish and smiled. Heyman raised his eyebrows at her. Yoonjun raised her eyebrows and approached, stating that she would try it. The man raised his eyebrows in astonishment and turned around, revealing that it was spicy bulgogi. Jisoo furrowed his brow and asked him to wait. A beef meal with greens was served on a white platter. The man extended his hand, asking if it was overcooked and whether he had served them charred food. Heyman grimaced and placed his hands behind his back. He smiled, explaining that he added soy sauce to the bulgogi alongside the red pepper paste, which darkened the hue. Yunin extended her hand, inquiring whether this meant conventional bulgogi rather than hot bulgogi. He massaged his chin attentively. The woman observed that the color of the dish had darkened. She cried in displeasure that his hot bulgogi was scorched, so she refused to eat it. The man said that it appeared they didn't even need to attempt it. Heyman raised his brow and gazed down, droplets of sweat flowing down his face. Jing furrowed his brows and pointed at the hero, wondering what was wrong with his countenance because he appeared depressed. Heyman looked at him and said it was all right. The guy furrowed his brow and glanced down, stating he hoped they would sample his food and enjoy it. The man scowled and looked at him with dislike. Jisoo folded his arms and offered Judge Mung a taste of it. The man lifted his eyebrows and grinned awkwardly, wondering what he was talking about. Mung wrinkled his eyebrows and glanced away, thinking that he didn't want to attempt it himself, and Judge Yunin had refused to do it, so asking her would be too much. So the man chose him. Yoon-sung smiled as he took up his chopsticks, ready to test the food. He grabbed the cooked beef and soy sauce with the tips of his chopsticks. The man brought the food into his mouth. Nanung grimaced and began chewing his food. He didn't turn his head to see if the meat was cooked. The color had been darkened by the soy sauce, but he just tasted bitterness. The hero scowled and looked at him. The man raised his eyebrows and pointed at him, claiming that as the hotel's chef, he was accountable for his dish. He should keep an eye on his own meal to see if it was scorched, or if he cooked it above the proper heat. His excuse was the worst he'd ever heard. The man was telling the guy that he should pray for a dish that was worse than his own, which appeared impossible. Heyman frowned, gritting his teeth. Jason slid his hands into his pockets and closed his eyes, motioning for the next person to pass. People strolled past H, frowning and staring at his food. The guy looked down, thinking he was ready for this. He didn't expect anything different, yet he wasn't the only one to fail. Hyman looked to Jason, who was speaking with Ji. Yoonjun pointed to the dish with one finger and gave a thumbs up with the other while gazing at Jisung, who was standing next to her. Nanung closed his eyes and lifted the spoon to his mouth. The man's eyes expanded as his brow furrowed. The woman closed one eye and extended her tongue. Jisung grimaced and clenched his teeth, focusing on the spoon in his fingers. Ji furrowed her brow and clenched her teeth as she gazed at the spoon in the dish she had prepared in front of her. The guy assumed he would lose along with her. The girl's eyes were wide open, and beads of sweat ran down her face. Ji and Heyman stood in front of the judges, who were seated on chairs. Jen folded his arms across his chest, stating that he was confident that they both understood why they were standing there. Both of their dishes were inferior to the other contenders. The guy furrowed his brow, looking ahead. The girl hid her hands behind her back, nervously furrowing her forehead and staring at the floor. Yunin scowled and pointed her finger forward, indicating that a contestant's dish was scorched. On the other hand, a participant used too much soy sauce and oversalted her dish. While it was not scorched, it was too salty. It felt as if a whole bottle of soy sauce had been dumped into it. The girl nervously tightened her teeth, thinking this was strange. She glanced at the floor, remembering that she hadn't even changed the seasoning after trying it. She puzzled how her sauce could be so salty. The problem was not. The onion Hyun furrowed his brows and glanced at the girl, subconsciously telling her not to be embarrassed because it was his fault. Before the competition with Yoongi, she gazed up to the second floor. The girl raised her head, looked at the chef standing on the floors above, and frowned, convinced that she was gazing at Sanghoon. Perhaps she had feelings. Again, this wasn't his first relationship, so he knew she wanted to get back together with him because he took the initiative. Ji-hee knitted her brows while looking at the floor, droplets of sweat flowing down her face. The hero smirked, believing that all he wanted was to boost his odds of succeeding slightly. The woman raised an eyebrow at them. Yoonjun raised her head, inquiring if they weren't in a relationship. Her lover had revealed everything during the interview. Jio glanced at her with amazement. The girl looked at Hyun, thinking it was apparent they were in a relationship, but they shouldn't have said it in public. Yunin furrowed her eyebrows and pointed her finger at the girl, asking if she was concerned that her partner would be expelled, which is why she purposefully added a lot of salt to her food. Jio frowned her face in terror and extended her palm in front of her, claiming that it was not like that, she would never do that. The girl froze and widened her eyes, wondering what Oppa had done. Jio looked at Hyun, who was standing next to her. Hyun frowned, assuming she had already figured it out, but he didn't care. Man furrowed his forehead, picturing Sanghoon and thinking that the most important thing he was concerned about right now was being spared from elimination. He kept his hands behind his back, believing that the protagonist's immunity card came with a condition. It wasn't the same as before. The protagonist needed to utilize it today to save one of the players. The protagonist scowled and glanced ahead, realizing that if he hadn't done anything, the person standing beside him wouldn't be Ji. He envisioned himself and the protagonist standing next to him beneath the brilliant lights, hands raised in excitement. Heyman believed that if this happened and Sanghoon did not use his immunity to save him, but instead saved someone else, he would be doomed. He grimaced and looked at the judges, thinking that this was a different circumstance. At least he wasn't guaranteed to be eliminated. Ji-hee widened her eyes and looked down. The guy had an idea that no one else did. Only Sunan knew Ji was his ex-girlfriend who had dumped him. The girl's eyes expanded and her brows rose, staring at one point. Heyman furrowed his brows and smirked smugly, wondering if this meant he had a better chance of avoiding removal. Jason raised his brow, asking Judge Mong, who sat next to him, whether he had anything to say. The man put his hands in his pockets, claiming that he had spoken everything he intended to say earlier. Jason closed his eyes, stating that in that scenario, Member Sunan, who possesses the ability to save a member from elimination, should approach them. The protagonist smiled as he walked down the stairs toward the rest of the crowd. The guy stood next to Ji, and the girl cast a glance at him. Jisung furrowed his brow, explaining that he needed to determine who he wanted to save from elimination. Sunan interrupted him and stated that he had something to say. The male lead lifted his eyebrows, indicating that he had something to point out. Heyman raised his eyebrows at the male lead. Ji furrowed her face in terror and opened her mouth. The judges stared at him carefully. He simply unfolded his arms. The male lead raised his hand, indicating that he had an essential detail to point up. The male lead furrowed his brow and inquired as to what the male lead intended to highlight. The male protagonist frowned, claiming that someone had deliberately damaged Ji's food. Heyman tightened his teeth while looking at him. The male lead furrowed his brow, sweat running down his forehead, convinced that no one was watching. He wondered if Sanghoon saw everything. Jisung scowled, wondering if the food had been purposefully destroyed. The male lead furrowed his eyebrows and explained that Member Man had added salt to Member G's food. The guy put his hand to his chest and gestured at Sunghoon. He grimaced, saying that he did not do anything. The person was being accused without evidence. Yunan frowned and poked her finger at him, wondering what he was doing. She instructed him to stand still. The woman observed that if it was the case, she could see why Member G seasoned the food in that manner. Yunan opened her mouth, wondering if the male lead had any evidence, or if he was simply a witness. Sunghoon raised his eyebrows, claiming that he had evidence, and was certain that it had been captured on the camera that was filming the judges. Jisung frowned, turning to the producer and demanding to watch the tape. The person glanced at him and said there would be no problem. The hero with the camera approached and stood between the judges. Jisung lowered his brow, remarking that it was fashionable to watch in the corner as Member Man poured salt into Member G's meal. The girl scowled and stared at him with displeasure. The hero clenched his teeth and turned away. Jen folded his arms across his chest, claiming that there was no need to look anymore because they were chefs from the same hotel, and he wrecked. His co-worker, Dish, was truly the worst of the worst. The man pointed at him and yelled in dissatisfaction, claiming that he had ruined not only someone's dish but also his hotel's image. The hero furrowed his brow and lowered his head. Nanung turned to Judge Jisung, who gazed at him. Nanung grinned and asked how they could rate the food because salt had already been added. They tried. He claimed that if participant man had not intervened, the girl would not have been at the bottom either. Ji furrowed her brow as she gazed down. Jisung folded his arms across his chest, realizing that the dish had been spoiled due to man's intervention, but he didn't want to overestimate participant Ji's meal. The man looked ahead with dissatisfaction, believing that there was no more room for the Priya Hotel in this competition. Jason turned aside, knowing it would be a major error to overrate her food right now. What Judge Mang said was correct. Nonetheless, he was confident the man was already exhausted from today's program. Except for Sunghoon, he didn't want to overrate anyone else. Yunong gave the man a smile. Jen looked at the woman seated next to him, expecting Yunwon to object, but he didn't need to worry about her because he and Munsang had agreed on this. The judge mentioned the evaluation of Member G. The girl raised her brow, staring ahead. The man mentioned that they would leave at AIS. G's eyes widened with amazement. Jisun gestured at them, wondering whether they were a couple and why they were bringing their personal troubles into the kitchen. The girl lifted her brows and opened her mouth, preparing to object. The man interrupted, asking if she was a lead cook under a SE chef, like him, who couldn't even make a simple dish. Then how could she possibly learn? Jisun pushed his hand to his chest and knitted his brows, claiming that even if he hadn't damaged her meal, it would still have been the worst, which is why they wouldn't re-evaluate it. Ji-hee widened her eyes and looked down. Yunjun folded her arms and closed her eyes, claiming that she knew what the food was supposed to taste like because she had experienced it previously. Therefore, she highly advised reconsidering her decision. However, involving a love conflict in cooking was not recommended. The woman glanced forward, stating that she had no wish to reconsider her dish. Ji tilted her head, enlarged her gaze, and knitted her brows. Noonan closed his eyes, stating that if that was what the judges believed, his opinion was irrelevant because the most important item right now was participant Sunghoon's immunity card. The male lead lifted his brows and held his hands behind his back. Mung arched his brow and smirked before turning to the male lead and asking who he had used his immunity card on. Heyman furrowed his brow and looked down, a drop of sweat streaming down his face. Ji-hee looked down, dejected. The male lead furrowed his eyebrows, perplexed as to why the judge stated, used, rather than his, which caused his eyes to widen, as if the male lead had already made his decision. Sunan raised his eyebrows, explaining that he used his card on someone who was not present in front of the judges. The girl and boy's eyes widened in amazement. Jason folded his arms and closed his eyes, stating it appeared like Sunghoon used his immunity card on someone who had positive ratings and was not now in the bottom two. Heyman clenched his teeth in annoyance, grimaced, and glanced aside, recognizing that immunity was already granted prior to the elimination candidate's task. A bead of sweat went down Heyman's unsatisfied face as he looked at the protagonist, wondering what the objective of his actions was. Then Jiyoung folded his arms and addressed Ji-hai and Man from the Priya Hotel, informing them that they had been removed from Top Chef. They thanked them for their efforts. The girl looked down, dejected. Heyman gritted his teeth and tightened his fists. The man opened his mouth, stating that they were finished for today. He sat on a chair next to Mang's and said they'd see each other tomorrow. It was a good job. The lights shone brightly through the big building's windows. There was a full moon in the night sky. The protagonist grasped the girl's wrist. Heeman scowled and asked Ji to stop. He could explain everything along the way. The girl frowned and told him to let her go. Ji yanked her hand away from him and dragged the suitcase behind her before she could complain. The man reached out his hand and shouted her name. Heeman scowled, instructing her to take the bus and asking where she was going. Ji grimaced and clenched her fist, then moved fast forward. The room number on the door was 312. The girl grimaced regretfully. She clenched her fist and knocked. Behind the door, on the balcony, stood the man. Ji scowled uneasily, a drop of sweat trickling down her cheek. The protagonist's face was dismal, and he bowed his head. The girl froze at the entrance door, holding her fist in front of her. She turned around and went for the exit. The girl rolled the suitcase behind her and moved down the long corridor. The man hoisted the can above himself and began drinking the contents. He abruptly set the tin can on the balcony railing. Sunghoon leaned over the railing, looking out at the dark night sky. The brilliant sunlight shone on the dark doors with bug glass. The heroes sat at the table and looked. At Hyunwoo, the guy raised his brow, stating it was a good job because given their hectic filming schedule since that morning. He expected there to be no problems with the show for 3 weeks. He inquired whether they informed the members that they were taking a 2-week sabbatical. The hero wearing glasses and a cap stated that it was announced throughout the show. At the hotel, Hyunwoo smiled and offered to discuss the next duty. Nina arched her brow, staring intently at the notepad containing her thoughts. The girl touched her pen to her cheek while looking down. He remembered himself warily peering out from around the corner. Heeman and Ji stood in the corridor. The main hero stood in front of them, holding a cap. The youngster scowled, adding that if the hero had stated that he and Ji had already split up, this would not have occurred. The girl glanced down with guilt. Sunghoon opened his mouth slightly, claiming they had only broken up a few days earlier and couldn't find the perfect time. Nina frowned her brows sadly, thinking that based on his attitude during today's interview and the talk she overheard in the corridor, she believed member Sunghoon and member Ji were dating. The girl clasped her hands in front of her, supposing that member Ji was currently with member Hyun. Given the circumstances, she doubted that Ji and Sunghoon's romantic connection had ended smoothly. Nina narrowed her brows, wondering why, if such was the case, member Sunghoon helped member Ji even before the elimination results were revealed. She remembered the protagonist reaching out his hand, wondering if there had been an emotional rift in their meeting and whether it was superfluous for him to intervene, regardless of whether the meal was spoiled. She couldn't understand why he'd do it. Mina's eyes widened as she contemplated the situation. She could hear her co-workers' voices attempting to gain her attention. Hyunwoo frowned and called her name aloud, and she raised her brow in terror and pulled her hands off the table. He stared at her with disdain, questioning why she was so distracted throughout their discussion and urging her to quit thinking. Mina smiled nervously and explained that she was only thinking about ideas for the next task. The boy exclaimed with surprise. Hyunwoo grinned, stating that, when you think about it, the concept she proposed, specifically, making someone the main character, was fantastic, especially since member Sunghoon had grown particularly famous among viewers. The youngster stated that he believed he and member Jangi were more closer than he realized. When he interviewed Junti, he discovered that they both worked as army cooks. The females raised their brows and looked at the producer. Hyunwoo folded his arms and smiled, remarking that while they were army cooks, they must have been close while competing in military cooking competitions. He believes they considered themselves rivals long before they created the photographs for the show. The child lifted his eyebrows in amazement, wondering whether this was not the case. Nina scowled as she introduced the protagonist, dressed in a chef's outfit, and stated that she had heard that member Sunghoon immediately used his immunity card on Contender T. The red-haired girl with a cap raised her brow, remarking that it was weird. She inquired as to whether member Janti already got his immunity card, given that he finished first in the ingredient guessing exercise. Hyunwoo scratched his chin thoughtfully and closed his eyes, saying it appeared like member Sunghoon blamed himself for member Jangi's impending elimination, which he discovered after reading the protagonist's resume. Member Sunghoon used to work at the Mongdong Hotel, where you now work. He introduced both the protagonist and the man smiling next to him. The protagonist's eyes widened with amazement as he looked at the producer. The man took up a piece of paper and inquired whether this hotel was listed second on the list. The person acknowledged this. Hyunwoo wiped his hands and glanced down, stating it was only a guess, but he didn't think member Sunghoon had fond memories of his time at the Yeongdong Hotel because he hadn't worked there long and didn't appear to be close to the Yeongdong members. Mina widened her eyes and gazed at him. Hyunwoo extended his palm and raised his brow, adding that because the hotels had produced the members' resumes, it couldn't be helped that their job records were included. But member Sung personally approached him and asked him not to mention that he worked at the Yongdong Hotel. He recalled how the male lead bowed before him. Id frowned, and the producer said that member Uni must have known they were linked, which is why he chose member Ilu as his opponent. The man extended his hand and asked if he did it because they were friends. Hyuna raised his eyebrows, indicating that it was conceivable. He simply stated that it was his guess. If not for that, then perhaps because member Uni had a strained relationship with the Yongdong Hotel. The producer clasped his hands in front of him, indicating that no matter what, member Suhin felt responsible for member Uni's potential elimination, so he used the immunity card on him. At least that was his theory. Mina raised her brow, gazing at him. The red-haired girl clutched a piece of paper in her palm, stating that regardless of the reason, she was delighted he used the immunity card on him. If one of the two members they portrayed as competitors was eliminated, the entire image would be shattered. The heroes offered unspoken support. Hyuna closed one eye, picturing the frowning judge and thinking, even if it wasn't. Sanghoon believes Yunti would not have been eliminated. Thanks to Judge Jaisa, he turned around and talked to Mina, who was sitting next to him. He extended his hand and said, "Member S." Hun's narrative had grown in popularity, and he wondered whether there were any plans to continue it. The timing was ideal because Mun's mother was in the hospital. Nina raised her eyebrows in puzzlement, repeating his words in amazement. Hyuna folded his arms and closed his eyes, stating that there was a little period after the morning mission when families may meet with the members, and it appeared that Si-hoon's family had also arrived. Na frowned, recalling the happy woman who had expressed a desire to meet her son, of whom she was extremely proud. Hyuna raised his hand and told the girl that he didn't know the full specifics, but there was an incident in the corridor, so she was sent to the hospital right away. Sunin contacted with today, informing him that he would be heading to the hospital on his day off tomorrow. The producer raised his index finger and asked, "How about filming it in the hospital like last time? There would be more tension, so the picture would be cooler?" Mina pursed her lips nervously and raised her brow, saying she didn't think it was a good idea because the viewers would probably get bored watching the same scene. Hyuna closed his eyes and stroked his chin thoughtfully, acknowledging that it was true, he hadn't forgotten about it. The guy suggested that they look for a better option than filming in the hospital. He asked Sui to give some further ideas based on member Jang's tale. The girl grinned, agreeing with his statement. Hyuna furrowed his eyebrows and averted his gaze, stating that they needed to complete the concept for the next job and summarize the meeting's outcomes. The heroes agreed to his proposition while the others at the table were busy debating something. Mina froze, her eyes widening. The girl knitted her brows, thinking about Onyu. They were boarding the train, and individuals with bags were approaching. The sign marked the fifth path to Wa. The protagonist boarded the train and slumped down hard in his seat. S, who had knitted his brows and nervously pursed his lips, opened his mouth wide and raised his brows, wondering how this could have happened. The protagonist was in the room, his cap resting on the bed. He held the phone to his ear, questioning why his mother was in the hospital when the girl stated that she was all right. Mina furrowed her brows unhappily and closed her eyes, claiming that she was fine when she was rushed to the emergency room, but her condition deteriorated, and she was admitted. She explained that such news would have startled him too much. During the mission, the protagonist frowned and stated that she should not have been concerned. He asked where the hospital was. Mina said it was at Wanu, which was a large hospital not far from Pongchang, so it was easy to go here. Sunin stood outside the window, palm on hip, and said he'd come tomorrow morning. The man closed his eyes and furrowed his brow, reflecting on how his mother had been admitted to the emergency room and how long it would be until payday. The protagonist glanced out the window, choking, and wondered if he might request an advance from the hotel. He believed he would be doomed for being a guy with no sense at all. All of the girls smiled and apologized for bothering him. She inquired whether the seat next to him was taken. Sunan furrowed his eyebrows in astonishment and turned around, indicating that the seat was available. The guy's eyes widened, and the hero's mouth dropped open, astonished to see the playwright there. Na grinned while staring at him. The bus was traveling down the highway. Sunan leaned on his fist, gazing out the window. Na gazed at the screen of her phone, apprehensive. They sat close to each other, obviously uncomfortable. Finally, the girl turned to Sanghoon and informed him that his mother had been hospitalized again. When the guy heard the question about traveling to the hospital in W since his mother was there, he glanced at the girl surprised. He agreed and questioned what business the female had in Wa. Mina smiled tensely, contemplating what business she may have there because she couldn't say she was stalking him since she suddenly became concerned. She finally responded, stating that the institution she attended was in Wa, and because it was a holiday, she had planned to meet with her professor. Sunghoon stated that he must be her previous teacher because she had to meet him in person. Mina hesitantly agreed to this. She glanced away, unsure what she meant when she mentioned the professor, for while she had attended a university in Wu, she had dropped out and had no recollections of it. Sunghoon stared at his neighbor with interest, but he felt awkward since he didn't know what to say. He remembered what they talked about throughout the show's interview. Back then, the girl looked over her notes uneasily. That time, he asked a little harshly whether he may go after the questions were completed. Na gripped the papers, and her countenance clouded. She asked that the recording be stopped. Mina turned to the person and asked him directly if he had met member So-ji. Sunghoon inquired again, surprised, but Mina felt embarrassed asking the question again. She attempted to explain that she had purposefully overheard them in the. Today, Sunghoon insisted on knowing if this was an official interview or a personal question. Na hesitated and verified that the question was personal. Sunghoon frowned, put on his chef's hat, stood up from the table, and prepared to depart. Mina attempted to stop him, but he asked whether she was truly that curious as to halt the conversation right now. Mina instantly came to a halt and apologized for her overzealous inquiry. Sunghoon said, without turning to face her, that he would depart once the interview was complete. Mina watched him go uneasily. Sunghoon thought about the situation. Mina suddenly realized that he wanted to say something. Sunghoon chose not to face the girl and instead apologized for his aggressive outburst during the interview yesterday. Mina glanced at him silently and smiled with relief when the bus declared that he was fine, since she was the one who needed to apologize. Finally, the bus arrived at Wu. Sunghoon stepped down the steps of the bus. Mina, who was strolling behind him, asked him with a smile if he was going straight to the hospital, and he agreed. He bowed to her in farewell, and she stated they'd see each other next week. Na watched him leave with anxiety. She was thinking hard about something. Sunghoon's mother was lying on a couch at WJU Hospital. Her brother and sister glanced at her, concerned. Sunghoon asked Mijin when his mother fell asleep, and she said it was only lately after she was given painkillers. The boy clutched the handrail firmly. He closed his eyes, and his entire body began to glow blue. He had a flashback of his mother screaming in pain, the doctors fussing over him, and his sister crying in fear. Everything went quiet when the medicines were administered. The physical pain of his mother was mirrored in the mental pain on his face. Later, he and Mayan strolled down the hospital corridor. The girl stated that the physicians had promised to discharge his mother tomorrow, which startled her brother. She added that even before his mother fell asleep, she kept saying that she knew her children didn't have money, so she didn't want to be a burden and wanted to be discharged right away. Sunghoon listened sadly to her, adding that even if they objected, it would be pointless because he knew their mother. They approached the receptionist's desk. The receptionist estimated that the emergency room price, hospital fee, and medication would total 360,000 W. Sunghoon went for his wallet, fearing that he was in danger because he only had money from the previous time. Mayan handed up his card and stated that he was willing to pay with it. Sunghoon expressed amazement that she did not have any money. She replied with a smile that the filming team for his program had contacted her and informed her that they had already paid for the previous filming. This perplexed the man because he was certain they said they would pay after the program. So, is he mistaken? The girl looked at her phone screen, which had a message from her stating that they had transferred 400,000 W for her participation in the previous filming. She grinned, staring at the phone. Her mood improved significantly. The girl gazed at her brother and sister, subconsciously asking Sunghoon to be strong. Cadv, the chef at an Mason restaurant in France, was adorning a ready-made meal 8 years ago. Someone suddenly distracted him by greeting him. The man initially had no idea what was going on, but after viewing the guest, he understood everything. Donggak, Suhun's father, stood behind his son, saying they hadn't seen Cadv in a long time. He smiled and asked her how she was, because they had come to France without notifying him, to which Donggak replied that he was on his yearly gastronomy trip, before praising his good Korean friend. Kav inquired about the young man next to him, to whom Donggak introduced his kid. Kav invited the master to sit at the table, and he would bring them food. After a while, a delicious-smelling soup appeared on the table. Sunghoon took a serious look at the plate. Cadv softly inquired whether Sunghoon was feeling well, to which Donggak said that something had happened to him at the Mongdong Hotel. The guy stated that his son was concerned about the direction of the culinary sector owing to the prevalence of workplace violence, to which Cadv responded that chefs must wield knives and fire as if they were fighting to cook for people, which is why he was in such a bad mood. Donggak closed his eyes and stated that he wanted his son to be an amazing chef, but if he did not want to, nothing could be done. Cad stared at the boy with sadness. He suddenly decided to turn to face him. Cov gave the boy a business card. Sihun was told that if he wanted to cook again, he could learn from him. Sihun stated that he did not want to cook anymore because he despised the nasty and domineering attitude in the kitchen. Cad grinned and stated he believed so now, but did he believe his opinion would still be remembered? Also, he does not hand out his business card to everyone in a row. Cv merely begged him to accept it. Sihun regarded the business card skeptically. It had the aide's contacts on it. Remembering the story, the boy took out the man's business card. Shanhun felt he had forgotten about the business card, so his father slipped it in. With his notebook in hand, he smiled, thinking he was a chef again, but he hadn't called Kadao. Sihun closed his notebook, and Hyunwoo moved down the hallway. He was tired of thinking about why his supervisor was phoning him at this moment. The man knocked on the door, stating he had arrived. Jisung opened the door and welcomed the guest in. Hyunwoo instantly inquired as to what was going on this time, knowing that they would face consequences if discovered during such a meeting. Jisun unexpectedly stated that in the next assignment, the judges would cook while the candidates estimated what ingredients were used in the dishes, and then inquired whether this was correct. The scriptwriter agreed with it. Jisun wondered if they had chosen a head chef, but they hadn't. Hyunwoo was astonished when the man requested if he could be the one to cook. He believed this was bad because if he continued to dominate the scenario, the program could turn out extremely weirdly. Hyunwoo tightened up but tried to respond politely, saying that Jisung had already done so much, so they should give the others an opportunity. However, Jisun was dissatisfied because he had only accomplished 2 things. The mood grew stifling when Jisung added that the writer should remember how he forced him to back down when he got carried away, and that he would not let him do it again. Hyunwoo cursed in his mind because it appeared that his interlocutor would not give up so easy. He grimaced, thinking that this would be the last time he acted like this, and that continuing to do so would only harm their program. Hyunwoo stated that he understood everything, but he did take out his notes and clarify that while they hadn't chosen who would cook yet, someone had already claimed that they could do it. Jisun wondered who it was. Hyunwoo mentioned the chef's name, Mung. Jisun was irritated because Munan was always in his way. Hyunwoo stated that he had not yet given his consent and vowed to think about it. He urged that Jisun approach him directly and express his desire to cook, as the playwright still had a lot of work to do. Jisun learned that regardless of whether they had a disagreement with Judge Mung or not, he did not want to become involved in it. The scriptwriter bowed and said he'd leave. The bright sun shone over the house, and people talked in the workplace. Yunan stared at the men and requested them to repeat the task. Yosung smiled and said they had to predict the ingredients, but wasn't that the first task? Because in that exercise they had to guess the names of the ingredients, and this time they would be creating food. Their task would be to figure out what ingredients they utilized. Y inquired whether they all had to cook, and he said that there was only one judge. The woman exhaled quickly, explaining that she couldn't do it because there were 22 people, which meant she'd have to cook 22 dishes. Nanung stated that he had already notified the team that he would be the chief chef for this mission. Yun Jing claimed it would be difficult. Jisung suddenly interrupted them. He inquired if the woman felt it was strange. He folded his arms and explained that during Minsang's work, in which they had to guess the ingredients, there was an error in the results checking, and Suhun correctly identified all 50 ingredients. Yujae was startled that he did that. Jisung went on to remark that during the noodle job, Hun's team should have been eliminated owing to the dish's quality, but the evaluation altered, thanks to Munam. Yun Jang was astonished since she assumed it was the boy's fault, but the guy said that he had always done things to put Sang-hun in a favorable position. Jisung scowled and wondered how, if it wasn't the woman who didn't agree, the youngest member of a 4-star hotel could always take first position. Mung called it nonsense. He asked his opponent what he was trying to communicate, and whether he truly meant to say that he was biased against Sang-hun. Jisung smirked ominously and inquired if he was really wrong, given that the man had already told Sang-hun which substances he would use this time. Munan angrily stated that he was dumbfounded since they were accusing him of something he did not commit. Jisung became even more somber, as he demanded proof that he was not behind Sanan. Nanung agreed on this. Jisung was overjoyed when his opponent angrily declared that he would not intervene, allowing him to do anything he pleased. The man smiled and said okay. Nanung frowned and placed his palm on his hip, indicating that he would not intervene so that the Sunbai might do whatever he pleased. The man gave a wicked smirk and folded his arms. Jisung tilted his head and closed his eyes, explaining that he had already told him so when the stranger interrupted him. Jisung scowled and opened his eyes. Manang lunged for the door handle, stating that if his colleague Yunti, whom he worked with at the same hotel, got first place in his assignment, he would withdraw all of the charges he had filed against him today. The man lifted his eyebrows and smiled. Jason frowned, staring at him from beneath his brow. The man closed his eyes and folded his arms, with Yunan standing behind him. The woman raised her eyebrows, figuring that something was going on between the two of them, but she hoped that whatever it was would be resolved without causing any trouble. Jason grimaced and closed one eye in the hallway. On the first floor, the participants and chefs were moving forward. The protagonist and the person with glasses stood at the center of the room, ahead of the other contestants. Sunghoon lifted his eyebrows in surprise and looked forward. The protagonist opened his mouth slightly, questioning why there were only lids and no actual kitchen. Sunghoon grinned and asked whether this could be a challenge in which he tasted and guessed the ingredients. Yunti lifted his brow and laughed uneasily, insisting that it couldn't be. The protagonist lifted his eyebrows and looked forward with seriousness. Yunti furrowed his forehead and opened his mouth wide, perplexed as to how this was possible. Jisung stood in front of him, arms folded, and promised to tell him about all of the impending Top Chef missions next week. The man furrowed his brow, a drop of sweat running down his chin, and inquired whether the chef would face any repercussions for disclosing this information. Jisung frowned, saying he didn't need to worry about it. In any case, all of the participants from the top 10 hotels would receive this information, not just the individual. The man looked at Yun, who was standing in front of him, and said that even Jai, who would be joining him, had concluded her mission preparations, so it was time for him to start as well. Wai furrowed his eyebrows, wondering what would happen to the contestants who were not in the top 10. Jisung frowned and peered at him from beneath his brow, wondering why he was even thinking about them. The guy scowled and looked at the cook with displeasure. The man pointed at him, implying that he had misunderstood something since Best Chef is more than just a competition. Jisung furrowed his brow and gazed forward, wondering whether he had never heard of this before. The results of this tournament would determine the ranking of their hotel. The man approached the youngster and opened his mouth wide, saying that their hotel was currently in first place and that they needed to keep it that way no matter what. Jisung pointed at him and sneered at the hero, claiming that this is what everyone at the top wants. Wai wrinkled his brows and pursed his lips, unsure which top he was referring to. The judge placed his palm on his hip, indicating that it was time to stop the nonsense and begin preparing. The boy bowed and said he'd do anything. Wai raised his brow, peering ahead, a bead of sweat trickling down his cheeks. The hero assumed that based on what he recalled, the challenge was to estimate what ingredients were utilized in the dishes. As Sunghoon stated, the guy frowned, believing that the primary issue was who would cook these delicacies. The judges entered the room, led by Jisung. The man lifted his eyebrows and greeted the participants, preparing to explain the regulations of the upcoming assignment. Jason addressed the participants lined up in front of him, explaining that their objective was to taste the dishes and determine which ingredients were utilized in them. There were 24 substances used here, and if they didn't predict at least one, they were eliminated right away. The man folded his arms across his chest, stating that the participants would enter one by one, and that there should be no one in the room but the participant performing the task. Yun Sang and Yun Jun stood by him. The judge revealed that the first contestant would be Jang Ti, who presently leads the rankings. The protagonist looked at Jang, who stood next to him. The person frowned. Sunghoon smiled, encouraging him to give it his all. He lifted his eyebrows and grinned awkwardly, indicating that he would. There were numerous contestants in the room. The protagonist stood near the wall, looking away. Sui approached him with a piece of paper in her hand, indicating that it was his time. The person could enter. Sunghoon proceeded forward, glancing around and assuming that the candidates who had completed the assignment were exiting from a separate location because he hadn't seen Janti. The protagonist stood in front of the table where the judges sat, hands behind his back. The man turned his head and requested that a dish be delivered here. The protagonist pushed a cart carrying a covered meal forward. A dish with an iron cover stood in front of the man. Jisung raised his hand, suggesting that the competitor open the meal himself. Sunghoon's eyes widened as he took the iron cover off the plate. The protagonist grimaced, recognizing that it was lasagna. On the plate was a fried dish comprised of marinated and deep-fried chicken pieces, topped with greens. Jisung furrowed his eyebrows, stating that the man might begin tasting the food and naming the ingredients. There are no boundaries. The hero gets 5 minutes to finish the mission. Time has begun. The protagonist froze in front of the plate and dish. He furrowed his brow and brought his face closer to the plate. The guy glanced up at the judges and said, "I believe there is bok choy in there." The man gazed at Mun Sun. The hero closed his eyes and got up. The judge came up to the covered dish and extended his hand. He raised the iron lid, stating that the dish does certainly include this item. The white platter had green bok choy. Sunghoon lifted his brow and widened his gaze, revealing that there are also champion and shiitake mushrooms. The hero's indicated ingredients, light and dark mushrooms, were on the white plates. The protagonist proceeded to name the components, which included bamboo shoots, peas, cabbage, and bell pepper. Nanung smiled broadly, taking the iron cover from the plate and remarking, "It was absolutely correct." Jisung frowned as he folded his arms across his chest. Yoonjun gazed at him, and the woman averted her head, remarking that he appeared worried. The man stared at her, opened his mouth, and said everything was okay. Jisung frowned, a drop of sweat trickling down his cheek. He assumed that everything would be okay. After all, he employed a substance no one would recognize. What matters now is how many the guy guesses. The man stared at the protagonist executing the work, and Sunghoon stroked his chin thoughtfully. Jisung reasoned that, in any event, the individual had heard nothing about the dish prior to the work. He only knew the ingredients in conventional zagi. The man scowled, gazing ahead from beneath his brow and picturing himself cooking. He recalled how, as a result of what Sung had informed him at the time, he had prepared a dish using components that even Yuni was unaware of. The man's eyes widened, and beads of sweat ran down his cheeks. He reflected on how he didn't care about his persistence because this was his last chance. The occurrences occurred yesterday. The man stood near the wide window in the room, holding a glass. Jisung lifted his eyebrows in astonishment as he heard his phone ring. The man furrowed his brow and picked up the phone, wondering who was calling at such a late hour. The hero's eyes brightened as he saw a call on the phone screen from the contact Soyeon, the president of the five-star hotel. Jisung stood in the room, holding a ringing phone. The hero clenched his teeth and grimaced uneasily. A call from the president of the five-star hotel, Soyeon, appeared on his phone screen. Jisung put the phone to his ear, indicating that he was listening. Soyeon opened his mouth to ask how things were going. Jisung's furrowed brows and sweat running down his face revealed that the man was probably working. He remarked that he wasn't too busy. The man opened his mouth to ask if he knew why he was calling. Jisung turned away, indicating that he understood. Soyeon grinned and stated that in that case, he would go right to the point. The president of the five-star hotel sat in a chair, legs crossed. He inquired as to what the man intended to do with the presentation, given that the strange gentleman was the center of attention. The man inquired as to who Sunghoon from the jewelry hotel was and whether this hotel was also part of their alliance. Jisung looked down, sighed deeply, and stated that this was a four-star hotel. Soyeon scowled and tightened his teeth, wondering how this was possible. The man questioned why trash like that guy was still present. Jisung's eyes widened and a drop of sweat trickled down his cheek. Soyeon gazed at his palm, wondering if the boss understood that this program was the result of all his efforts. The hero said, "I knew it." The hotel president furrowed his eyebrows, reminding him of something they had recently discussed. In the program, Yongdong Hotel should be first among hotels, and why from the Hilton Hotel should be first among all chefs. The man inquired if it was not what they discussed. Jisung grimaced and looked away. Ko-yoon tilted his head back, stating that as the judge, the hero should not be sidetracked by such garbage. Jing tilted his head down, stating he did his best, but the person was too persistent. The hotel president opened his lips wide, exclaiming, "No!" Ko-yoon smirked mischievously and raised his brow, wondering if he had yet demonstrated his true strength. The man stated that the top hotels held a separate seminar. He inquired whether the hero merely provided the tasks covered at the session. Jisung's eyes widened as he remembered the list of responsibilities. This was a handbook to chef-specific training. The Five-Star Hotel Association will make a special offer in the 4th week of October. The subject: Privat Fester Hotel Association. The content, skills and elements of working in a hotel, and a remuneration of 500,000 W for only participants. Special chefs are welcome to participate in training from 9:40 to 10 a.m., followed by skills and aspects from 10 to 11 a.m. The goals of a five-star hotel. The speaker is the hotel's president, at 11:30 a.m. An introduction to the pro. Jisung stated that he presented the tasks they discussed during the seminar as soon as he got the opportunity, but Yoon and Mun-song were also present, so he could not insist on the work they agreed on. Si-yoon looked down at his hand and stated that while he understood Yoon since he was a member of the Traditional Korean Cuisine Association, he did not comprehend Muna. The hero introduced the competition's judging panel, which included both men and women. Ko-yoon turned to the wide window, explaining that no matter how much experience he had in America, he needed to join the hotel owned by their association in order to settle in Korea. The man couldn't understand why Mang was acting this way. The president inquired whether that was all, urging the hero to do his best because it was the end. Jong closed his eyes, sighed heavily, and stated that it will be completed. The sound of a call ending was heard. Ko-yoon rose up from his seat and placed his hands in his pockets, requesting that the CEO call those working on the initiative just in case. Min Young held the paperwork in front of her, claiming that he had done it. The girl inquired where he was heading. Siyun laughed and said he needed to inspect the kitchen at their hotel. After all, he was still the Mongdong Hotel's head chef, so why not? He should listen closely because they had decided to run the episode earlier than scheduled. She went on to say that they wanted to focus on the tension between the participants and the drama that was emerging. The producer grimaced, contemplating the consequences of this action. He was aware that if the drama escalated, it may have unintended effects for all those involved. He looked over at Jisung, who was becoming increasingly anxious, and then back at the candidates. Mina noticed the producer's fear and promised him that they would manage the matter cautiously, but she highlighted the need of capturing the competition's real feelings. The producer nodded slowly, but he couldn't resist the sense that things were spiraling out of control. As the episode progressed, the tension in the room increased. Jisung could not help but feel the weight of the competition bear down on him. With each passing instant, he knew that the stakes had never been higher, and the pressure to perform was becoming overpowering. He took a long breath, attempting to steady himself, but the uncertainty of what lay ahead was overwhelming. They reported that members of the Five-Star Hotel Association had contacted them. Hyunwoo raised his eyebrows in surprise and removed the microphone from his ear. The fellow extended his hand, asking what they wanted. The girl raised her brow, remarking that they were laconic and inquiring if their companions required anything. Hyunwoo scowled and looked at her. The guy opened his mouth and asked whether that was all. Mina refused to help because they didn't need it, but they promised to contact him later. The girl held a notepad in her hands and asked if the Five-Star Hotel Association was putting pressure on them. The hero closed his eyes and folded his arms, stating that it appeared that because their show, which had grown in popularity, was backed by the government, he did everything he could to ensure that no one placed pressure on them. Hyunwoo extended his hands, asking if they had attempted to exert pressure on them. They would have likely notified him sooner. Nina's eyes widened. Hyunwoo raised his eyebrows, noting that they had contacted them in the middle of the show. The hero glanced aside. The child opened his mouth to inquire what if they were backing someone from the Five-Star Hotel Association. Nina scowled and inquired whether he meant that someone among them worked for the association. Hyunwoo took up a piece of paper and stated that it was true. He had doubts about it not long ago, but now he was certain. The hero looked at Jisun, who was sitting on a chair, with disappointment. The producer said that, in any event, they were still recording and that it would be best if they discussed it later. Na furrowed her face, agreeing with his statement. The participants dressed in chef costumes stood in front of the three judges. Jisung held a black piece of paper in his palm and stated that he would now announce the results. He turned to Mian from the Mirage Hotel and invited her to come over. The girl's eyes widened, and her forehead furrowed in sympathy. Neon stood before the judges, her hands folded in front of her. Jisung furrowed his brow, questioning whether she understood why they hadn't invited her. The girl timidly said, "I assumed so." The judge stated that she only named 11 elements, hence she received the lowest mark for this test. Neon looked down and pursed her lips, anxiously. Jisung pushed his hand forward and furrowed his brow, indicating that she was exiting the shell and that he was asking her to surrender her badge. Neon scrunched her brow with sadness, a drop of sweat running down her cheek. The girl put her badge in his palm. The man glanced at Meng, and the hero nodded. Jisung furrowed his brow, instructing Sunin from the jewelry hotel, the person with the best score, to walk forward. Yun's eyes widened as he stared at the male lead standing behind him. The boy's brow furrowed, and a trickle of sweat ran down his cheek. He wondered if the hero had won first place despite the fact that he had named 18 ingredients in advance. Gianti examined the cheerful boy's back, wondering how many ingredients the hero had named. The judges grinned and looked at Sang-hun. The dad furrowed his brow, stating that in that work, the youngster specified 24 substances. Jisung widened his eyes and looked away. Nanung raised his eyebrows and smiled. He spread his arms, claiming that the youngster had accurately named all of the elements. Jonggi's eyes widened in amazement as the hero enumerated all of the elements. The man in the black uniform questioned how this youngster could name all of the ingredients. The boy standing beside him grimaced, and folded his arms. Yoonjun grinned and said the youngster did an excellent job on the work. He could return to his station. Sunin closed his eyes and bowed to thank her. Jisun furrowed his brow, stating that was all for today, they should all retire to their rooms and relax. The man observed as the candidates left. Sunghoon raised his hand, grinned, and continued walking forward. Jisung scowled, staring at him from beneath his forehead. The protest removed the white cap from his head and walked down the hallway with it in his hands. A girl stepped in front of him and apologized for distracting him. The man lifted his eyebrows in amazement. Na furrowed her brow and folded her hands in front of her, wondering whether he had any free minutes. The heroes sat at a cafe table together. Sunghoon raised his brows and grinned, wondering what she wanted to talk about. Nina furrowed her brow and bowed her head. Hyuna gazed at the judges. Jisung declared that the participants might go back to their rooms and recuperate. The guy raised his index finger, informing the videographer that they may terminate it there. Hyuna removed the microphone, turned to scriptwriter Mina, who was standing next to him, and said they could continue their talk. The heroes sat at the office desk. He urged they give up on Jism. The girl furrowed her brow and gazed at him. Hook furrowed his brows and clasped his hands in front of him, stating that he had already informed her, but he was now certain that Jisung was working with the 5-Star Hotel Association. The guy turned to face the girl and asked if she had seen the grades for this work. Mina furrowed her brow, claiming she hadn't looked at them yet. The hero handed her a form with grades and offered to look at them. They were arranged from highest to lowest. Na held the sheet in her hands and grimaced. The girl opened her eyes wide and asked what the numbers were. Hyuna placed his hands together in front of him, indicating that these were the hotel rankings for the attendees. Mina frowned and asked him whether it was the hotel ranking rather than the mission rating. Hyuna furrowed his brow, indicating that this was the fact. The guy raised his hand, stating that it was for all of Jisung's missions, not just this one. Except for Sunghoon, the hotel rating matched the standings of the contestants. Nina scrunched her brow uneasily, a drop of sweat streaming down her cheeks. She inquired whether the protagonist had anything to do with them. Hyuna frowned, wondering if Sunghoon was affiliated with the organization. Otherwise, how could one explain Jisung's attitude toward him, given that he publicly complimented Yuni, who worked at the same hotel as him, and continuously picked on Sunghoon, attempting to get rid of him in any way possible? The hero imagined Jisung standing cheerfully in front of Yuni's prepared dish. He envisioned the man frowning and pointing his finger at the main character standing in front of him. Hyuna twisted his head, adding that even if it wasn't true, Sunghoon came from a 4-star hotel and couldn't possibly join the 5-star hotel organization. Nino lifted her eyebrows, acknowledging that he was correct. The guy scratched his forehead with his palm, stating he thought Jisung was only attempting to eliminate the one breathing down Young's neck. But Yunti couldn't believe he was a tool of the association, so they had to get rid of him before the show's reputation suffered. Hyuna furrowed his eyebrows and pointed at the girl, telling her that she could find another chef to replace Jason right once, a chef who had nothing to do with the 5-star hotel organization. The girl said that she understood. Nina raised her eyes, wondering if Oppa shouldn't tell Sunghoon about this because it was unfair to him. Given the other members' privileges, she believed they should intervene. The man furrowed his brow as he glanced at her. Hyuna scowled and said no, instructing her not to inform the male lead. The guy extended his hand and asked whether she knew who made their program popular, specifically Sunghoon. He questioned what would happen if he found out, and refused to participate. Regardless of how awful he felt for the guys, the program was his first priority. Nina frowned her forehead unhappily and looked down, indicating that she understood. The girl looked down sadly, a drop of sweat running down her face. She glanced to Sunghoon, who lifted his brow and grinned, wondering what had happened. Mina closed her eyes and lowered her head, pleading for his pardon. Mina apologized and frowned as she sat at a cafe table. The male lead questioned why she chose to apologize. The girl looked down and closed her eyes. The girl mentally prayed for his forgiveness once more. The playwright raised her eyebrows and revealed that the results of all the assignments, including the current one with Jisung as the judge, were manufactured. Looking down, the staff member said that if you look at the judges' ratings, you can see the hotel's actual ranks. Sunghoon pursed his lips silently. The scriptwriters wrote the scores to ensure that there were no errors in the procedure, but there was a chance that information had escaped. Mina closed her eyes and stated that they should have prepared more extensively to avoid something like this. She felt deeply sorry for what had transpired. The guy looked down and remarked, "I knew it from the start." The girl stared at him with amazement. She folded her hands on the table and asked if her friend was aware of the situation. Raising her eyes, the young man explained that he had a premonition. On the platter was a meal of mushrooms and herbs. The intern tried it with a fork, and a blue aura developed around him. After sampling the cuisine, the protagonist noticed not only the recollections of the products, but also the chef's smiling countenance. Sweat appeared on the man's face. Jisung was solely thinking about getting rid of the show's unneeded participants. Sunghoon held a drink in his hands. When she was called, the girl gazed up at him from her seat opposite her. The guy inquired as to how the software would change in that situation. Looking aside, the playwright responded that, for starters, they would change the judge and choose someone unrelated to him as a new jury member. The young man gazed at her attentively, recalling the director's unhappy expression. The channel employee questioned what would happen if her buddy found out and refused to participate, but the program remained the most essential thing. Mina closed her eyes and looked at her pal. The girl stated that if he requested it, the program would be stopped instantly. The intern's lips widened in surprise. The girl firmly gazed into his eyes. When she learned that everything was good, she raised her eyebrows in surprise. Closing her eyes, the male lead indicated that it would be enough to replace Jisung, as he was determined to keep his spot on the show. The playwright averted her gaze, smiling, as she remembered her friend's smile and pledged to win. Sunghoon thanked her. Looking ahead, the guy concluded that his companion could have concealed this knowledge, but she chose to reveal the complete truth. The channel employee reddened with humiliation. The young man expressed confidence that she will continue to perform well on the show, and that he believed in her. Mina looked aside and pledged to do her best for this. The intern stood in front of the door. When he entered the room and opened the door, someone approached him. It turned out to be Jisung and JY. The male lead turned around when he heard their voice. The heroes were somber, frowning. The judge suggested that they talk outside for a time. Sunghoon grimaced tensely and said he would be glad to talk here as well. The man pursed his lips in disgust and kept silent. He narrowed his eyes angrily and realized that it would be impossible to eliminate this contender through chores, therefore he needed to win him over to his side in order to keep his seat. Looking up, the judge inquired whether it was true that the contestant had cooked for the military alongside his companion. The lad gave him a serious look, and the Hilton chef said that they frequently switched places on the ranking table back then, which is why his subordinate was overjoyed when he discovered that his friend was also on the show. Jisung handed the youngster a gold business card and introduced Uni as his colleague, before asking what he thought of it. The judge smiled and offered him a position as assistant chef at the Hilton. Raising his brow, the lad thanked him for the offer but rejected. The man glared menacingly and inquired what that meant. He waved his business card and begged the competitor to think carefully, as such a great chef should not waste his time in a third-rate hotel when he could work in Korea's best hotel. Turning to him, the trainee stated that he declined to work in the top hotel in the country because his chef was narrow-minded, and the judge sought to find flaws in his performance on every job. The chef trembled as he gripped the card, and the protagonist inquired as to how he came up with such an offer in light of everything that had occurred on the show. Sunghoon smirked and inquired if he had no self-esteem. Jay unclenched his fangs with rage. Swinging his hand, the judge inquired as to whether the contestant was aware of who he was speaking with. There was a slapping sound, and the man's eyes opened with surprise. Uni opened his mouth in terror. The guy halted the judge's hand, as if he was surrounded by a blue aura. The young man inquired whether the chef had turned to violence because he couldn't find the correct words. When the trainer asked if the Hilton hotel staff were trained in this manner, Jisung closed his eyes and yelled in anguish. He frowned sharply and questioned whether the contestant truly believed he could treat the judge that way. Smiling, the protagonist announced that he was no longer a judge. Pulling the chef's hand away, Sunghoon explained that he had met with the scriptwriter, who informed him that a member of the jury had been found doing something wrong. Uni grimaced pitifully and told his companion to stop. The child gave him a stiff look before relaxing his hand. The man slumped to the floor and picked up his hat. The intern inquired whether Jisung had indeed messed up the assignment, assessments, and training of the members of the five-star hotel organization. The judge grasped his hand. The main character claimed that he only recently discovered the truth, but the film team had known for a long time, and after all of this, the man would find it impossible to continue serving as a judge on the show. Sunghoon approached his acquaintance and asked if he had also been trained. Looking down, Janti confirmed it, recalling how his friend had extended his hand to him in the kitchen. The guy inquired what he meant when he recommended trying again. Raising his hand, the chef clarified that he had not meant that at all. The man lowered his head and admitted that he was really humiliated. Looking back, the young man decided they were finished, and it was time for him to leave. The door to his room slammed closed. JTI held a suitcase in his hand. Standing in front of him, Jisung commented that this trainee resembled that man. The guy wearing glasses inquired as to who he was referring to. Looking forward, the judge recognized Dongguk's face and pronounced his name. Surprised, the young man asked his mentor what kind of connection they had. The man frowned and answered that it didn't matter because he was a hypocrite. The judge extended his hand, asking his colleague to bring him his luggage. Taking hold of the luggage handle, he stated that these people were fantastic and that he couldn't believe they had dismissed him from the program as soon as there were any concerns. Looking back, the chef advised his colleague to persevere until the finish and win first place for the benefit of the hotel. Yuni looked down and agreed. Jing went to the car. The channel workers descended the stairs. Looking forward, Hyunwoo inquired whether the judge had left. Mina said she saw him take the luggage and leave. Scratching his chin, the show's director decided they needed to find a chef to replace him and inquired whether they had discovered a candidate. Looking at her colleague, the woman said she had someone in mind but hadn't had time to call him. Holding a paper, the woman explained that they needed to locate a substitute before kicking out the judge. The producer apologized and said he wanted to get rid of the guy as soon as possible. The man looked to the side and inquired who would be the substitute. Looking ahead, the scriptwriter clarified that it was a foreign chef from a restaurant with 2 Michelin stars. She reminded him of. They needed to find a well-known chef who was not linked with the 5-Star Hotel Association. Hyunwoo affirmed this by raising his eyebrows. However, such a person was impossible to find in Korea, so they had to look elsewhere. The show director inquired if they required a translation because he was a foreigner. Nah. He smiled, telling them not to worry because he spoke Korean well. Leaves fell from the trees against the backdrop of the Eiffel Tower. The sign on the building read, "N. Mason." The man in the apron was straightening his tie with a confident expression. The guy holding the phone called out to him, saying he was wanted on the phone. Kev opened his mouth in amazement and questioned who was calling. When the chef learned that it came from Korea, his eyes widened in surprise. The girl held the phone to her ear. Hearing the interlocutor's voice, she grinned and stated he was calling for KBC's Best Chef program. The man questioned what the call was about as he held the phone to his ear. Raising her hand, the woman stated that owing to a coincidence, one of the judges had left their program, and she wanted to know whether another chef could replace him. The chef leaned against the door frame and inquired whether he was the first person they had decided to contact with such a request. The writer responded affirmatively. Raising her brow, Kov closed his eyes, realizing that if they had approached him after disregarding a huge number of Korean chefs, something significant had occurred that could not be dismissed casually. Mina smiled happily when she heard that he was prepared to help. The chef affirmed it with a determined grimace, stating that he needed to visit Korea at least once. The man promised to get ready for the flight and contact them later from the airport, and the girl bowed and thanked him. She hung up, and the woman closed her eyes and sighed, relieved. The protagonist was sitting on his bed, reading his notepad, and recalling how he had to grip Jisung's wrist. Sunin realized he had accidentally glimpsed his life's memories. He pictured the judge humiliating his subordinate, accepting bribes, and relaxing with multiple women at once. The child pressed his hand to his forehead, thinking that all of his visions were nasty. Looking forward, the young man remembered experiencing something terribly familiar. He was concerned about what type of feeling that was. The chef crossed his arms across his chest and shook his head. The intern decided not to burden his head with such ideas and instead concentrate on the next assignment. Opening his notepad, he understood that he not only needed to perform an exceptional job on the following task, but also get to the finish line. One of the pages featured a recipe for fried pork and biscuits. The protagonist sat in bed for a long time, studying the recipes. When Sunin heard a knock on the door, he looked up. Mina stood behind the door, smiling. She was astonished to find her pal still awake. As she walked out into the corridor, the man asked her what had brought her here at this hour. The girl said she needed to tell him something. Raising his brow in surprise, the lad inquired as to how long it would take and offered to chat inside if the conversation was lengthy. The woman slipped a strand of hair behind her ear and consented. She paused for a while, wondering if she could simply walk in and continue the conversation in the room, given that this could be said in 10 seconds. After removing her shoes, the writer recognized that her body had reacted before her brain could process it. The young man sat down at the table and asked his friend what he wanted to chat about. Smiling, the staff member informed her that Jisung had left, and his position as a judge was now vacant. The intern looked at her closely, and Mina explained that they had invited a new chef, but he couldn't join them immediately away, so filming would have to be postponed for a while. The woman raised her eyes and stated that because the man was a foreigner, it would take him roughly 2 days to travel to Korea. Hearing that, they decided to grant the contestants 1 extra day off. The main character frowned. The woman smiled at her friend and suggested that they stay at the complex over the weekend, go out, or meet up with family. When she asked him what he planned to do, Sang-hun clenched his hands thoughtfully. Looking up at his companion, he explained that his mother had just been freed from the hospital, and that his family lived fairly far away, so he would be unable to see them. He raised his eyebrows and stated that the conversation was brief. The scriptwriter squirmed with shame. Mina opened her notebook and described it as unusual, explaining that she expected them to have a lengthy chat as she was taking notes. After getting to her feet, the girl realized she had made a mistake and apologized for disturbing the contestant so late. The intern attempted to stop her. Walking out the door, the woman said that she had to leave and promised to meet her later. Suddenly, the scriptwriter fell and lost her equilibrium. The terrified protagonist hurried toward her. He managed to catch her and stop her from falling. Sunghoon extended his palm forward and wrapped his arm around his girlfriend, preventing her from falling. The scriptwriter's eyes widened with amazement. The guy grimaced and offered to lift her up immediately. The young man helped his colleague to her feet, and the intern gave her a worried look and asked. Now looked down, and claimed everything was okay, then questioned what her friend had planned to say before. The chef furrowed his eyebrows in perplexity, and requested if he may practice over the weekend. Turning away from him, the girl explained that it was a forced weekend due to internal issues and promised to see if she could use the program's equipment and products. She pulled on her sneakers and walked toward the exit. The woman bid farewell to her buddy. The scriptwriter was strolling down the corridor when Mina suddenly began sprinting. She raced rapidly to the exit, smiling. The blushing girl called herself dumb several times while gripping the notebook. The woman found the scenario extremely unpleasant, and wondered how he caught her racing past the stairs. The writer imagined she had fallen right into his arms and that her friend was exercising because he caught her so naturally. The protagonist grasped the door handle, and Sunghoon shut it behind him, his cheeks flushing from humiliation as he remembered how he caught his acquaintance. The guy assumed he had accidentally seen her memories and feelings. The young man slid open the glass door and stepped out onto the balcony, gazing at the mountains. The intern believed that his friend had surreptitiously aided him at the hospital the previous time. The chef glanced down in embarrassment, reflecting on his ability to perceive other people's memories and emotions. He suddenly remembered gripping Jisung's hand. The protagonist then tested his food. Sunghoon's eyes widened as he placed his hand on his chin. The young man wondered if he could transfer his emotions and memories into the dishes while cooking. Smiling, the young man agreed to practice it over the weekend. Clouds float above the building. The trainee entered the kitchen wearing an apron and hat. Looking away, he realized he was the only one who had opted to try cooking and thought it was natural. Rolling up his sleeves, the chef realized that he had valuable time to practice in the middle of the program, so he decided to prepare a meal that he had never tried before. Looking at the oven, the protagonist considered baking something because it had all of the essential equipment. Sunghoon chose to create a dish that reminded him of a long-ago excursion to the sea with his family. Nina moved down the corridor, holding her notebook to her chest. She assumed that no one was interested in the notion that everyone could practice cooking over the weekend. The girl opened the door and saw there was only her friend in the kitchen. When the woman entered the room, her eyes opened as she noticed a man standing by the oven, waiting for the sponge cake to cook. When he heard his name, he turned around. Approaching him, the scriptwriter inquired as to whether her friend was truly practicing. Looking down, she explained that she had offered all of the show's participants access to the kitchen, but no one except him had taken advantage of this offer. The sponge cake rose in the oven. The channel employee noticed a lovely smell in the corridor and inquired as to what it was. The young man said that he planned to create a standard cake. Embarrassedly frowning, the intern volunteered to sample the cake when it was done. Mina slammed the notebook shut and asked if she could actually attempt it. The chef smiled as he acknowledged this and stated that he couldn't provide an objective appraisal of his own food. The protagonist took the sponge cake out of the oven. The girl relished the aroma as her companion cut the sponge cake into layers. Sunghoon blushed as he placed strawberries on top of the cream-covered cake. The woman smiled and closed her eyes as she stared at the cake. The person decided he needed to concentrate on happy experiences. There was a lovely cake with strawberries on the tray. The young man wiped his chin and declared that everything was ready. The scriptwriter thought the cake looked excellent. The knife sliced the dessert into pieces. The intern put a slice on a plate and invited his friend to try it first. Taking a piece of cake, the channel employee was astonished and inquired whether it wasn't the chef's turn to eat his meal first. Raising his hand, the main character indicated that he cooks for himself on occasion, so he is familiar with the approximate flavors of all the foods, but he would like an outside assessment. Mina agreed to try the cake after looking at it in her hands. She raised a fork to her mouth. Sunghoon looked at her and inquired how it tasted. The girl grinned broadly and said it was amazing, as if she were in heaven. After spearing another piece with her fork, the woman reported that her heart rate increased. The person raised his eyebrows in amazement and inquired as to what this meant. He wanted to know if his memories had been passed on to her, and with a strained scowl, he asked if any images, such as the water, had appeared in her mind. Turning to face her buddy, the scriptwriter explained that she had been so delighted that she had not imagined anything. The intern squinted his eyes in distaste, and the channel employee inquired whether he had truly learned to cook from a manga, as well as what "see" meant given that there was no seafood in this cake. Standing in the kitchen, the main character requested that his buddy depart once she had finished eating. Mina claimed there was still a lot left. The man looked up as he heard his name called out. Swaki held up the placard and her pal waved. The chef shook his hand, indicating that they did not need to meet him. The man with spectacles complimented his Korean and stated he had worked hard to get here. Smiling, the network employee suggested they proceed directly to the filming location. The blonde smiled back and agreed. Cad closed his eyes and greeted the persons in front of him, who were the top chef judges. Yunnan waved, greeted him, and attempted to say something in English. After shaking her hand, the man told her not to worry because he spoke Korean fluently. Manhwa crossed his arms and indicated that the man spent around 5 years working in Korea before launching a restaurant in France. The blonde man extended his hand and recognized him as the man who worked at the Hayes Hotel, which has 3 Michelin stars. The judge raised his hand to confirm this and inquired as to Jisung's whereabouts. Someone spoke up and stated Jisung would not be coming since he had exaggerated the ratings of cooks at particular hotels. The heroes turned around, and after a thorough investigation, they discovered that the Hilton Hotel chef was working with an association. Hung, holding the papers, stated that this was why they had invited a replacement for him. Looking away, Mung remembered his colleague's face and was astonished to learn that he was involved in an association. While shuffling through paperwork, the show's director revealed that they would be making an official announcement that Jisung had departed the show owing to his hectic schedule. The producer gave the schedule and list of remaining contestants to the new judge. Opening the door, the man instructed him to read everything and return in 30 minutes with everyone else. Tadlow started flipping through the list of contestants. Suddenly, his eyes widened. Among the other names were the main character's name and the name of the hotel. The chef smiled greatly, realizing it was Dong Sak's son. The judges stood in front of the remaining contenders. Dong Ti frowned severely as Sonan stood in front of him. The bespectacled cook looked down. Mangs placed his hands on his hips and stated that they would like to present someone before the competition begins. A member of the jury presented the chef of the French restaurant En Maison, which has 2 Michelin stars, and the blonde man lifted his hands to greet the candidates. The guy's brow furrowed in surprise when he saw him, and the judges informed him that Jisung had left the show owing to a hectic schedule, and he would be replaced by their special guest. The young man's jaw shot open in surprise, and he remembered that he and his father had visited the Nason restaurant. Nunung stretched his arms and chose to proceed to the next duty. Yunin grinned and stated that many of the candidates had relaxed because there had been so few eliminations recently, but that after this assignment, many of them will be sent home. Raising 2 fingers, the man decided to inform them what they may expect from the new duty. The judge smiled as he declared that they should split into 3 teams and cook a whole meal. When the intern learned that 5 individuals would be going home after this work, he grimaced tensely. Raising his hand, the jury member explained that each judge would serve as a mentor and offer a themed dish. Cad smiled. He had been tasked to analyze French cuisine. The woman narrowed her eyes and promised to strictly judge Korean cuisine. Mangs pointed at himself and asked the candidates whether they thought he would rate American cuisine. The man winked and said he'd try Italian cuisine. When the trainee with the best score was invited to come forward, the intern raised his eyebrows. The main character took a step forward, aware of the other's sidelong glances. The other contestants regarded him with envy and fear. Sitting in the chair in front of him, the chef asked him to select the mentor whose cuisine he liked best. Sanghoon put his hand to his chin and decided he wanted to cook meals from all 3 cuisines. Hearing the French language, the boy looked up and trembled, clutching his hands. Kavlo asked him to choose him and promised to teach him everything. The young man glanced at him in amazement, then closed his eyes and consented. The man smiled and thanked him. Nunung raised his hand to invite the 2nd place overall. Standing next to the mentor in charge of French cuisine resulted in 1st place overall. Idi, who finished 2nd, stood next to the judge in charge of Italian food. Ilov folded his arms over his chest, and both he and Subak selected Yun. The judge raised his eyebrows and said that all of the competitors had made their decision. They should now listen to what their mentor, who had joined their team, has to say. The participants were separated into 3 groups. Koff put his hands on his hips and looked at his teammates. The man understood there was a bad vibe between them since, except from the 4 people that chose him, the rest were compelled to join this team because there were already enough people on the other teams. The blonde raised his fist to his mouth and requested for a minute's attention. Looking at the show's participants, the chef decided to take them on a brief culinary journey through France. Raising his finger, he stated that there are only 3 major cuisines in the world: Chinese, Italian, and French. Cad smiled as he inquired who of them was considered the most elite. The main character raised his eyebrows, assuming he was discussing French cuisine. He closes his eyes. The man verified this, stating that Italian cuisine arrived in France after the Italian princess Médée married the king of France, after which the cuisine evolved independently and became refined and aristocratic in the 18th century. The show's participants focused their attention on him. The chef also mentioned how tough it is to find a restaurant in Korea that specializes in French cuisine. There are 2 explanations for this. The blonde crossed his arms over his chest and stated that the first reason is the unique products and sophisticated recipes, while the second is the flavor of the food. Sunan grinned, and Cav expressed confidence that they would be able to broaden their understanding of French cuisine by following his suggestions. Raising his hand, the man offered appointing a team leader and asked for volunteers. Looking down, the child pondered whether he should be the leader because he had eaten foods created in France and could reproduce them with the proper components. When the child heard that his squad had a volunteer, he glanced up. Seek-Hen raised his hand. Extending his palm in front of him, the sous chef EXP explained that he was a graduate of Cole Fandy's renowned French school and claimed to understand French cuisine better than anybody else in the room thanks to 5 months of training and 6 months of experience. Crossing his arms across his chest, the chef admitted that he was well aware of Cole Fandy. Spreading his arms, Bang Hyen stated that the school simply taught the fundamentals and did not develop professionals, which is why institutions such as Ritz Escoff and Le Cordon Bleu were more well known. Looking at his competition, Chef de Partie questioned whether studying at Cole Fandy was sufficient to become the group's head. Sa Hyen pointed to the other participants and asked whether he was advocating that they put someone who was forced to join their team due to their poor grades in command of the team. The girl clasped her hands behind her back, understanding that they couldn't reach an agreement, and recommended that they choose a team leader by cooking. The man narrowed his eyes and claimed they didn't have much time, but Kadoff thought that was a fantastic idea. The room was brightly lighted with lamps, and they had 5 hours to do the assignment. The judge had intended to use the first 2 hours for training, but opted to use them for the competition. The man smiled broadly and announced that the one who could precisely cook a French meal known as a crepe would be the team leader. The contestants stood before him in silence. The blonde man raised his index finger, asking if they knew what a crepe is. The woman waved her hand, saying that most culinary schools taught how to make crepes, and questioned if anyone had not attended culinary school. Raising his hand, the main character stated that he did not have the necessary education. The girl apologized to him and smiled. The chef replied everything was good and promised to explain what this dish was and how to prepare it. Looking away, Kev said that this meal has numerous names, but the French call it crepes. A crepe is a thin pancake made by laying out dough and cooking it. To finish the dish, wrap the filling in the pancake. Looking at the show's contestants, the man explained that depending on the filling, this meal can be a main course or a dessert. Pointing to the stove, the blonde decided to show them how to prepare this dish. There was a frying pan on the stove. You needed to pour the batter into it, and the liquid batter covered the pan. It contained eggs, flour, sugar, and butter. You also have to fry this meal on low heat. Taking the frying pan, the chef began gently tilting it in different directions to ensure that the batter was equally dispersed. Cad used a spatula to demonstrate how to delicately flip it over once one side had been done. A bright brown pancake sat in the frying pan. The man removed it with a spatula and placed the pancake on a platter, declaring that everything was ready. The blonde turned to the show's contestants and asked them to use their imaginations to complete the meal. Looking down, the main character assumed he already knew the recipe for this dish and mentally thanked his old acquaintance for reminding him. Looking at his competition, Sang-hun determined that Sakin or someone else may take over as team captain. Putting his hand to his chin, the guy remembered that 5 individuals would be eliminated at the end of this task, thus he needed to be the team leader to best represent French food. The young man considered numerous components and concluded that in Korea, strawberries, whipped cream, and bananas were the most commonly used for pancakes. Frowning, he reasoned that they went well together, making them a universal combination. However, being unique with such a diverse product line proved tough. The intern, carefully lowering his sight, concluded that he needed to find something memorable that would stick out from the crowd. His eyes widened as a sudden thought occurred to him. Raising his hand, the chef requested permission to go to the supermarket. Sev's mouth opened in shock. The Korean culinary team stood to one side. Ilu crossed his arms, declared himself the leader of the group, and asked if anyone objected. Chusun raised his hand, asking if they should not choose a leader until the judge returned from the restroom. The sous chef extended his hand and announced that everyone, including himself, wanted to be the team's leader. With a hostile expression, the man inquired about the Yongdong Hotel. Walking up to his opponent, the chef said that the hotel was consistently ranked number 1 among hotels serving Korean food and hosted official government dinners. Gritting his teeth, Ilu inquired who should head the crew if not the hotel's sous chef. Subak moved in between them and implored them to calm down. Obviously everyone present knew this. Yoonjun came from the restroom and inquired whether they had chosen a team leader. The man smirked, corroborated the statement, and declared himself the leader. The chef instructed her to do nothing except rely on him. The woman furrowed her brow and asked him what that meant, her jaw hanging open. Manji closed his eyes and selected who would lead his crew. He pointed at the stunned Jang Ti. Scratching his head, the child questioned whether he would be an effective leader because several of the members were better than him and had more experience. The woman scratched his cheek and consented to appoint him the leader. The chef stated that they did not mind and were willing to give up this position to someone higher in the rankings. The young man smiled shyly and raised his hand. The chef noted that Italian cuisine is quite popular, but the more popular the restaurant, the lower the quality of the food. Jang Ti smiled widely and decided that they should give it their all so that the judges would respect them. The man said with a determined frown that the Hilton Hotel specializes in Italian cuisine, therefore he had the opportunity to exchange information on how to prepare it with the others. Looking at him, Munin decided he was a fine guy who had become a leader and instantly determined the team's course. Looking at how the candidate interacted with the others, the man concluded that he could do without Jisung. Kadao stood in front of his comrades, each of whom was holding their dishes. The chef crossed his arms over his chest and decided to sample the crepes. Bandan approached him, holding plates containing a crepe with chocolate, kiwi, and something red. The man placed a piece of dessert in his mouth. He chewed the dish, and gazing at his subordinate, the blonde commented that the tomatoes added to boost the kiwi sourness were too intense. Sokken put his dish on the table. After tasting it and closing his right eye, the judge recognized it as an egg and a salad and inquired about the balsamic reduction. When the candidate heard that, he looked down at the snack, which appeared to be absolutely typical. Yoni smiled as she presented her food. Kadao said that this method of serving the crepes seemed quite unique. He grabbed a chunk of the pancake with a fork and knife. Looking down, the man recognized that the butter and syrup combination reminded him of pancakes, and that the egg added to the sweetness. The chef inquired whether the candidate had wrapped the egg tart in the crepe. The girl hid her hands behind her back and explained that she chose to try creating this dish because she was adept at baking. The blonde gave a thumbs up, declaring that this was the greatest crepe she'd had today. He smiled and requested the other contestants to be patient, while he appraised their work. The main figure approached him with a plate containing little bite-sized crepes. Kadv grabbed one up, and the man took a little mouthful before cleaning his hands with a napkin. The chef was shocked that such small crepes could accommodate so many ingredients, including banana, chocolate syrup, and cream. The blonde man's eyes widened as he sensed something else there. A bead of sweat trickled down his tight face as he pursed his lips and stared at the contender. The judge inquired what it was. Sanghan smiled and responded, "It's explosive caramel." The other applicants for the team captain position appeared stunned. Raising his brow, the man explained that he remembered the caramel leg when he was brainstorming distinctive elements for the dish. Kadv, puzzled, inquired as to what they were discussing. Staken raised his hands and said that these candies were sold near stationery stores. Bangan adjusted his tie and explained that the caramels were foot-shaped and were eaten with a specific powder. Yan went on to say that when this powder came into contact with his mouth, it erupted. The man recalls eating something similar as a child. Putting his hands behind his back, the man said that the caramel foot was quite sour, making it difficult to utilize as a filler. He needed to get another product that included explosive caramel. The cook smiled and guessed it was ice cream. He crossed his arms across his chest, guessing that the cream's smooth feel was due to the ice cream. Pointing his finger forward, the blonde noticed that rice paper had been placed to it. Imagining a slice of multicolored ice cream in his brain, the young guy said that it was wrapped in wet rice paper. This allowed the ice cream to melt evenly and not run away too soon. Kadv regarded his learner with satisfaction. Looking down, the man believed he could pick who would head the team. Yoni's brows contracted in sadness, as the judge stated that he had intended to declare her the leader but changed his mind. Looking ahead, the head chef commented, "This crepe is incredible," pointing to the intern. The judge appointed him as leader, and the other members applauded. Cad sat on the stairs, holding a bottle of water. He placed a napkin on his forehead, and something off to the side piqued his interest. The main character came up to him. The man inquired as to what had brought him here, and whether it was a break. Sunghoon grinned and explained that they were pretending not to know each other, so he wanted to come over and say hi. The head chef put the napkin in his inside pocket, and stated it had been roughly 8 years since they last met. Raising his brow, the blonde complimented his old friend and stated that the bite-sized crepes were a novel idea. The judge was startled that the contestant had considered utilizing ice cream and explosive caramel, which was quite dangerous. The guy scratched his head and remarked, "I was just lucky." Imagining the other contestants' disgruntled expressions, the jury member added that those who did not want to see him as team leader sampled his crepes and recognized him right away. Furthermore, the boy purposefully made so many pancakes so that everyone could try. Holding a chef's hat in his hands, the young man stated that he created a lot of crepes because they were little. Cliff raised a bottle of water to his mouth, saying that his old friend had amazed him as a judge, not just with his crepes. The man pointed out that his student not only cooks well, but also ranks first in the ratings. The intern reddened embarrassingly. Taking a sip from the bottle, the chef reminded him not to be pompous. He opened his mouth and sighed. Smiling, the blonde reminded him that cooking with soul is essential, and that when the cook becomes arrogant, the taste of the prepared meals suffers. Looking down, the main character stated that cooking should always be treated seriously, and that his father warned him not to allow other emotions interfere with the cooking process. Rising off the steps, the judge added that Donggak helped him become the person he is today. Sunghoon inquired about what his mentor planned to accomplish. The judge raised his index finger, recalling how Donggak once demonstrated how to serve meals at a restaurant. The child placed his hand on his chin, remembering that there should be music during the presentation. Cadley affirmed this by placing his palm on his shoulder and asking the participant to stick to the notion and choose the proper option. The man smiled politely and explained that he wanted to meet someone before they began cooking. When the young guy learned that this individual was related to him, his mouth dropped wide in amazement. The judges stood in front of the competitors, smiling. Mengs decided to begin judging the dishes, first explaining the judging criteria. The dishes would be served to every one of the judges except the team mentor. Except for the foreign chef, all of the jury members brought French food to the table. Following a brief presentation, they would have to try the delicacies and offer their ratings. The number on the plate represented the ultimate score, which would be the average of the judges' ratings. Looking at the contestants, the man said that the team with the fewest points will be ousted from the tournament. The panel member raised his eyebrows and said that the order of presentation of the dishes would be selected by lottery. In his hands was a glass and wooden chopsticks. The other judges selected one each. Manhwa gazed at his chopsticks. Looking up, he declared that the French culinary team will present their dishes first. The protagonist smiled. Italian cuisine would come second. Jang Tae squeezed his fist with joy. Elugrev, a Korean dish, was the final to be introduced. Raising his hand, Cad noticed that the order in which the teams were introduced matched the order in which they were already standing. When it came time to introduce the dishes, Sunghoon agreed with a troubled brow. When he was called out, the individual glanced away. Hyuna put his hand to his mouth and urged him to go to the waiting room to touch up his cosmetics so that the camera would not detect any flaws. Pointing his finger ahead, the young man assured the chef that he would return shortly to prepare everything they had discussed earlier. The show's director crossed his arms over his chest in disdain. Mina questioned him, wide-eyed, how often the makeup was touched up during the show. The producer said that it was not very often. The intern moved forward down the hall. The man explained that he attempted to continue filming, but the head of the makeup team and the project's chief coordinator informed him that he needed to touch up his makeup immediately. The girl gritted her teeth in displeasure as she realized who they were discussing. The woman narrowed her eyes and vowed to return after they had adjusted her friend's cosmetics. The writer grimaced and turned away as someone shouted out to her. Yunti approached her, handed her something, and begged her to accept it. The staff member grinned sheepishly and inquired as to what it meant. Someone wiped a sponge across the main character's face. A cosmetic artist painted his brows. The girl placed her hand on the contestant's shoulder and asked him how he liked the makeup. Looking in the mirror, the blonde observed that his skin tone had lightened. Covering her mouth, the woman stated that she had heard on TV that he worked extremely hard for his family. She wiped away a tear, assuming his mother was pleased with her son's first-place finish. Sunghoon, embarrassed, admitted that this was true and stated that he had never asked his family what they thought of his involvement on the show. The child looked around and inquired when he could get his outfit. Holding a steamer, the project coordinator stated that the team leader's uniform should not be so wrinkled and dirty, thus she needed to smooth out all of the creases. The youngster smiled and thanked her. The girls shivered when he claimed he was meeting them for the first time and questioned if they had only recently started working here. The blonde raised her hands, unsure how to tell him this. When the intern learned that they had already met, his mouth dropped wide in amazement. A displeased Mina stood in front of him. San smiled. She used to wear glasses, keep her hair in a ponytail, and appear perennially fatigued. Jim flushed when she was called someone who was unconcerned about herself and her beauty. Frowning cruelly, the girl concluded that after hearing the explanation, her friend recognized them. She pondered why they had come to a colleague's wedding without makeup. She suddenly put on contacts and makeup. The blonde raised her palms in front of her, asking her to calm down. The woman fiercely pursed her lips, imploring them to hurry up and finish the cosmetics. The makeup artist took off the participant's apron and announced that everything was ready. The coordinator threw him the outfit and told him she had steamed it. Opening the door, San announced that it was time for them to leave. Jim advised her colleague to speak with them next time before making assumptions. Frowning, the scriptwriter stated that she had made no assumptions. Putting on the uniform, the main character inquired whether he was delaying the filming too much. Looking away, the channel employee responded in the affirmative. Sunghoon tied the apron behind his back and returned to the hall right away. Mina handed him a container of milk, asking him to drink it before leaving. The guy thanked her as she held the chocolate milk. The girl closed her eyes and stated that it was not from her. The boy scowled when he heard Yuni had requested milk. The intern held the bag in his hand. The woman raised her hands in alarm, noting that the chef appeared gloomy. Looking down, she explained that she had no idea why she was requested to pass the chocolate milk, but it could be an apology for the incident with Jisung. The male lead lowered his gaze carefully. He apologized to his friend when she called him. The writer raised her eyebrows, sensing that he needed time to process his emotions, and announced that she would wait for him outside the door. The station staff opened the door, and Sunghoon said there was no need and that he was okay. Mina pinched her brows pitifully and stated that it was written on his face. The child raised his hand and froze in place. He looked at the bag of milk. The package had a picture of chocolate on it, and the young man wondered whether his old friend was just trying to apologize. Frowning angrily, the intern tried to figure out why Yuni had handed the milk without saying anything. The previously bespectacled lad lifted his eyebrows, surprised. Smiling, the protagonist inquired whether his friend had ever eaten chocolate milk for lunch. Placing his hand on his chin, the cook stated that he only drank ordinary milk. Frowning in surprise, the young guy inquired about the purpose of substituting regular milk with chocolate milk in the army, implying that there was some hidden meaning behind it. Sunghoon smiled broadly, explaining that it was only symbolic since as long as the milk was white, it didn't matter. Raising his hand, the intern stated that he understood that in the army, everyone had to eat from the same menu because there were so many hungry mouths. Changi gave him an attentive glance. The boy said that with milk, everything has changed because they did not have a choice in elementary school, but now they do. Crossing his legs, the young man explained that the presentation of white milk is a more established tradition, and he would like to be able to choose the drink. The protagonist, firmly knitting his brows, stated that if he did this, the amount of milk wasted would reduce, and a huge number of people would be satisfied with the army food. The cook walked away, his gaze directed downward. He grasped his friend's neck from behind. Chunti smiled as he explained that people like them had no control over the situation. Sunan, attempting to break away from his hold, stated that if he won the challenge, he would discuss his proposal in a victory speech.